Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's recap, we will be looking at an anime titled Radiant. This story takes place in a mythical world overflowing with a power known as Fantasia. It's said that those who wield such power can become either heroes or demons. As such, monsters known as Nemesis, or the demons of Fantasia, fall from the sky and are of unknown origin. They wreak havoc and death over the lands and people they touch. However, some humans survive the touch of a nemesis, but in return, they're permanently cursed with a magical power and are called sorcerers. Though persecuted by the majority, these sorcerers work relentlessly to end the reign of the nemesis and make the world a peaceful place to live in again. Amongst these sorcerers is a boy named Seth, who's also a sorcerer but with horns. Seth is a little boy who aspires to save the world from the nemesis and make sure sorcerers don't get shunned by the majority anymore. Training under a renowned freelance sorceress and pursuit-style hunter, Alma, Seth learns what it takes to become a sorcerer everyone can love and respect. To discover Seth's experiences during his journey to becoming the strongest sorcerer, sit back, grab a drink, and enjoy the video. In the opening scene, the small town on Island 21 is bubbling with happy people going on about their normal daily activities. Suddenly, a street runt, aka Seth, is seen jumping atop building roofs, hoping to get to the forest in time to see his friend Tommy and show him some of the cool magic tricks he's learned from his mentor Alma. He manages to get there on time and finds his best buddy, Little Tommy, sitting on a rock and worried sick about the boisterous Seth. Seth says hello, and Tommy tells him to skip the introductions and go straight to showing him his secret magic techniques. Tommy is a human who seems to be fascinated by sorcerers and their magical abilities, and Seth is in to give him something he can call cool. To begin the dramatic display of his special magic, Seth throws some grimoires on the rock and tells Tommy they're for their eyes only. Tommy, who saw through his lies, tells Seth he likely stole the grimoires from Alma's library. Seth shrieks in shame and quickly picks up one of the books to speak out its magic spell. Upon mouthing a few words, Seth gets disappointed when nothing happens. Tommy, who's even more disappointed, tells Seth to admit that he's talentless, so they don't waste more time chasing clouds. Seth throws a fit and decides to show his friend his raw power. After throwing Tommy a grimoire, Seth walks towards another rock, concentrates the Fantasia energy in the air, and accumulates it on his left fist to power it up sevenfold. Then, he releases all that energy by punching the rock in front of him and sending it flying toward the cattle farm a few meters away. The rock crashes into the barnyard and causes the cattle to become angry at Seth for trying to sabotage their eating space. To punish him for his mistake, the cattle break out of their yard and chase Seth and his friend into the town. Seth and Tommy run as fast as their legs can carry as they approach the town. Meanwhile, Alma is seen at a stall waiting to buy some rope and boards. Due to her nature and reputation, the stall owner refused to sell her the ropes and board. This pissed Alma off as she could clearly see the ropes at the back of his stall. She shouts at the stall owner and tries to make him get her the ropes, but then the stall owner changes his countenance toward her and tells her he doesn't sell stuff to sorcerers at all. He even suspects she may use the rope and board to abduct their kids and sacrifice them. Alma, having gotten used to the discrimination, calms herself down and threatens to blow the stall owner's stall if he doesn't give her the ropes she needs. The stall owner sheepishly runs to the back of his store to get the ropes he needs. As the stall owner rummages through his stall to get the ropes, Alma peeks outside and finds Seth and Tommy running into town with a herd of cattle chasing them. Seth races through the town begging the townsfolk to give him time to take care of things. However, he knows he's going to be in big trouble if Alma finds out he's behind this disaster. Lo and behold, however, he passes near Alma and takes a large gulp before continuing his race. Alma sighs and takes care of the cows, saving Seth and his friend from a near-death cattle experience. After settling down, Alma faces her ward and vows to punish him once they get back to their house. Just then, the townspeople get restive and begin throwing stones at Alma and Seth, blaming them for their misfortune and the damage done to their town. While Seth tries to defend the sorcerer's name, Alma handles the situation by promising to pay for all the damages incurred in the incident. Still, the townspeople continue discriminating against her and her ward. Eventually, Alma gets tired of the hubbub as they fly towards their coven high up in the clouds. On their way, Seth asks Alma why the people are so hateful towards them. Alma tells him not to take their words to heart, as they almost don't know anything about sorcerers or Fantasia. They're just ordinary people. Hours later, by nightfall, Alma makes Seth clean the walls of their floating coven, as punishment for bringing trouble to their side earlier that day. Not only that, Alma lets Seth know that she knows about him stealing her grimoires, and for that, she's punishing him as well. Seth grumbles a little bit, and then calms himself down to ask his next question carefully. He asks Alma why she's so chill with people calling her a monster, even though she's the sweetest person in the world. With a calm voice, Alma tells him it's because those who have upstanding normal lives usually fear things they don't understand. Plus, the townspeople view sorcerers, and they view the nemesis monsters. So it's not surprising that they don't like her one bit. Seconds later, Alma's head pulses and causes her to have a headache. Alma recognized this pain in her head and wished it had come later. Nonetheless, she ignores it and tells Seth not to get too many weird ideas, as she knows how stubborn he can be. Seth, on the other hand, begs Alma to let him off the hook so he can be a good boy from then on. Alma ignores him and makes sure he's done with all his work before letting him get back to his room. Later that night, Seth checks out a grimoire in his room and finally decides he's going to be the most powerful sorcerer in all of the lands. This way, he'd be able to save the other sorcerers from getting discriminated against all the time. The very next day, Seth heads out to the forest to meet with Tommy, and also practice some new spells he's learned the previous night. After burning his hands for the umpteenth time, Tommy finally speaks up about the things his parents told him the previous day. They warned him to stay away from someone like Seth as they're always up to no good. Seth, however, ignores the warnings and tells Tommy to believe in him and his future ambition of becoming a nemesis hunter. Tommy gets a little surprised and asks him what a nemesis looks like, as he's never seen one before in his life, much less understand why someone would want to hunt them. Seth gets serious and explains the vile creatures called nemesis and their notorious ways of leaving nothing but death and strife anywhere they go. He also explains Alma's job to Tommy and tells him he can't surely leave everything to Alma, as that'd be pretty pathetic of him. Just then, Tommy spots something falling from the sky and calls Seth's attention to it. Seth looks up and recognizes the egg-shaped object to be a nemesis egg falling towards their town. Without wasting any time, Seth takes control of the situation and tells Tommy to get everyone to safety while he fights that thing. Tommy advises them to inform Alma about the entire thing, but then again, Seth tells him to leave things in his hands. As the nemesis egg lands, Seth flies himself to the coven up in the sky and arms himself with some heavy and unnecessary equipment to take down the nemesis egg. Meanwhile, Tommy rushes towards his people, screaming his lungs out and telling them about the nemesis egg. There's a little ruckus in the village until Seth finally lands on the nemesis egg and urges the villagers to be calm while he fights the nemesis egg. Someone from the crown, a hypocrite, tells him to call Alma to come take care of the situation. Seth didn't have enough time for that as the nemesis egg hatched under his feet. Almost immediately, he springs into action and throws his weapons at the nemesis, hoping to do enough damage to the creature. Sadly, nothing worked and Seth gets thrown out of bounds. Tommy gets closer to the nemesis to check up on his friend, but the nemesis finds him unfortunately and attacks him. Seth blocks the attack on his friend and urges Tommy to run as fast as he can while he holds the nemesis down. Tommy rushes back to the city, calling for help in any way he can. Seth, on the other hand, struggles desperately to free himself from the nemesis hold. Tommy, upon realizing that his friend is being crushed, screams out for someone to help. Just then, a bunch of sorcerers show up from the sky and seal the nemesis with a mid-range sealing spell. After putting the nemesis to sleep, the sorcerers introduce themselves as the Bravery Quartet. Their leader, who's also the most extravagantly dressed, Don Bossman, prepares himself for a speech and explains their intentions to the villagers, which is to save them from the monster plaguing their village. Upon hearing this, the villagers are thrilled to finally have real heroes come in and rescue their village from these sorcerers and nemesis. Seth, however, gets the shock of his life as he's never seen any sorcerers aside from himself and Alma. He calls on Don Bossman and asks him to fight him so he can prove he's stronger. Don Bossman sidesteps Seth's request and asks him if he can become their partner. Seth, who's none the wiser, accepts his offer and asks when they get to fight each other. Just then, the townspeople speak out and tell Don Bossman not to trust someone like Seth, as he's usually up to no good. Don Bossman, however, shocks everybody when he removes his hat and proves to the villagers that he's a sorcerer, just like Seth, so they shouldn't be too judgy towards both of them. With that, Don Bossman orders his crew to buckle up and work on destroying the nemesis before it breaks itself out of the seal it's under. Moments before the seal's broken, Don Bossman advises the villagers to evacuate the village so they can avoid collateral damage while fighting the nemesis. The villagers complain about their people still being in their houses and ask Don what he plans on doing about that. Don tells them not to worry, as he and his people will make sure to evacuate the others from their houses as well. To do that though, Don mentions that he'll need someone to act as a decoy for the monster while they evacuate the others. Don turns to Seth and asks if he's up for the task. Seth happily agrees to help them, and then asks Don what he should do. Don cooks up a half-assed motivational speech and tells him to act smart and run when the time comes to run. After that, the entire team dispersed and the people immediately started evacuating the town. Minutes later, the nemesis breaks itself out of the seal and faces the only person in front of him, Seth. Seth tries to use his Titan Punch on the monster, hoping it'll do a little damage. Sadly for him, that wasn't the case as the monster chased him all through town. Seth tries ambushing the monster and giving it an axe kick. However, the monster's body bounced off his kick and sent him flying into a tall building. Confused about what to do, Seth recalls what Don Bossman told him to do earlier and decides to get smart about things. What he didn't know was that the con artists who call themselves the Bravery Quartet had already broken into the town's bank and placed everyone there hostage, including Tommy and his dad who worked there. After regaining consciousness, Seth takes out an object he could use to take down the Nemesis. He then lures the unsuspecting monster out in the open toward his trap. When the Nemesis monster gets close enough, Seth pulls up his trap and wraps the chains he set down previously all around the Nemesis. He stops to laugh and gloat over his bravado, completely ignoring how strong the Nemesis can get when angry. It doesn't take long for him to find out, as the Nemesis gets seriously pissed and begins shooting lasers out of its face. Seth continues running for dear life and calls for serious help this time. Somewhere up in the skies, Alma glides towards her coven as she is just returning from a boring job. She complains a little about the job she just completed, but then stops when she feels an unusual sensation around the village. She imagines Seth must be there trying to do something and gets worried. Without further ado, she heads straight towards the village, hoping to save Seth from the Nemesis' wrath. Seth, on the other hand, is seen breathing very hard, as he just saved himself from the monster's laser beams. Just then, he hears screams from the village bank and realizes something must be wrong with the place. After restraining the townspeople, Don Bossman and his band of merry fools prepare their bags to be filled with cash and jewelry from the bank's vaults. The villagers feel sorry for placing their trust in sorcerers. Don Bossman and his men make fun of them for thinking they are heroes and laugh at their impending wealth. At that instant, Seth arrives in anger and confronts Don Bossman and his people. Initially, the villagers thought he was with them, but then Seth proves them wrong when he questions the Bravery Quartet's motives towards the people of his village. It was then that Don Bossman blows his cover and reveals his group to be a bunch of scalawags who take advantage of situations such as the ones they're in, just so they can fill their pockets. At this point, Seth gets understandably pissed off at them. He asks them why they lied to him that way, and the guys only laughed and told him that they knew he would buy something like that. This only makes Seth more pissed as he wonders why they would do something that wrong to the people of a small village. Don Bossman takes a deep breath and tells Seth that the townspeople aren't worth fighting for at all, and to be honest, Don was right. It didn't take the people long before they started raining curses and blaming Don and Seth for all the calamities they faced that day with the Nemesis. Don tells Seth not to get too attached to idiots like those people, and instead, be himself and work towards making himself somebody. He ends his speech by telling Seth to be smart about things and quit trying to protect those who don't give a damn about him. When it's time to go, Don Bossman throws Seth a bag of money to show his gratitude for helping them in this heist. Seth, however, punches Don Bossman as hard as he can and calls them pathetic for being that selfish. He also tries punching the other members of the Bravery Quartet, but then again, one of them, Gigi, stops him with his defense magic. Seth falls to the ground unconscious and listens to Don Bossman talk about his theory about people one more time. As they wait for Seth to get back to his senses, the Nemesis wakes up and continues its attack on the village. At this point, Don Bossman and his people bail out on them and leave the people there for dead. The Nemesis gets to the bank and cooks up a laser beam on its face while facing everybody. Seth shocks everybody when he gets back on his feet and faces the laser head-on to block it. He waits for the Nemesis to finish forming his laser and then uses his Titan Punch to block it. Don Bossman and his men, who thought Seth had died, were shocked to the bone when they found Seth using magic from his bare hands to stop the laser beam from hitting the people. After stopping the laser beam, Seth reinforces his fist with Fantasia to form a Titan Punch. Before the Nemesis creates another laser beam, Seth lunges at the monster and blows a hole in its belly. This attack worked out well for him, as the monster fell unconscious for just a moment. Tommy, Don Bossman, and their people all stare in awe as they witness a young boy become a man. Sadly for Seth, his victory is short-lived as the Nemesis gets back up. Thankfully, Alma came at the right time and destroyed the remains of the Nemesis. Seth loses consciousness and wakes up later that night in their floating coven. He finds himself in his room and sees Alma sitting close to him. Without even thanking her, he asks her about his friend, Tommy, and the state of the village. Alma tells him they're all fine thanks to him, and this makes Seth very happy with himself. Alma cuts to the chase and scolds Seth for using Fantasia barehanded in his battle against the Nemesis. Seth smiles and tells her not to think about it too much, seeing as things eventually panned out fine. Alma cuts him there and tells him to think about what the Inquisition would think about his abnormal abilities. She already has enough on her plate and would rather not allow Seth to add to it. it. Mauricio, there's a high chance that the villagers are probably reporting Seth to the Inquisition now. Annoyed, Seth tells her the villagers can't do something like that to the person who saved their village from a dangerous nemesis monster. Alma looks him dead in the eye and remembers what the villagers said to her moments after destroying the nemesis earlier. The villagers were caught with their tails between their legs as they now understood the true intentions of Alma and her apprentice, Seth. Tommy was the only person reasonable enough to give her a piece of the nemesis, and even thank her personally for saving them all. Not even that. He asks Alma to help him tell Seth that he's cool the way he is. After snapping back to reality, Alma gets up to make some tea. She tells Seth to make peace with the fact that people will never understand sorcerers who have been infected with the nemesis disease. Seth gets a little pissed off and tells Alma what he's going to do. He vows to find the source of the nemesis monsters and destroy them all so the world can be a safer place for sorcerers and the people. This makes Alma gasp in surprise as she's never heard of such a delusional wish in her life. Out of spite, she tells Seth about the dangerous nest of the nemesis monsters, aka the Radiant. Although believed to be just a legend, Seth promises Alma to find and destroy the Radiant sometime in his life. Alma tries warning him about the dangers he may face ahead, but Seth already made up his mind to take down the nemesis nest. In the end, Alma promises to take him on her next nemesis hunt. Seth looks down and asks Alma one more time why she's so chill with being called a monster and a bad person. Alma makes Seth some green tea and tells him not to worry too much about her, and that she's already used to the hate. Alma then returns to her room to rethink her life these past 10 years. While deep in thought, she recalls her previous memory of how it all began. Several years ago, Alma sustained a heavy injury that resulted in her losing her right arm. One morning, she woke up in the hospital and found young Seth sleeping on the bed next to hers. Just then, the doctor shows up and informs her of her situation. Alma had lost her memory from the severe head trauma she sustained during the accident that landed her in that hospital. The doctor, however, told her they rescued the boy with her when they found her holding on to him like he was her son or something. After recuperating in the hospital for a few weeks, Alma began the journey to find herself again, and this time, she took Seth along. As they glided through the skies and lands, Alma and Seth kept on asking people they could find if they knew a thing or two about them. Sadly, nobody could remember them. One evening, while trekking through the forest, Alma gets a headache and nearly falls off. Fortunately for her, she got herself back up and continued moving on to her next destination, learning all she could about sorcery and magic. By nightfall, Alma and Seth set up camp somewhere in the forest to pass off the night. Alma thought of leaving Seth that instant, but then again, Seth was the only clue she had towards finding herself again. So, she pressed on with the little boy and made sure she didn't leave him behind. A few months later, decided to settle down as a freelance nemesis hunter. One day during winter, Alma left Seth in their small shed to complete a job she'd previously gotten. Moments after leaving, some bullies show up at the shed and accuse Seth of bringing misfortune to their village. Despite Seth's pleas of innocence, the boys keep bullying Seth to anger. In the end, Seth loses control of his powers and blows both the shed and the boys out of his sight. Alma returns that night only to find her ward tied up at the stake and ready to be burnt alive by the angry villagers. She immediately steps up and saves Seth from being killed by the angry villagers and chases them away. Once they're all gone, she releases Seth from the ropes and hugs him as tight as she can. At that moment, Alma realized how small and helpless poor Seth was, so she decided to protect him as one of her own. She carried him and took him everywhere she went. To protect young Seth from disdain by the people, Alma bought a floating coven for herself and Seth so they could fly up in the sky, completely protected by the angry people. Life became much easier for Alma and Seth as they drifted through the clouds for several years on end. At the end of her story, Alma gets up from her seat and takes out one of Seth's coats with a smile on her face. The next morning, Seth wakes up and sneaks out of the house to begin his journey to search for the Radiant. Alma catches up to him and gives him her permission to go on his adventure. She gives him a parting gift and some gloves so he doesn't freeze from the cold. After that, she makes him promise her always to be the good little man he's always been. Seth bids her farewell and rushes forward to his next destination. He stops along the way and rushes back into Alma's arms to hug her tightly and thank her for keeping him safe all these years. Alma keeps her tears and encourages the young eagle to soar to the skies. Shortly after Seth's gone, she lets down the waterworks and cries as hard as she can. As he glides along the town, Seth finds Tommy and some of the other villagers repairing their village. This time, however, they bow down and thank him for helping them out when he could. Seth also greets them and continues his journey to his next adventure. Miles away, in a poorly lit church, a bunch of high-end officials belonging to the organization called the Inquisition meet to discuss a rare sighting with the general and their boss, General Torque. Torque starts the meeting by telling them about a young sorcerer with horns who could use magic with his bare hands. He was found gliding over the sea and could prove very dangerous if not handled ASAP. 3 days after Seth's departure, Alma receives another visitor from the Authority on Nemesis Research, a man who calls himself Doc. As it turns out, Alma was looking to gather the remains of the Nemesis she and Seth destroyed the previous day. Doc shows up on some raggedly old flying machine and introduces himself to Alma. Elsewhere, Captain Dragunov from the Inquisition pilots their ship towards restricted airspace. His subordinate shows up and asks him what he'd like them to do with the sorcerer they captured earlier. Dragunov only smiles as he thinks about the best punishment befitting their captured sorcerer. Meanwhile, Alma is seen complaining to Doc about him being late despite having called him 3 days ago. To defend himself, Doc tells Alma that he sent his assistant, a red-heated sorcerer, to come help him on the trip. He then asks her if she's seen her around. Sadly, Alma hasn't seen the red-heed. Doc wonders if she's gotten lost again, but then he comports himself, asks for his travel expenses, and tries to hustle Alma. Sadly for him, Alma already knew that his travel expenses were covered, so she calls his BS and urges him to get back to work. Seconds after the Doc leaves, Alma gets a little concerned and wonders where Seth may be at that instant. Little did she know that Seth was trying to escape Dragunov's clutches after he was caught flying across their ship. Seth causes a ruckus in the ship as Dragunov's soldiers are all clumped up around him. Dragunov shows up after hearing all the shouting to check up on the brat disturbing his peace. To his surprise, he finds little horns on Seth's head and remembers what his master, Torque, told him in the meeting earlier. Seth, on the other hand, is seen struggling to get himself off the soldiers. In the end, he uses his Titan Punch to blow the soldiers away from himself so he can get some breathing space. Dragunov speaks to Seth for the first time and calls him an idiot for using Fantasia on an Inquisition ship. According to law, if Seth can't provide a means of identification in time, then Dragunov and his people can imprison him. Seth grumbles a little bit and tells them it's not fair. Dragunov, who's had enough of Seth, locks him up in a small fitted cage and seizes his stuff. Angry Seth tries to use his magical Titan Punch to break himself out of the cage. Unfortunately for him, it didn't work. Dragunov gets closer to him and tells him he's been caged in a black-silver cage that inhibits the acquisition of Fantasia. Seth gets super pissed and blames them for delaying his journey to find Radiant. Upon hearing this, the soldiers get a little confused, but Dragunov explains the meaning to them. One of the soldiers asks Seth if he truly thinks a place like that exists. Seth tells them it does and promises to find it. To help prevent him from getting into further trouble, Dragunov tells Seth to avoid saying the word Radiant everywhere it goes, as it's a taboo to mention something of that nature outside. After that, Dragunov turns his back and explains the mission of the Inquisition to Seth. So the Inquisitors are those whose lives are dedicated to tracking down sorcerers and eradicating them off the face of the earth just so they can achieve world peace. In his explanation, Dragunov refers to Seth's horn and then lowers below the deck and into a darker room. On his way down to the cabin, Seth recalls one time when Alma warned him against showcasing his horns just anyhow to the people. In a flashback, Seth remembers the exact moment from 3 days ago, when he was bidding his guardian farewell. Alma had asked him where he'd intended to go to start looking for Radiant. Seth tells her a bunch of inconclusive words and ends up pissing Alma off. Eventually, she tells him to make his way to a town called Artemis, and make sure to find a man named Yaga there. Seth gets confused and asks her where and what Artemis is. Alma explains that Artemis is a place where sorcerers gather to research the supernatural. Seth continues his memory recollection until he's brought back to reality by a small dragon-like creature who finds its way into his cell. Seth recoils in fear and scares the creature, which flies back to the hair of a familiar redhead lady. The lady wakes up and introduces herself as a sorcerer named Mali. Now, Mali was the assistant Doc sent to Island 21 to retrieve the remains of the Nemesis. Seth gets a little surprised at the entire arrangement, but isn't allowed to say a thing as Mr. Boobry pops out of Melly's head. Melly introduces it as her friend and tells Seth that she was separated from the only person who could identify her, aka Doc. As such, she was captured and held against her will in that cabin. Moving on, Melly sees Seth's horns and gets excited enough to ask him some irritable questions about it. Seth stops her from intruding and throws a tantrum for the weird Mali. Mali extends her hand to shake Seth, but then the entire ship shakes as Doc docked his ship at the Inquisition vessel. He gets off his ship and introduces himself as an ordinary doctor there to retrieve his assistant. He knows he mustn't let them know that he's carrying Nemesis's remains with him, or else the repercussions may be bad enough for him. Mali finds him and calls his name without any regard. She even goes as far as telling the soldiers and guards about the Nemesis he recovered from Island 21. Doc tried his best to save himself, but it was already too late as his cover's already been blown. So, Doc is captured and imprisoned alongside Mali and Seth. There, The three argue and get to know each other. After the hubbub, Seth asks Doc for his identity. Doc tells him he's a researcher from Artemis and not a sorcerer of any sort. Seth gets curious and asks Doc why he's so intent on getting the Nemesis to Artemis. Doc tells him he wants the reward for the remains and hopes he can get them before Dragunov and his men tear it to pieces. He then lies in his cell and explains the harsh reality of the average sorcerer's life. Seth tells him he can end all that by destroying the Radiant. This expression comes as a shock to both Doc and Mei Li, as they never thought someone so little could say something so crazy. Seth mentions Alma, and this sends a chill down Doc's spine. He gets up and starts arguing with Seth when suddenly, Boobry shows up with the keys to their cell. Surprised, Mei Li and the others get themselves out of their cells and plan a secret escape from the Inquisition ship. Seth moves on to get his stuff back, and the other two follow him to search all over the ship for his stuff. Eventually, they find Seth's stuff with two guards, hauling it somewhere else. Seth proposes they follow the guard, but then it's already too late, as Dragunov already found them out. Without fail, they're surrounded by dozens of guards. The trio tried to plead for mercy, but Dragunov wasn't hearing all that. Rather, he orders his soldiers to go get the prisoners. Seth uses his Titan Punch to punch a hole in their formation. Dragunov's archers shoot a bunch of arrows at the three of them. Mei Li uses her defensive magic to block the arrow attacks, but it soon loses its integrity and crumbles. Up next, the swordsmen show up and hold all three of them at the sword point. Mei Li gets so scared that she faints and switches to her alternate personality, which is a baddie type of melee. Without thinking twice, she activates her destructive power and defeats all the soldiers on Dragunov's ship. When he is asked what happened, Doc tells Seth that Mei Li's alternate personality only comes out when she's under extreme stress. Mei Li knocks down all the soldiers, but then fails to realize Dragunov, who's already raised his arrows to her forehead. Before he gets to do anything, Seth gets on his broomstick and uses his Titan Punch to tip the ship off balance. In all the hubbub, Seth takes his friends and flies them to the ship before escaping the Inquisitor's ship. On their way to Artemis, Seth commends Mei Li for using her alternate reality to save them back there. He gets very restive and asks the Doc about their journey to Artemis. In a few minutes, Seth gets to see the beautiful city of Artemis in all its splendor. Without wasting any more time, Doc enters the Artemis ship and passes through a series of magic circles for inspection and identification. Finally, they're granted access to the inner chamber of the Artemis ship. Seth is awed by the beautiful floating boats he found floating all around the space. After passing that space, they get their own parking space and dock the ship. Then, they alight their ship and walk to the first security checkpoint to ID themselves before they're allowed access to the residential areas. The security tells Seth that he has to register as a resident to gain access to the residential areas. Seth, however, wasn't interested in being a resident, as all he ever wanted was to find Yaga and be on his merry way. Doc, on the other hand, realizes becoming a resident is a good way for him to get rid of Seth. He rushes toward the security guy and asks him about the next admission ceremony at the Artemis Academy. The security guard, who's scared shitless, tells Doc it's about to start. Doc immediately picks Seth up and drags him to the ceremony. On their way there, Seth stops by a balcony to sightsee the wondrous city of Artemis. He sees various witches flying to their various destinations and asks Mei Li about it. Mei Li tells him about the peace and prosperity Artemis has seen for thousands of years, and even calls it the sorcerer's paradise. Doc cuts them short and advises them to hurry up their tour so they can get to the admission ceremony before it's too late. Seth takes him up on his word and races to the ceremony holding Doc all the way. Unknowingly, they pass by a cauldron housing a man inside. The man pops out of the cauldron after hearing Alma from Seth's mouth and wonders if the youngster is related to her. Seth and the others arrive at the Artemis Academy Majestic Castle just in time to witness the introduction of the school's headmaster, a yellow cat named Master Lord Majesty. Majesty gets into the spotlight and gives the newbies a welcome speech, encouraging them to help him achieve his goal, which is to create a world free of curses or suffering from sorcerers. After his introductory speech, he welcomes the newbies to the stage and grants them all access to the facilities on the campus. To finish their sign-in, however, Majesty gives each newbie a contract to sign and urges them to sign it without reading the contents of the contract. Seth and 3 other newbies blindly sign the contract, only to find out that they were agreeing to be in financial debt with the school. When they find out about the debt, it's already too late as they've already signed it. Seth tries to call Majesty out on his BS, but then the others tell them it's tradition. To pay their debts, they will have to embark on missions as Artemis sorcerers to make the world a safer place for the sorcerers. This means they ain't getting paid for their work. Upon noticing this, Doc gets a smug look and laughs at his genius. Sadly for him, he's also to take part in the debt repayment as the official guardian of Seth and Mei Li. At this point, Doc faints. In the next scene, Seth, Doc, and Mei Li all sulk over the unfortunate situation they're in at the moment. Seth complains about Majesty a little bit and eventually accepts his fate. Doc throws a tantrum and Seth manages to calm him down. He promises to leave Artemis once he's found Yaga and the location of the Radiant. This doesn't sit well with Doc as he knows all the debt will be his once Seth leaves Artemis. Nonetheless, Seth and Maylee make their plans without him. Later on, Seth and his buddies get a little tired and decide to rest a little bit. Seth proposes they walk around the intersecting alleyways, hoping they'd find Yaga somewhere along the way. Doc tries his best to stop them, but the two youngsters keep on moving forward. They spend money they don't even have and begin increasing their debt until it reaches a whopping 21,000 dimes. At one point in their search, the trio visit a pub to ask the grown-ups for some information. Doc and Seth get into another argument, and Maylee wanders off to a table to ask a man about Yaga. The man disrespects her and causes her emotional stress. This makes Maylee switch personalities and use her magic in the pub. Without thinking of the repercussions, she destroys a portion of the pub and raises their debt to 12 million dimes. At this point, Doc knows he exists to pay up their debt and may die before he even finishes paying up. That evening, he sits by the roadside with his two youngsters, worrying over how he's gonna pay the debt. Eventually, he faints and leaves the two to talk. Seth and Maylee overhear two sorcerers appreciating the peace Artemis brings them and are grateful they decided to move there, despite how expensive the place is. Seth suddenly gets the impression that the place is as peaceful as it gets. Just then, the man in the cauldron pops up near them and says hi. Seth and Maylee are a little shocked to see a cauldron talk. The old man inside the cauldron gets out of it and confirms that the kids are searching for the cauldron. Before telling them he's Yaga, he asks the kids to tell him what they feel about Majesty's preachings and the world he's built. Seth admits that although the Yellow Cat is a con man, the city he built is still peaceful and free from discriminators. Yaga smiles and asks them if they truly know why the Yellow Cat demanded so much money from the sorcerers. Seth fumbles around as he fails to find a good reason why Majetti demands so much money from them. Just before Yaga explains why, Yaga leaves the kids to experience the strong defense of the Artemis military. Doc freaks out and tells Seth that the Inquisition must have followed them there. Yaga calms them down and tells them to watch and see what happens. As Dragunov's ship approaches Artemis, hundreds of armed witches flood the skies of Artemis to defend the city. Dragunov convinces his small army to retreat so they can fight another day. Luckily for him, his plan works and they get to live another day. Seth, Doc, and Maylee are so grateful for getting saved and protected from the Inquisition. Just then, Yaga explains the reason why Majesty demanded so much money from them. He uses the money to strengthen the military and make sure his people don't suffer attacks. Seth, however, tells Yaga about his dream to go find Radiant and destroy it. Yaga tries to convince him to stay and build a good life here in Artemis, but Coconut Head Seth tells him he's hell-bent on finding Radiant and destroying it to pieces. Seth's courage impresses Yaga, so he introduces himself as Yaga. Elsewhere, Dragunov informs his General Torque, about Seth's existence. Torque asks to ensure Dragunov isn't telling him lies. Dragunov swears on his mother's name that he saw Seth with horns. With that, Torque dismisses him and tells his secret assassin to prepare himself to hunt and capture Seth and his minions as they think he somehow poses a threat to the world. The following day, Melly wakes up with her dolls Gudul and Gertrude and prepares herself to have fun with them. Before she knows it, Seth crashes into her apartment and begs her to teach him the ropes around learning magic. Maylee sits him down and asks him why he wants to learn magic. Seth takes a deep breath and tells Maylee that Yaga refused to train him, as he was too weak to even train under him. Seth tries to use the Alma student card, but then again, Yaga wants to see some raw talent. So, Seth tries to impress him by gathering Fantasia in his bare hands and punching something. Sadly, Yaga wasn't impressed one bit, as he didn't think the Titan Punch was a good enough offensive magic. Seth was there to beseech Maylee to help him out. He thinks she could switch to her alternate self and teach him some good offensive magic. Maylee puts her head down and apologizes for not being able to do such a thing with him because she just can't switch personalities at will, and with the way she is right now, she can only teach defensive magic. Seth then asks her to teach him how to gather Fantasia from the air, and Melly does a whack display of whooshes and hms that eventually surmount to nothing. Disappointed, Seth realizes he's in trouble as there's nobody he knows who's skilled enough to teach him magic. He apologizes with a smile on his face and decides to go learn things by himself. Ridden with guilt, Melly asks him to stop and follow her somewhere, that she has an idea. Seth follows Melly to an outdoor cafe to find Doc. There, they find the poor lover boy, holding a small bouquet and waiting for the cafe owner, a beautiful lady named Melba, to show up from the entrance and grace him with her presence. Unfortunately for him, Melly and Seth destroyed his proposal before his woman of honor could even approach him. Doc unintentionally gifts Melly the flowers and recoils in shock when his crush, Miss Melba shows up to welcome them to the cafe. Being very cheerful, Melba asks after the young man she's never seen around before, and Melly introduces her to Seth. With a happy look on her face, Melba wishes Seth a wonderful stay in their wonderful city and hopes he comes around ever so often. While they discuss, Doc leers at Melba, and Melba's dad, who's a puppet in her hand, pops out of nowhere and punches Doc for staring at his daughter so lustfully. The duo gets into a huge fight, and this makes Melba sad about things. To make it up to them, she decides to serve them their best dishes, and does so in the finest fashion. After filling their bellies with the best delicacies, Seth tells Melba about his mission to find the Radiant and save the world of sorcerers. Melba surprisingly seems happy and interested in the brave young man called Seth. She gets close to him and asks for more details. Seth tells her about his current handicap and asks Doc if he could teach him how to use offensive magic. Initially, Doc isn't up for anything like that, but then Melba gives a cute look and cajoles him emotionally till he agrees to help Seth learn his offensive magic. Poor Doc's got his heart controlled by a cutie. Moving on, Melba serves them her special rainbow tea and makes the three of them drink from it. Seth, Melly, and Doc all take a drink from the tea and are instantly disgusted at how foul and weird it tastes. Melba had made the tea out of roasted beef and served it to them. Before they all die from the terrible tea, Doc settles the bill and takes his apprentices as far away from the cafe as possible. His excuse? He wants them to begin their training as soon as possible. In the next scene, Doc takes Seth to a plain field and explains the rules of the training to him. He's not going to use any Fantasia since he's just a researcher and the most he can do is read grimoires. Seth asks him to teach him how to use the Meteor Drop's offensive magic. Doc opens a grimoire and dishes out instructions Seth has to follow to accumulate Fantasia into his body. Seth tried a few times but couldn't get the Meteor Drops to form. Eventually, Seth gets pissed and uses his bare hands to make the Meteor Drops. He ends up injuring Doc and making him have bandages all over his body. After training, the trio sit somewhere to discuss the results of their training. Doc insults Seth and calls him talentless, just like Tommy did initially, and this causes Melly to feel very sad and uncomfortable for Seth. As a result, she switches personalities and lets her alternate personality take over training Seth. Without considering the damage she'll deal, Melly's alternate personality destroys the entire cafe and sends Doc flying high into the sky. Then, she chases after Seth and tells him to quit being so weak and attack her fair and square. Seth runs for dear life and ends up crashing into a building. Melly gets disgusted at the weakling she's training and tells him to attack her to save his life at least. She tries attacking again, but this time, Seth decides to return the attack and surprisingly, he does the Meteor Drops offensive magic for the first time. This makes Seth so happy that he stops attacking and gloats about his new skill to Melly. Melly switches back to her normal self and throws a fuss over the damage she dealt to the surroundings. Their debt has increased now, and there's nothing they can do about it. After commending each other, Seth and Melly find Dog hanging in a tree and then proceed to find Yaga and show him his new offensive magic skill. After seeing what Seth can do, Yaga issues him a note of warning to make sure Seth is ready for the trials and tribulations he's going to face. Finally, Yaga tests the power of Seth's hand and initiates a magic attack with his Cauldron. As expected, Seth dispels the magic attack with his bare hands and saves himself from trouble. Yaga explains his strict training regimen to Seth, so he knows what he's getting himself into. Seth happily accepts all and gets ready for the next training day. The following morning, Melly wakes up in her apartment and opens her window only for Seth to crash into it again to make a ridiculous request. He asks Melly to lend him her house as Doc doesn't want him sleeping in the park. Thankfully, Melly had a room to spare, so she lets Seth stay with her for a while. Seth thanks her and makes a weird comment about her doll. Melly gets very shy and explains that the doll is her friend. Later that day, Seth joins Yaga, the Cauldron guy in a harsh training regimen. Things take a turn for worse when Yaga uses his Cauldron crash on Seth and knocks the scared little dude to the ground. In the meantime, Doc is seen enjoying a hot cup of early morning coffee at his usual spot in Melba's cafe. He takes a sip and stares ever so silently at his beloved Melba. As he soliloquizes, his two disgruntled apprentices, Seth and Melia, show up out of the blue to disturb his peaceful morning. In a second, Doc returns to his normal depressed state and his two apprentices order coffees to help them recuperate their bodies after training. Melly and Seth try to carry their Doc along, but Doc isn't feeling them. Melba steps in and offers Doc her latest coffee. Doc recalls the terrible taste he experienced from her previous coffee and considers rejecting her offer. Then again, she's Melba and has been his crush for a while now, so he decides to take the risk and try out her new coffee. Upon taking a sip, Doc realizes how delicious the coffee tastes. He instantly gets up on his feet and does a dramatic display of his love for this new blend of coffee. Unknown to Doc, who was standing by a sewer manhole. There was a creature just waiting for him to get way too close to the aquifer hole. So, it crept out of the hole when Doc wasn't looking, dragged his right leg, and pulled him into the aquifer. Seth and Melly tried to save him, but it was already too late. Moments after their beloved Doc was pulled into the manhole, Yaga arrives with a book and describes the creature that just abducted Doc. The devilfish kraken is a failed lab experiment that was dumped into the Artemis underground water system and made to live out its eternity in solitude. Thankfully, this creature isn't a man-eating monster, as it only loves to drink coffee. It must have abducted Doc because Doc reeks of coffee. Nonetheless, the group still believes Doc is in danger because Yaga tells them there's a high chance that the fish kraken will eat Doc whole. Upon realizing this, Seth and Melly get scared and try calling their beloved Doc's name from the manhole. Doc, on the other hand, wakes up in one of the rooms in the aquifer and finds the kraken sipping his coffee. He silently gets up and tries to escape the aquifer, but the kraken finds him and holds his leg. Just as it was about to eat Doc, the smell of coffee reaches that part of the aquifer, and the kraken rushes towards the source. A few meters away, Seth, Yaga, and Meili stand in front of a big pail full of coffee. They plan to lure the kraken out to their location using the smell of the coffee, and it works. Soon after, the kraken surfaces from the aquifer system holding Doc in one of its tentacles. Seth and Melly call on Doc to make sure he's okay. After finding out that he's okay, Seth tries punching the kraken with his Titan Punch. Sadly, this doesn't work at all. The kraken picks up the pail of coffee, drenches Seth and Melly in ink, and then makes a run for it. Seth and Melly are left completely knocked out from the ink attack. Elsewhere, Dragunov instructs his army commander to quit being so restive about their surroundings. The commander, however, tells his captain that he's only trying to make sure they're not caught off guard, just in case the horned sorcerer attacks them again. Dragunov thanks him for his services and gives Seth's powers another thought. In the meantime, Seth and Meili dried up their clothes as it was wet from the ink attack. Seth cusses at the kraken and realizes he has to learn a stronger magic spell as quickly as possible so he can take down a more powerful foe next time. Meili comes up with a dumb idea to use traps she uses to catch the nemesis monsters to somehow capture the kraken. Seth goes along with her plan, but unfortunately, it doesn't work as the traps catch Doc instead. They try using fishnets, but still, Doc gets the short end of the stick. At this point, one may feel very sorry for Doc as their next 3 attempts to rescue him end up injuring him. Eventually, Yaga steps in and advises them to leave Doc for his new life. Seth and Meili refuse to let their beloved Doc die a horrible death, so they cook up another plan to brute force their way in and save Doc from the kraken. But how do they do something like that? Fortunately, Melba steps in and gives them a good idea, and they decide to try it out. In the next scene, Seth and Meili approach the kraken with another pail of coffee, but this time, Doc refuses to be saved and just asks them to let him live his life with his new friend, Devil. Surprised at this human-beast interaction, Seth decides he's going to save Doc from his madness no matter what it takes. So, he drenches himself in Melba's special blend of coffee and allows the kraken monster to swallow him whole. Doc screams his lungs out and begs his new friend not to eat his friend, but unfortunately, it is already too late. Moments after swallowing Seth, the kraken feels a weird sensation in his stomach. Eventually, he spits out Seth and all the coffee he's been drinking the past few days, and even ends up falling to the lower levels of the aquifer. Seth and Meili immediately attack the kraken to subdue it. Just as they're about to finish it, Doc shows up and protects his friend. He calls Devil his friend and begs Seth not to destroy him with his Titan Punch. Seth realizes just how close Doc is to the kraken and decides to let the kraken off the hook. Doc gets saved and returns to his normal life with his annoying apprentices, Meili and Seth. Over a cup of coffee, Seth thinks a little and realizes he still has a long way to go if he wants to become much stronger than he already is. Doc remains silent until Melba shows up with her puppet dad to check up on them. Doc gets a little flustered and reviews the coffee blend she gave him to drink before he was abducted the previous day. Sadly for him, he finds out the hard way that Melba's father was the one who made the coffee for him, so his compliment went to the wrong person. Doc realizes he's back on his bad luck streak and quickly accepts his life as it is. After their morning coffee, Seth gets back to training with Yaga, his master. At one point in his training, Seth destroys the gloves Alma gave him and gets handicapped, and gives Seth a pair of special gloves. These new gloves are laced with black silver, which prohibits the accumulation of Fantasia. Seth gets frustrated as he can't understand why Yaga wouldn't want him to use Fantasia. He asks Yaga why he would do something like that to him, and Yaga tells him it's because he gets too careless with his Fantasia. Currently, he can't teach someone who isn't calm enough to gather wild Fantasia and use it responsibly. Seth protests this, but Yaga ends up leaving him with the black silver gloves on, Until he finds a good enough reason to get stronger, Seth is prohibited from taking off those gloves, and if tries to double-cross Yaga, then he gets expelled from Yaga's training regimen. With this, Seth is left with no choice but to obey his master, even if it means doing something he doesn't like. After training, Seth heads over to Melba's cafe to get some breakfast. While munching a huge Subway sandwich, Seth complains and grumbles over Yaga's bogus philosophies and wishes he could be more straightforward towards him. Melba arrives to serve them tea and finds Seth complaining about Yaga maltreating him in the name of training. Upon asking for some details, Seth divulges every nasty thing he has to say about Yaga and hopes Melba and her puppet dad will understand him. Seconds later, Doc shows up in a hurry and says hi to Melba and her impudent father before getting to the point. Doc tells Seth and Melly that they've been summoned by Master Lord Majesty, the headmaster of Artemis Academy, and are to report to him immediately. Upon getting to his palace, Majesty tells them about the humongous debt they've managed to gather in such a short period. Initially, Seth and Melee get excited as they think they've set a cool new record. Sadly, Majesty breaks the bad news to them and tells them not to think they're out of the woods just yet. He gives them a good option to get themselves out of the debt they're currently in, and the trio takes it. In the next scene, Melly, Doc, and Seth are all seen cleaning some of the advertisement signs for the Academy just like Majesty instructed them to do, while Melly uses her magic to clean multiple portions of the big letters at a time. Seth is limited to cleaning his spots manually since his ability to gather Fantasia has been prohibited. Seth sees Melee using her magic so seamlessly and gets a little jealous, so he decides to increase his cleaning speed and make sure he does his work as fast as possible. Doc, on the other hand, is seen in a dark room spinning a mechanism while thinking about Miss Melba. He gets carried away in his thoughts and ends up spinning the mechanism out of control. Moments later, Seth and Melly finish cleaning their spots so they can have some time to themselves. Suddenly, the duo looks up and finds a familiar broomstick with 4 people approaching the top of the advertisement sign they were cleaning earlier. Seth watches them land and gets closer to say hi. Upon getting there, he finds out they're the Bravery Quartet. Seth didn't recognize them at first, but then they displayed some weird theatrics that made Seth remember their devious selves. Melee joins Seth seconds later and finds the weirdos in underwear. She gets a little freaked out when she finds them wearing just underwear, but Seth tells her about their devious nature and assures her that he's going to stop at nothing to protect her. When it comes down to it, Melee steps forward and attacks them with her meteor, shower offensive magic. Seth, who's unable to do anything, stays behind and watches Melee steal all the glory. The 4 criminals use their underwear to deflect her magic attacks and even gloat about the entire thing to the bunch. After their boisterous talks, the 4 criminals point their underwear toward Melee and Seth and then shoot them some offensive magic to attack the duo. Melee and Seth manage to deflect the attacks and even counter their attack. The 4 criminals deflect the attacks and face the 2 of them. Don Bossman, their leader, notices the black-silver gloves on Seth's hands and offers him a deal. If he can let them steal what they came there to steal, then Don Bossman would help him remove the black-silver gloves without getting him in trouble. To make his deal more believable, Don Bossman sweet-talks Seth into considering his offer. When all's been said and done, Seth decides not to accept the deal. He tells them flat out that the deal's not going to work, and this pisses Don Bossman. He punishes Seth by blasting him and Melee with his ultimate bravery attack. This huge attack causes emotional stress on Melee, and changes her personality to the alternate one. In no time, he uses the Ignis Rumpier magic attack to throw the 4 criminals off balance. Unfortunately, this doesn't work, so Seth comes up with another plan to make it work. He rushes towards the criminals and uses the explosion from Melee's next attack as a boost to get past the criminals' line of defense. This plan works, and destroys Gigi, aka Don Bossman's defense specialist. Don, however, gets close to Melee and holds her hostage, threatening to do something bad to her if Seth doesn't let them do their thing. Mr. Boobry disrupts Don Bossman's attention and causes him to fall off the edge of the advertisement sign, which is high up in the air. Without thinking, Seth dives down to save Don Bossman from certain death. As he glides towards the ground, Seth realizes he needs to use magic if he's going to save both of them. So, he disobeys his teacher, Yaga, and forcefully removes the gloves on his hands, enduring all the shock while he's at it. Eventually, he manages to get the gloves off just in time, and ends up saving Don Bossman from fall damage. After their audacious ordeal, Seth and Melee return to Yaga to apologize for taking the gloves off without his permission. Given the circumstances they were under, Yaga lets him off the hook and decides to take him back in. After the celebrations, Yaga repairs Seth's old magic gloves and returns them to the rightful owner. Only this time, he added a handless design to this, just so he could maximize his Fantasia gathering potential and also up his chances of becoming stronger than ever before. Surprised and happy, Seth tries gathering Fantasia with his new gloves and eventually gathers loads of them at a time. While he discusses, Melee gets the feeling that they're forgetting something but can't can't pinpoint exactly what they are forgetting. Just then, Doc is seen deep underground, still spinning the mechanism as his life slowly drains away from his body. Majesty, on the other hand, enjoys life in his palace. After getting back on the same team as Yaga, Seth takes Yaga and Meili out to Melba's cafe to eat and drink some of her coffee. When their food arrives, Seth eats voraciously, while Yaga reads the paper about the Inquisition. He makes a few comments about them and Seth misjudges them for being the bad guys. Yaga stops him there and lets him know that not all Inquisition members are bad guys. Some of them have a different and more sensible school of thought. That's a little different from the well-known way of thinking. This comes as a surprise to both Meili and Seth, as they never thought there could be any good guys amongst the Inquisition. Several feet high up in the air, Dragunov is seen taking a deep breath from the nice evening breeze while his team pilots his ship to the unknown. While at it, he gets down to doing a little cloud fishing and even gets bored at some point. However, just when he thought he'd caught something, his vice captain shows up and distracts him well enough for his catch to be lost. Dragunov gets a little pissed and almost punishes the vice captain for distracting him, but then again, Dragunov decides to be chill about things and just let it slide. Moving on, the vice captain complains about the shortage in their ship's food supplies and asks Dragunov if there's anything he wishes to do about it. Dragunov apologizes for being a little harsh on them and tells them he never expected them to spend this long on standby without a mission. To make it up to his crew, Dragunov decides to cook them a nice fish dinner for the night. The vice captain gets a little too happy to hear his captain cooking for his team. A few meters away, 2 guards, 1 stay light, and a newbie are seen cleaning up the ship's deck. They eavesdrop on the conversation between the captain and his vice, and this makes the newbie a little shocked at how ordinary the great Dragunov, feared as the Lynx Eye, is to his people. Before losing focus on his job for the day, the newbie quickly gets back to work and hopes to see some action from his captain before he loses all respect for him. That night, Dragunov cooks his specialty fish dish for his boys and serves them when it's done and at its finest. Almost immediately after he serves them, the boys eat out of the meal and enjoy it voraciously. The newbie, however, refuses to eat his food as nothing seems right to him. What was Dragunov doing and why was he serving his boys instead of the other way around? He stares at Dragunov, who was sipping something, and quickly removes his gaze when he realizes he's been caught. Later that night, after dinner, the newbie kind of runs into his captain, while Dragunov takes in the cool evening breeze. He immediately tries to get out of Dragunov's sight, but then Dragunov calls him back to ask him something. After getting Dragunov's attention, the newbie asks him what he was doing there. Dragunov answers his question and tells him a little about himself, as he suspects the newbie may be disappointed in him. The newbie learns a few things about his honorable captain, but couldn't get to know him that well as rain began falling shortly. Dragunov sits this one out and makes his men protect the ship from thunder strikes. In his room, Dragunov senses something hiding within the clouds, but decides to ignore it and focus on saving his ship. Thankfully, Dragunov's ship survives the night and morning comes as quickly as possible. The newbie, who's been working all night, takes a break with his 2 partners and decides to ask them about their captain. The newbie seems disappointed to see their captain getting things easy, while the other Inquisitors like Captain Conrad and Rumbletown have all the fun. In the meantime, Dragunov helps his men repair his ship when suddenly, a soldier runs in with an emergency signal from one of their troops on another island. Apparently, they were hit by a nemesis and needed help pronto. Dragunov stops what he's doing and immediately rushes to their rescue. Elsewhere, Seth and his master, Yaga, sit and discuss the Inquisitors. Yaga tells Seth not to think all Inquisitors are bad, as there may be some good ones amongst them. Meili reasons with Yaga and accepts the fact that there may be good Inquisitors somewhere. Hours later, Dragunov and his team arrive at the island where his fellow Captain Edmund and his team are docked. He asks a few questions to figure out what happened, and even asks after the location of the nemesis that attacked them. Captain Edmund remains indifferent about the whereabouts of the nemesis. For all he knows, the nemesis might be attacking the next human settlement close by. What he cares about is his mission to deliver the sorcerers to their HQ. Dragunov asks to see the sorcerers, and Edmund happily shows him his dungeon filled with them. Dragunov senses something wrong with this shipment of sorcerers, but chooses to do nothing about it. The newbie, on the other hand, seems psyched to see so many sorcerers captured at once. Dragunov and his team decide to help Edmund repair his broken ship, and they do this for several hours till evening. By evening time, Edmund walks onto Dragunov's ship to ask about the progress of the repairs. Dragunov tells him not to worry too much about things as they should be airborne by tonight. Edmund chuckles nervously and tries to be feisty about things. Just then, the nemesis that attacked them glides over Dragunov's ship and sends fear into the spines of Edmund and his men. Dragunov, on the other hand, remains unfazed as he realizes the nemesis isn't interested in them at all. Instead, it headed for a town nearby. Upon hearing this, Edmund heaves a sigh of relief as he knows they'll be safe for the main time. Dragunov and the newbie try asking him for help to save the people in the nearby town, but Edmund refuses to waste any resources to help the poor people, despite the pleas from the newbie. Dragunov keeps quiet and waits for his men to show up at the right time. When they do, Dragunov gives them a brief speech before letting his men go for their fight. In a few minutes, the newbie finally gets to see some action as Dragunov and his men head towards the town to capture the Nemesis and rescue the people. Edmund and his team stay behind and wait for the horrible news about Dragunov's death to reach him. To his dismay, Dragunov and his men return completely unscathed after saving the entire village from destruction by the Nemesis. Edmund feigns a little ignorance of Dragunov's feat and tries to flee the scene. However, it was already too late for him as Dragunov already knew who he was. Firstly, he releases the so-called prisoners Edmund had in his dungeons and arrests the fraud Edmund, sending him to the High Court to be judged for holding innocent people against their will. Later that night, Dragunov earns the newbie's respect and serves his men another fish dish. Everyone digs in and enjoys their meal as they should. While watching his men eat, Dragunov recalls the wound he found on the Nemesis's belly and wonders who could have done such a thing. At that moment, a masked figure is seen standing on a broomstick, expressing how impressed he was to see someone like Dragunov drive off such a big beast. Eventually, he decides to call it a night and get ready for his next strike. In another scene, Melee serves Seth some tea after catching him in the rain. Seth talks about Doc, who he saw drinking coffee at Melba's shop earlier that day. Doc, who seems to be having the time of his life in the rain, gets slapped by a woman's underwear while drinking his favorite coffee blend. The following day, Seth wriggles his body around his hammock as he dreams about a memory he had with Alma, when she saved him from being burnt at the stake by the angry villagers several years ago. As the dreams play out, Seth commends Alma's efforts to make him into the man he is today, and promises to be a world-renowned sorcerer that Alma can be proud of. He wakes up from his hammock hail, ready to get on with his normal daily activities, and looks at his stuff before heading out of bed. Upon meeting up with his partner Mealy, Seth heads into town with her and notices the festivities all over town. Seth asks Mealy for some clarity about the festival, and Mealy tells him Headmaster Majesty is currently hosting a random festival in that town for the people. When Seth asks her what the special event is, Mealy tells him she doesn't know. As they approach Miss Melba's coffee shop, Doc, who was busy taking some coffee, overhears them and tells them the real reason why Majesty was hosting the tournament. Apparently, Majesty was looking to give foreigners a reason to come to Artemis and spend their hard currency so he could make more money. Anyways, Seth seems pretty excited about the entire festival, despite the foul reason behind the party. Doc tells them not to rack their dummy brains too much about the details, and advises them to make themselves useful by entering the broom race competition and earning some prize money so they can clear a large chunk of their debt. Seth and Mealy see this as a great idea to have fun and clear their debt. So, they wait for the big announcement from Majesty and find out they will be awarded 10 million dimes if they win the broom race. Seth and Mealy immediately rush outside to register but are soon flustered when they find out they have to pay to enter the race. Since they're broke, they're left with nothing to do. As they think of a plan, a spoilt rich kid who also turns out to be the two-time champion of the broom race, Nick, shows up with his two servants and gloats over his previous achievements in the broom race. Seth and Mealy get a little confused as they don't know the doofus rambling on in front of them. After a brief introduction by his servants, Mealy remembers who Nick is and explains that he's a good-for-nothing who is just lucky to have money. Nick takes the insult like a champ and dishes out his revenge on poor Seth by insulting Alma, his master. Seth gets understandably pissed and lets Nick know that his master, Alma, is the strongest sorcerer he's ever known. Nick tells Seth to put his money where his mouth is and prove that Alma's the strongest by beating him in the broom race. Seth takes him up on his challenge and watches the idiot and his two doofus servants go. After they're gone, Mealy asks Seth to tell her a bit about her master. Seth narrates the horrible night he got his punishment from Alma. In a flashback, Seth relives the horrible night when he had to clean the walls of their ship as punishment for releasing the cattle. Not only that, he also relives his last moment with Alma and heartfully remembers the wonderful gifts Alma gave him to help him on his journey to find and take out the Radiant. After mouthing encouraging words to her ward, Alma and Seth bid each other a heartwarming farewell to see each other sometime soon. Following his story, Seth returns to his room to retrieve Alma's special broom for the race. In a few hours, Majesty calls everyone from Artemis to gather at the arena to watch the race happen. While Seth arrives at the track with his normal broom, the other racers arrive on fancy sport-themed brooms. Seth initially feels out of place, but then again, the teases and aggressive bants from the others fire him up for greatness. Soon, Mealy joins them in the race and says hi to her buddy, Seth. Seth welcomes her on board and wishes her a safe trip. Doc, on the other hand, is seen ranting and regretting ever advising his apprentices to join the race. Moments before the race begins, Seth recalls the special day of training he had with Yaga and Mei Li's alternate personality and uses his experience as encouragement for this race. If he could survive the embarrassment back then to get the hang of offensive magic, then this race is no match for him. The start buzzer comes on and the racers immediately spring into action. Seth and Mei Li work together to crash some of the other racers while maintaining their lanes. Their display impresses Doc and Yaga, who were watching them from the audience stands. Halfway through the race, Majesty joins the racers on his special ultra-fast ship. He cheats the entire race and blows off most of the racers with his majestic wing. Then, he uses a few more weapons to shoot some of the other racers down, including Seth and Mei Li. Sadly for him, this didn't work as Seth was smarter than the Majesty. He attacks the Majesty's ship from the top, but the Majesty defends the attack by shooting a laser beam at him. Seth shocks everybody by using the Repulse Defense spell to defend himself before blowing Majesty's ship out of proportion. Mei Li loses her step and falls to the ground, but Seth catches her and continues racing his only opponent, Nick, and his two servants to the finish line. Nick wins the race by a hair's length, but Seth ends up saving the idiot's two servants after they fell a few seconds to the finish line. Seth gains appreciation from the fans, and Majesty brings the entire festival to a close. That night, Seth, Doc, and Mei Li all complain about their loss and wish they had better odds. Doc gets annoyed as usual and shakes the hell out of Seth, who was only laughing. While all that happens, the masked man from earlier, a guy who calls himself Grim, finally arrives at his target town, Rumbletown, and gets ready to begin his mission in the town that never sleeps. The following morning, Doc realizes how badly he and his team are in debt. At this point, he may as well kiss his marriage to his beautiful woman, Miss Melba, good be, as he doesn't think they can recover from the debt. As he soliloquizes his dreadful dreams, Melba shows up with an order for some customers and serves them. And Doc realizes he has to repay that debt as quickly as possible, or risk getting rejected by the love of his life. Desperate to find a job, Doc ruffles up some paper on his coffee table and finds nothing he could work with. Suddenly, he finds one piece of paper with a request from Rumbletown for fully fledged sorcerers who can fight a nemesis attacking their city at certain times during the day and night. Judging by the difficulty and danger of the mission, Doc decides not to bother doing the mission, despite it being a high-paying one. Just as he's about to put the paper down, Seth and Mei Li show up and take a look at the paper once more after Doc tries to hide it from them. After finding out the details, they manage to convince Doc to accept the mission. Besides, if they can catch the said nemesis alive, then they get a huge reward that might clear up their debt. Doc tries to protest this by telling them the Inquisition will intervene and do something about things. However, Seth and Mei Li remind him what was clearly written on the document and mention that it says the Inquisition is doing nothing about the situation on the ground. With this, Doc is left with no choice but to keep refusing to help them. At one point in the back and forth conversation, Melba joins them and asks if Doc is going on the Nemesis hunt with his buddies. Doc tries to explain his point of view, but Melba doesn't let him speak. She cajoles him into accepting the mission, and Doc does so without fail. You know, he needs to look good for his lady, even if he isn't truly happy to do this with his apprentices. At the docks, Doc and his people ready their ships to begin sailing to Rumbletown. As Doc complains about everything his apprentices do, Yaga shows up to remind Seth about the reason why he fights for his people. Seth thanks him for the help and promises not to disappoint him. On their way there, Doc and Mei Li's ship get spotted by Dragunov and his minions. They immediately figure out where Doc's disguised ship is headed and decide to follow them. Hours away from Rumbletown, Doc calls his apprentices to conceal themselves so they don't appear odd in the city. Seth quickly covers his small horns and then asks Doc for a brief description of the type of city they're getting to. Mei Li tells him they're getting to a weird, loud city with lots of factories and engines running at full power. According to what she's heard about Rumbletown, they say the town's a place just like the Industrial Revolution. At this point in their journey, the town appears closer than ever. Doc pilots his ship and apprentices into the densely packed and deserted town. There, they realize how desolate and noisy the town is. They dock their ship somewhere and walk around a little bit to get a sense of where they are. Doc pulls out his small diary and reads out the address of their client, Zeta, which is on 12th Street. Upon hearing this, Seth and Mei Li begin walking towards the 12th Street, hoping they'll find it in due time. Sadly for them, they trekked down the roads for hours and couldn't find the 12th Street. When they stop to chill and get some air, Mei Li realizes she's lost her pet, Mr. Boobry. She immediately springs into action and retraces their steps with Seth to find Mr. Boobry. Luckily for them, they find Mr. Boobry sitting somewhere in an alleyway and are reunited with him once more. Just then, the duo heard a loud creature whoosh past them. After taking a closer look at the thing running as quickly as possible, they realize that it's a nemesis and decide to pursue it. Without wasting any time, they both get on their brooms and follow the creature. On their way, however, another nemesis shows up and stops them from following the first one with a laser beam from its mouth. Seth and Melee pause a little to assess their situation. Soon, one nemesis monster turns to two, and both begin attacking Seth and Melee with laser beam barrages. Seth gets pissed and uses the Fantasia he gathered on his fist to knock one of the creatures out. The other monster stands up to Seth to protect it, but then they hear a strange pipe music in the distance. This music seems to affect them one way or the other, and they run as fast as they can to meet their master. Seth and Melee follow the critters to their location and get the shock of their life when multiple nemesis creatures of the same build show up out of nowhere, all running in the same direction. Seth loses sight of what's in front of him and fails to see the hand bulging out of the alleyway. When he realizes this, it's already too late, and he gets pulled into a room by Grim. Seth asks a few questions to understand who Grim is, but then Grim returns his question with another question by asking him what he plans on doing with the nemesis he's also pursuing. Seth refuses to give him any answer and lets his fists do the talking instead. He uses a few basic spells to throw Grim off his balance, but Grim, as his name implies, is a professional killer. He dodges Seth's attacks and beats him to the ground in one swift move. Before he gets to say any other thing, Melee catches up to them and attacks Grim. After all that hubbub, the city bell was already signaling the townsters to wake up. Now Grim is a shy person that can't handle all the hate and attention, so he bails out before the guards and citizens show up. Seth and Melee, who are none the wiser, allow themselves to be spotted by two guards who immediately rush over to Conrad's residence to report the situation to him. Upon hearing that two sorcerers are in town, the Inquisitor captain of the town laughs and gets his men ready to find and capture the two pesky sorcerers. At sunrise the next morning, Conrad has his men scouring the entire city searching for the three pesky sorcerers who broke into his city the previous night. After waiting out some guards, Doc, Melee, and Seth finally resurface after spending hours in a dumpster. Doc starts off the conversation by complaining as usual before asking Seth about the nemesis. When Seth tells him about the multiple nemesis monsters he found, Doc shrieks in fear. He thinks about abandoning the mission at hand, but then realizes just how rich he will be when he eventually catches all the nemesis monsters in one go. Seth hurries Doc to sort his affairs quickly so they can search for the nemesis. However, Doc wanted them to go searching for the writer of the letter first, before doing any other thing nemesis related. To do that, Doc and his minions sneak through the dense town to search for the 12th Street. While that happens, Conrad receives an August visitor, Dragunov. As a fellow captain, Dragunov was there to deliver an important message from General Torky, their boss. Conrad, on the other hand, seems to be restive about the entire situation, as he kept on reminding Dragunov to address him as a captain, and not his underling like he used to be. To get to the point, Dragunov tells Conrad not to bother chasing after the sorcerers who invaded his town by nightfall, and leave things to his team instead. Conrad's coconut head makes him grumble at Dragunov's orders as he struggles to understand why General Torque would disrespect him like that. He throws a fit and stomps his feet on the ground in disappointment, asking Dragunov to tell him where he went wrong. After receiving no clear answers from Dragunov, Conrad eventually succumbs to Dragunov's orders and storms out of the room as angry as he can ever be. Dragunov only ignores him and continues sipping his drink. In the next scene, Doc, Melee, and Seth arrive at their client's house in the middle of the slums and knock on the door hoping to get invited in. Doc knocks on the door a few times and gets an answer from a dark man. They ask if he knew about Zeta, but then the man tells them no and closes the door. Melee immediately switches to her alternate personality and bangs the door. The man opens the door, and Melee threatens to burn the house down if he doesn't let them in. Hearing this, the man lets them in and serves them tea. After drinking a hot cup of tea, Doc takes the lead and asks them about their son, Zeta, who came into contact with a nemesis. The mother of the house tells them about their eldest son, Taj, who apparently had contact with a nemesis and got cursed. Doc and his people immediately feel sorry for Taj as they thought he was gone for good. Luckily, Taj showed up in the nick of time and proved to his parents and Doc that he was not dead. He walks down the stairs and sneezes out some purple stuff from his nose. This gives Doc the notion that the little guy's been poisoned by some holy nemesis juice. He then asks the mother of the house what the Inquisition's doing about the nemesis situation in town, and the mother tells him they're doing absolutely nothing, just like their letter says. Doc and his guys are pretty shocked by the entire matter. Doc continues talking about the situation at hand and tells them they all have to get the Inquisition's permission to use magic in Rumbletown. However, the man and his wife tell them it's impossible to get their permission simply because they're immigrants, and the Inquisition doesn't rate immigrants as highly as they rate the citizens. Just then, Taj sneezes again and tells his dad to chase their visitors out of the house. The dad tries to do so, but then again, Seth stands up and promises to chase after the Nemesis and either kill it or capture it alive. With this, Taj decides to be their guide to the heart of the Nemesis nest. Seth and the others thank him and then follow him atop a wall to find the Nemesis. On their way there, Doc and his people ask Taj a few questions about the Nemesis he saw with all of them. Taj answers all the questions until he gets them to the supposed place where he saw the Nemesis in his first encounter. Doc and the others thank Taj for his service and continue into the settlement alone. Seth leads his people to a closed room and forces the door open. Upon entering the room, they find a tree with glowing feathers and its leaves standing in the middle of the room. Seth, Doc, and Maylee walk into the room to study the tree and are amazed at just how many and big the feathers are. Suddenly, something shakes the entire town and people start evacuating to their shelters. Doc, Maylee, and Seth walk out of the room and notice the evacuation of the people. Doc comes up with an interesting theory and tells his students that the Earth must have been shifting due to heavy industrial activities for years. So, the guards may be evacuating the people to try and rebalance it. He urges his people to follow him out to safety, but Seth isn't ready to leave just yet. He convinces his people to stay and watch from the sky with him. Maybe they can find a clue about what's going on in the town. Doc and Maylee follow this plan and immediately get to the skies to sightsee the town. When it gets dark, Seth and his people find the Nemesis monsters running somewhere. Seth gets off his broom and uses the Titan Punch to knock out a few of them. He ends up knocking down 3 of them and celebrates too early as one of them gets back up and attacks him in return. Seth's insane reaction time grants enough time for him to defend himself against the Nemesis. Soon Melly joins him and he works with her to seal the Nemesis in a magic sealing circle. As the circle traps the Nemesis, Doc begins to daydream about the beautiful life he's going to have with his future wife, Melba. Melly also gets into her trance and dreams about the good food she'll be eating when this is all over. Seth brings them back to reality and urges them to stand tight and wait for the spell to finish sealing them. As they celebrate their success, however, one other Nemesis falls from the sky and adds to the number of Nemesis in the sealing circle. Soon, the total number of Nemesis enters 7 and Doc rejoices. Just when they thought nothing could mess things up for them, Grimm returns and breaks the Nemesis out of the sealing spell. Annoyed, Seth commands him to get off their property, but Grimm, who was disappointed by their mission, takes the 7 Nemesis and escapes. Before he gets too far, Melly puts a tracking spell on Grimm and lets him go wherever he wants to, so they can follow him. Grimm lands somewhere around town and places 2 live people in a coffin before sealing them shut. He asks the forces inside the coffin to show them what he showed them while he was still with them, and waits for the coffin to do its thing. A few meters away, a white-haired person plays the pipe that calls the Nemesis monsters around to come to them. In the meantime, Seth and his people camp under a dilapidated house to rest after their ordeal with Grimm. While Seth complains about the incessant Grimm making things harder for them, Doc gets a little restive and decides to return to Artemis like the coward he is. Seth and Melly tried to get him to change his mind, but then Doc already had his mind set on going back and saving himself. Before letting Doc sleep, Seth asks him about the weird mark he found on the Nemesis earlier that day. Doc immediately gets up and shows Seth what he's been studying for years on end. Although he hasn't found any reason behind the markings, Doc seems to believe the mark glows whenever the Nemesis is being controlled by a sorcerer he calls the Domitor. With immense surprise, Seth gasps as he thinks of a possible reason behind the Domitor's existence. At that instant, the Domitor plays her pipe on the clock tower and calls together all her Nemesis. When they arrive atop the clock tower, she pets them and urges them to remain calm and wait a little more time before she enacts her revenge on Rumbletown. The next morning, Dragunov's men, including the rookie from earlier, stand by and await orders from their captain. The rookie gets a little impatient and wishes their captain could be more swift with his plans to capture the sorcerers. Plus, he misses Dragunov's cooking and would stop at nothing to taste such deliciousness again. The other soldiers tell him to calm down and trust Dragunov a little more so they don't risk losing their lives in a pointless fight. Somewhere around town, Dragunov disguises himself and sneaks to the town square. There, he finds one of Conrad's loudmouths inciting a riot against the immigrants of the town and also the sorcerers living there. Dragunov, who was already amongst the crowd, takes his leave when he hears the loudmouth speaking horrible things about him. The dummies who call themselves real citizens of Rumbletown also believe the words of the loudmouth without question and act according to Conrad's plans, and enters Conrad's residence. He finds Conrad standing at a window, spectating the horrible things happening right in front of him. Without further ado, Dragunov calls him out for turning the people against the immigrants and sorcerers so there can be a riot. just like the riot that happened 15 years ago. Conrad gets a little confused and asks Dragunov what he meant. Dragunov asks him why he's so hateful towards the immigrants, and Conrad tells him he simply hates the sight of them, and as the town's wall, he must protect Rumbletown to the best of his abilities. Dragunov filters off the BS that just came out of the idiot in front of him and gets to the main point of the conversation. To begin, he asks Conrad to make sure he's not ignoring the presence of the nemesis in the town, just to filter out the immigrants. Conrad remains silent as Dragunov asks where his loyalty lies. When he finally speaks up, he sidesteps the question. Dragunov feigns his ignorance and shows him a missive from General Torque informing Rumbletown of their arrival the following day. Conrad ends his meeting with Dragunov and returns to his quarters to pace and think of a plan to throw Dragunov off his scent. After laughing like a maniac, he decides to hasten his plan and carry them out before the following day, so General Torque and the others don't find out what happened. In another scene, Seth and Mealy find Doc gathering some supplies before bailing out on them. They try their best to get him off that, but then Doc wasn't done with them just yet. He tells them he's fed up with his life chasing after sorcerers and would rather live his life in loneliness, just like always. Besides, the Inquisitors in the town don't seem to care much about their citizens and the nemesis ravaging through town, so why should he? To be honest, he has a valid point. Doc leaves shortly, and Seth gets more hungry. Melly advises them to get to Taj's house and hopefully get some food. There, they find the place in shambles, and get to hear what happened from Taj's neighbor. Conrad apparently had his men brand Taj's family, along with the sorcerers and other immigrants, as traitors to be captured and executed in front of everybody. Upon hearing this, Taj's family ran for dear life, hoping to be saved by nighttime. Seth and Mealy waste no time, and immediately spring into action to find Taj before Conrad and his goons do. Meanwhile, Conrad calls every citizen of Rumbletown for a special announcement. After gathering all of them in one place, he climbs atop the wall and starts his horrible speech. The nincompoop speaks in such a manner that he amplifies the hatred the people have for the sorcerers and immigrants, making them believe that they're the enemies of the town and are out for blood. The dummies believe everything their all-powerful Conrad says and immediately begin a manhunt for the sorcerers and immigrants. Dragunov watches from the shadows and gets a little disappointed over what Conrad just did. Seth and Mealy search the town for Taj from above, while Doc hides in the alleyways to avoid being spotted by the angry townsfolk. While stepping back from the crowd, Doc accidentally stumbles upon a room where he finds some nemesis monsters sleeping ever so silently, as if waiting for their master to call them. Before he can do anything, he gets captured by one of Conrad's men. Hours later, the angry villagers capture Taj and tie him up to be burnt at the stake. Thankfully, Seth and Melly came just in time to save Taj before the villagers burnt the innocent little boy alive. After chasing the greater lot, Seth takes Taj and Melly to a safer place. In the meantime, Conrad gets informed of the appearance of Melly and Seth at the North Gate. Without even considering the citizens there, Conrad orders his men to prepare the cannons and attack everyone at the North Gate, citizens included. Seth and Melia finally get Portage to a safe place. There, they discuss a few things about the Conrad guy who incited the people against the immigrants. Before they can think of a plan, the angry mob finds them and Melly switches personalities. She considers attacking and killing the people, but then again, Seth wasn't about to let that happen at all. He picks Melly up and runs away with Taj to find this Conrad guy and take care of him. Before they could get far, Conrad's cannons catch up to them and stop them in their tracks. Conrad's voice echoes through the city as he orders the sorcerers to stop what they're doing and surrender themselves immediately. Seth ignores his orders and attacks some of his soldiers with his magic abilities. Soon, Mealy joins him and destroys a portion of Conrad's men. Realizing that it's time for him to step in, Conrad takes out his special white-silver lance and points it at his enemies to fight them, but soon gets beaten down by Conrad's big lance. Mealy decides to join the fight, but Dragunov's arrows stop her from doing so. Conrad recognizes Dragunov's presence and commends him for helping him incapacitate Mealy. Seth begins gathering Fantasia in his fists, but then Conrad warns him against something like that, so he doesn't lose his friends. Just then, Seth finds Doc, with his body wrinkling, in a black-silver cage. Seconds later, Melly gets thrown into the cage, and Dragunov steps in to remove Seth's gloves. After getting his gloves removed, Dragunov tells Conrad not to underestimate Seth simply because he got his gloves removed, as Seth could still gather Fantasia, even while he's handicapped. With that, Dragunov takes his leave and continues his investigation. Moments later, one of his soldiers rushes to inform him about the panic spreading around 12th Street. With a cunning, smug look on his face, Conrad decides to go talk to the people before Dragunov finds out about his dirty secret. Melly, on the other hand, tries her best to wake Doc up as he is pretty down bad in the cage he was kept in, all to no avail. In the next scene, Conrad takes Seth and Taj to the people and lies about them confessing to harboring the infected and immigrants. To make matters worse, Conrad tells the people that Seth and his people have been hiding Nemesis residents in their quarters and have been trying their hardest to bring him down with the Nemesis. At this point, Seth wakes up and tells Conrad that the Nemesis problem isn't their fault. Conrad tells him he knows that, but continues to lie to the people about the situation. Eventually, he gets what he wants, which is the approval from the people to take down the vermin living within their city walls. Without wasting any time, Conrad closes the gates and orders his soldiers to aim their cannons at everyone on 12th Street, citizens and immigrants alike. While the people beg for their lives to be saved, Seth asks Conrad why he hates immigrants so much. Conrad holds Seth's face towards him and tells him he simply hates his city being tainted by the traditions and customs of other people. Seth gets so shocked at Conrad's stupid reason that he amasses a good amount of Fantasia in his hand and punches Conrad's unsuspecting face, till he lets him and Taj go. Conrad falls to the ground and crashes into his cannon, annoyed and surprised at Seth's power. He takes a bottle of green muscle juice and drinks it to enhance his powers. After gaining a six-pack in 5 seconds, he orders his men to fire the cannons, which they do. Seth shouts and begs them to stop the madness, but it is already too late. Just when Seth thought all was lost, Grim shows up and absorbs the cannon shells into his body. He repairs Seth's left hand with his special bandages and asks Seth a few questions about his relationship with the Domitor, controlling the Nemesis running around town. Seth tells him he doesn't know her from Adam and Grim believes him as his heartbeat didn't shift an inch. Before they get to launch the next round, Grim returns the shells he absorbed previously and destroys Conrad's cannons. Then, he gets down to explain a few things to Seth, but is interrupted by the loud gush of wind coming from the Domitor, who was sitting atop the clock tower. It was finally time for her revenge, and the Domitor never held back. Rather, she keeps blowing her pipe and controls the Nemesis to attack the people in the town. Seth's about to go and stop her, when suddenly, Conrad climbs the wall to face him in round 2. Seth tries to reason with Conrad so they work together to bring down the Domitor. Sadly, Conrad admits to being the mastermind behind the current Nemesis attack and mandates Seth's death, so his secret stays hidden. As the entire city plunges into chaos, Doc loses his life. Melly tried feeling his hands for a pulse, but unfortunately there was none. As she hugs him and cries with all her heart, she hears a few guards screaming to get saved. Thankfully, Mr. Boobry shows up with her wand and gives it to her. Melly breaks herself out of the black cage and saves the soldiers from getting eaten up. Then, while she's at it, Grim gets irritated at her incessant doings and wonders what her true motive is. Meanwhile, Conrad and Seth continue fighting as hard as they can for their values and morals. Seth tries beating Conrad down with some magic attacks, but Conrad is too strong to be fazed by his puny attacks. Plus, his Silver Lance was super resistant to Fantasia attacks, so he's had the upper hand from the onset. Taj, who was inches away from Seth and Conrad, thinks of a way to get to the other side so he can open the gates and let the people in. Elsewhere, a normal citizen runs towards the gate with her child, as a Nemesis pursues her hotly from behind. The soldiers refuse to open the door for her, but then Dragunov and his men arrive just in time to save the woman from near ruin. As they talk and discuss other things, Nemesis Dragunov, knocked down, wakes up for round 2. Thankfully, Melly came in time to take it out before it became too much of a problem. Dragunov turns back and aims his arrow at the other Nemesis atop the roof and shoots it down. Then, he leaves his normal enemy, which is Melly, and continues to find the other Nemesis and stop them. With the chaos reaching its limit, the Domitor summons a big lip out of Fantasia and calls all the citizens of Rumbletown together to listen to what she has to say. When she gets their attention, she reminds them about the accident that happened 15 years ago on 13th Street and sets the stage to finally allow for her final act. She intensifies the tune from Homeline's pipe and makes the Nemesis even more angry at her. Taj takes advantage of the distraction and races past Conrad to get to the gate levers. Conrad spots Taj running out of sight and tries to stop him. Seth catches on to him and uses every magic spell at his disposal to stop Conrad from getting to Taj. Conrad blocks all of Seth's attacks and makes sure to gloat about his power. Just then, Seth plays a nasty trick on him and successfully lands a kick on his chin. Then, he makes fun of Conrad to get him riled up so he can buy time. Sadly, this doesn't work, as Conrad realizes that Seth's left arm is paralyzed. At that moment, Taj gets to the other side of the gate and pulls down one of the levers to open just one portcullis, completely ignoring the second one. When he finds out about the second portcullis, it is already too late as the guards have captured him. Conrad reminds Seth about his powerlessness and wishes the balance between the Rumbletown was upset, so that the immigrants could get the hell out of his precious city. Little did he know what the Domitor had in store for his precious city. Before he knows it, but also Conrad's precious tower. Enraged, Conrad asks the Domitor why she's violating their agreement. The Domitor laughs and decides to tell Conrad and the others a short story before she continues her revenge. About 15 years ago, the Inquisition took in 4 infected children and admitted them into a special program to train them into soldiers to fight the Nemesis in their stead. The children, aka Poussey, Hans, Greta, and yours truly, the Domitor, were all rounded up and thrown in jail cells after each day of training. The four of them eventually had haters who made a big fuss about their presence in the town. At times, the haters would surround the dungeons and protest against keeping the kids inside the town. Their screams would sometimes reach the dungeons, but the children kept themselves hidden and encouraged one another to avoid breaking down from all the hate. One time during a protest, Major Oxumar, the leader of the Rumbletown Inquisition at the time, approaches the kids and plays the pipe for them for the first time. This seemed to calm the children down, as they laughed at how horrible Oxumare was at playing the pipe. Oxumare allows the children to laugh at him, and then hands the young Domitor the pipe to play. The Domitor tries to play the pipe, but then she fumbles horribly and makes the others laugh at her. Oxumare and the kids all laugh and have fun together, while Conrad, who was still just a guard at the time, was overhearing them. By nightfall, Conrad snuck into the dungeon and found Domitor playing the pipe, while her other three friends watched her. Annoyed at their happiness, he walks towards their cells and condemns them for being happy under his watch, when they should be sad and fearful of what's coming for their monstrous selves. He holds out his crossbow and aims it at them to fire. Thankfully, Oxumar came by before he could do anything, and chastised him for holding a crossbow against the children. Scared, Conrad searches for a lie to tell Oxumar, but can't come up with any. Oxumar closes the chapter quickly, and calls Conrad weak for being problematic towards children for that matter. This pisses Conrad off so badly, but he keeps his cool, knowing he can't take on someone as powerful as Oxumar at the time. He quietly takes his leave and returns to his station. Later that night, Conrad shows up again and sets the children free this time. He disguises himself to look like their guardian angel and tells them to find shelter in the streets of the town when the time is right. Being young and foolish, the children didn't stop to think there was anything wrong with Conrad's intentions, so they just rushed through the entire town searching for a place to hide and escape the guards. Conrad lets the kids run away as far as they can before he spreads the word that the Defense Force kids escaped. He made sure to turn the citizens of the town towards the kids so they could hunt them down and do his dirty work for him. When Oxumare found out about the entire thing, it was already too late, as the citizens had already killed 3 out of the 4 kids chosen earlier. Oxumare manages to save Domitor and quickly takes her back to the cell. There, he swears to protect her to the best of his abilities and make sure no harm comes to her. Little did he know that the spineless coward Conrad was already there, just waiting for Oxumare to fall into his trap so he could carry out his coup and take over as the lead inquisitor of the town. A few days after the incident, a Nemesis egg landed on Rumbletown and threw the entire town into panic. Conrad takes advantage of the situation and cajoles Oxumare to deploy the Domitor out to fight and, if possible, capture the Nemesis that just landed. Left with no choice, Oxumare gives the order to Conrad to keep evacuating the citizens while he works with Domitor to take care of the Nemesis. Conrad, who already knew Oxumare had fallen deep into his trap, follows Oxumare and the Domitor around town and corners them in an alleyway with only one guard with them. As Oxumare promises to protect the Domitor from harm, Conrad gets closer to him and stabs him in the back. The Domitor throws a fit and cries over the half-alive body of her master. Conrad kills the soldier with Oxumare and contemplates killing the Domitor right there. Before he makes his decision, Oxumare gets back up and pins Conrad against the wall to buy Domitor enough time for her to escape. Conrad finishes Oxumare and pursues the Domitor through town. The Domitor runs as fast as she can and falls to the ground at one point, wondering where she's to go from there. Just then, she remembers something Oxumare told her and picks up Hameline's pipe, which is the pipe Oxumare gave her, to play it while closing her eyes. When she opens her eyes, she finds the Nemesis that landed earlier, all gathered around her. Initially, she tries to chase them away, but eventually, she figures out the reason they were with her. She tries playing the Hameline's pipe again and realizes that the sound from the pipe calmed them down in some manner. She gets closer to them and pets them. Minutes later, the cannon shells hit the ground, and Conrad made sure to oust 13th Street from the town. He shoots enough cannon shells to break them from the island and send them flying down to the ground. Seeing this, the Domitor's heart froze forever, and since that day, she's been preparing herself for the moment she enacts her revenge. Fast forwarding back to reality, the Domitor reveals her true identity as the child from back then. She then continues her story and exposes Conrad to the dummies. After hearing all the horrible things he's done, Conrad defends himself, saying that the people he killed were necessary sacrifices to ensure the peace of the town was kept in order. The Domitor moves on to explain just how happy Conrad was to accept her offer to help him take down the immigrants, alongside the other innocents, while at it. Conrad completely forgets about the crowd beneath him and tells everyone that he would happily sacrifice his people and even stomp their dead bodies if it meant saving his town from the infected and the immigrants. Upon hearing this, the people turn against the idiot and refuse to be used by him any longer. They now turn to the Domitor and wonder if she'll be saving them as well. The Domitor disappoints them as she reminds them of the blood on their hands as well. If they weren't so dumb to listen to Conrad's every order, then maybe they wouldn't have killed her friends and the countless others who were innocent. She lets them know that she plans on killing them right there so they shouldn't think they will be saved. Around that time, random people from the crowd begin claiming innocence, making both Seth and the Domitor even more disgusted. The Domitor names all of them her enemies and makes sure they feel wretched and worthless like they should. When she's done saying horrible things to the people, she activates her ultimate technique and prepares herself to take out all of them. Grim interrupts her preparations and gets her busy. In the meantime, Conrad orders the rest of his men to gather up the remaining shells and bombard 12th Street. While they're at it, Seth calls Conrad and accuses him of being a scared weakling who just can't accept people who are better than him. Conrad gets pissed again and lets his emotions get the best of him. He blindly attacks Seth, hoping to crush him in one strike, but Seth deflects his attack and reinforces his legs with Fantasia. He lunges himself at Conrad and punches his belly and a few other parts of his body. Conrad's six-pack and reinforced muscles protect his organs from the impact, but in time, they still failed to do much. At one point, Conrad throws Seth up in the sky and extends his lance to capture Seth so he can slam him into the ground. Seth, however, holds the lance and charges towards Conrad with his skull burst technique. He takes down Conrad in one fell swoop and even breaks his lance while he's at it. Conrad is met with a bright light as he realizes he just lost the biggest fight of his life. Moments after knocking Conrad to the ground, Seth collapses from exhaustion. While punching Conrad, Seth had blown the wall separating 12th Street from the rest of the town. The people were so happy that they ran through the wall to get back to their homes. In the meantime, Dragunov showed up close to Seth and arrested him. However, there was a ruckus in the town as the Nemesis was still loose. Seth gets up to protect the people, but Dragunov holds him back. He speaks some sense into Dragunov's head and tells him to do his job as an inquisitor and protect the people first before prosecuting him. Dragunov stops him there and asks him if he truly believes the BS he said about finding the Radiant and destroying it. Seth tells him that he not only believes it, but is also going to do something about it. Dragunov chuckles and asks Seth to prove things to him by defeating the Nemesis and their caster first before talking about finding Radiant. Seth assures him that he's going to do something about it. With that, he leaves Dragunov to find the Nemesis and their Domitor. Several miles away, a high-speed Inquisition frigate ship races towards Rumbletown. On board the ship are General Torque and his minions. During their trip, they receive the news about Conrad's betrayal, including all the crimes he's committed against the Inquisition. Upon hearing this, Conrad's other colleagues reprimand him for being such a conniving snake. A few of them drop weird comments about Conrad and Dragunov before teasing each other and getting to sleep. When the time comes, Torque interrupts them and advises them to keep their sights on their true mission. Then, he heads back to the deck and instructs his secret assassin to go ahead of the ship and scout for enemies or nemesis that may block their way. Soon, the other captains show up and Torque reminds them of their mission, which is to find and capture the Horned Sorcerer Seth. As for the rest of them, they're to be captured and sent to the Red Room. In the next scene, Seth is seen running towards the clock tower, while Grim continues fighting the Domitor and her nemesis. He combines his powers and makes impressive and well-thought plans to bring both the Nemesis and their Domitors to their knees. Eventually, he captures the Domitor and asks her about her master, as he thinks he may have some sort of connection to the Domitor. The Domitor gets even more pissed and pushes Grim away as her nemesis come back to protect her. Somewhere around town, Mr. Boobry successfully wakes Melee up after she gets hit and almost crushed in an explosion. With immediate alacrity, she switches personalities and slices all the nemesis around her. She stands in all the dust and rubble and hopes to hear the next one coming. Just then, she gets her chance and encases her wand in mana to slice through Seth. Thankfully, Seth stopped her before she turned him into a human slushy. Then, he hugs her, listens to her cry, and complains about Doc's death. Seth stops her from crying and shows her a new version of Doc. Melly gets confused and asks Seth how Doc's still alive. Seth tells her he was also surprised when he sensed some weird Fantasia when he returned from his fight with Conrad. He stopped for a while to check out Fantasia's location and realized that Doc had molted from his old form into a smaller, babyish version of himself. At that point, Baby Doc speaks for the first time, and Melee hugs him tightly. While she's at it, her wand glows up, and a bubble of magic shows them the location of the bandaged man, Grim, who was just about to say hi. Knowing that he's been made, Grim approaches the kids and surrenders himself to be their friend. Seth asks him what he wishes to do about the Nemesis and the Domitor. Grim asks them if it is possible to kill them, but Seth forbids him from doing such a thing. With that, Grim asks Seth and Melly for their plan, and Melly comes up with one. With the right tool, she can restrain the Nemesis' strength and hopefully capture them, while Seth and Grim fight the Domitor. Now this seems to be a good plan for Grim, so he agrees to help them. As for Baby Doc, Grimm promises to keep him safe so his people don't have to worry too much about him. Once everything's been settled, Seth and his people fly to the top of the clock tower. The Domitor spots them coming a mile away and orders her Nemesis monsters to attack them. Seth uses his Fantasia powers to distract the Nemesis monsters, but it is unfortunately not enough to keep them at bay. The Nemesis monsters came together and blasted Seth to smithereens with a single blow. Seth nearly lost his life if not for a weird creature, who seems to have horns as he does, who came in at the right time to save him and teleport him to another dimension. Melly shouts Seth's name as she thinks he is dead. Thankfully, Grimm tells her not to worry, as he can still feel Seth's pulse from the bandages he attached to his arm earlier. Melly thanks Grimm for the information and moves on to face their common enemy, the Domitor. The Domitor goes all out and beats Melly down. After taking a huge beating from the Domitor, Melly gets up and decides to have the moral anime talk with her. She tries to reason with the Domitor, but unfortunately, the poor girl has lost way too many people in her life to ever be saved from her inexplicable thirst for revenge. After her brief talk with Melly, Domitor gathers Fantasia for the next round, but is shocked when she finds out she can't use her power. It is then that Melly introduced the Domitor to the Plundering Lamp, which is an instrument that captures Fantasia as it is gathering thus, and stops it from being used. The Domitor continues complaining about her predicament, but then Grimm gets tired of her whining and decides to end all her nemeses in one swoop. He takes out a scroll, opens it, and places it on the floor to summon the Cannibal, which is the most dangerous sword in his arsenal. In the other dimension Seth was teleported to, the horned sorcerer who saved him earlier asks to be called Piedon and introduces himself as a sorcerer who spectates the happenings of the real world from his tiny little cubicle of a world. After the necessary introductions, Piedon asks Seth why he keeps wearing a particular bandage-looking thing on his cheeks. Seth tells him it's to cover a scar he got from the first time he fought a nemesis. He also mentions that Alma was the one who put it on him, and has since been forbidden from taking it off. Upon hearing this, Piedon chuckles and tells him he doesn't understand Fantasia yet. Seth keeps getting angrier and angrier until Piedon calms him down and asks him why he keeps fighting to protect those who persecute him. To him, Seth is basically sabotaging himself. He asks Seth to tell him who he fights for, but before Seth can answer, they both feel a huge rumble, and Seth heads up to help the others. Before he gets out of sight, Piedon asks him to come visit again sometime. Back on the clock tower, Grimm loses control of his sword, Cannibal, and is left handicapped and vulnerable to attacks. The Domitor decides to unleash all the power in her arsenal to break down the floating island called Rumbletown. Before she's able to do it though, Seth breaks out of another dimension and returns to the fight. Seconds after returning to the fight, Seth finds Hamelin, the Domitor, conjuring up some powerful magic to take down the entire town. He wastes no time in joining the fight and distracting her long enough to render her magic attack useless. After quelling her magic attack, Seth engages Hamelina in a conversation about morals and how he got saved from her blast earlier. Hamelina cuts their conversation short and continues fighting him. Amid the fight, she asks Seth why he keeps fighting her as if the people were innocent. Seth tells her he's there to stop her and that's final. Annoyed, Hamelin gets back at him with another attack. In the meantime, Grimm takes Melly and flies her away from the clock tower to protect her from getting destroyed when the tower eventually falls. Hamelin and Seth take their fight to the next level when Seth decides to use his Skullburst magic attack to punch through Hamelin's blast magic. As their magic attacks clash with each other, Hamelin asks Seth one more time if he understands that he's helping her enemy. Seth tells her he's aware of his intentions to save the idiots of Rumbletown. Hamelin gets even more pissed and amplifies her attack, which crushes Seth to the ground. Thankfully, Seth survives that wave of attacks and gets to talk with Hamelin a second time. This time, she asks him who he thinks she's fighting. Seth calms his head a little bit and tells her the people are not to blame as they are just following the orders of their cowardly leader. At this point, Hamelin stops him and explains everything the dummies did to her when she was younger. Getting rid of one Inquisitor will never end their discrimination against sorcerers and the infected. Seth confronts her and asks her if she plans on killing everyone in the town, simply because they are discriminators. Hamelin proudly tells him yes, and Seth likens her to someone like Conrad. Before she lets him judge her, Hamelin reminds Seth that she never chose to be the way she is, and yet the people hate her just for being herself. She asks Seth one more time and Seth's answer remains the same. He's been fighting for the people and he will continue doing so. Hamelin sends another barrage of attacks towards Seth and tells him the same good fine people he's protecting took her mother and friends away from her. Hamelin makes sure the barrage crashes Seth into the ground. Then, she levitates herself up in the sky and rains another wave of attacks on Seth, hoping to change his countenance and the way he views these townsfolk. Hamelin kept on reminding Seth about all the horrible things the people did to him when he was younger. Seth, however, refuses to accept her views about the people and uses every last ounce of strength in his body to blow away the blast. A few meters from the clock tower, Grim and Maylee, while standing on the floating broom, use magic to spectate what is happening on the clock tower. From the looks of things, it appears Seth and Hamelin had already agreed. At that instant, Hamelin gets closer to Seth to reason with him. Seth pretends to listen to everything she has to say and agree with her, so she lets her guard down. Hamelin gives in to her emotions and leaves herself vulnerable to Seth's attack. When he's sure she can't do anything, Seth removes her scroll, unsheathes her spear, and pins Hamelin to the ground. At this point, Hamelin gets tired of everything. She asks Seth why he keeps refusing to think for himself, and instead chooses to follow what Alma says in the book. Seth tells her it's never been like that for him. Although he's been persecuted by the people several times, he's learned to know there are always good people amongst the bad and scared ones. As such, he's learned to have compassion for the good ones and would do anything he can to protect them. Hamelin, who doesn't see any reason to continue living, gives up on life and asks Seth to end her while he still can. Seth refuses to end her life and instead invites her to join him on his charade to find and take down the Radiant. It's the only reason why he's been on such a long journey, and he isn't looking to stop there. Hamelin tries to let him know that she's far gone already, but Seth tells her he's going to save her no matter what happens, and this brings a smile to Hamelin's face. Before she gets to say anything, a white glowing apparition of a man appears from the clouds and descends upon Rumbletown. The glowing man is then followed by a frigate ship that housed heavy reinforcements from the Inquisition itself. As the citizens rejoice over their arrival, Dragunov gets a little worried. Why would they bring such heavy-duty soldiers to a fight between sorcerers, much less try to use miracles to scare the sorcerers into submission? Something wasn't feeling right, but Dragunov was yet to find out what the matter was. Maybe Torque and his minions were so scared of Seth that they felt they had to bring such advanced artillery along. Anyways, the man speaking through the glowing man miracle finally speaks up and accuses Seth of several counts of murder, damages, and abductions of important personalities in the Inquisition. Confused, Seth struggles to find reasons why he doesn't recollect doing any of those things. He tries speaking up to clear his name, but Hamelin stops him and holds him at knife point. She pretends to capture Seth so she can use him as a bargaining chip for the Inquisitors in front of her, and maybe come to a deal with them. Initially, the Inquisition refused to negotiate with a heinous terrorist like her. However, Hamelin exposes them and lets them know that she knows they would rather have Seth alive than dead. With this, she makes her demands and tells the Inquisitors to release all the sorcerers they've ever captured. Clearly, this is impossible even for the Inquisition, so they reject it instantly. Hamelin drops Seth and shoots a measly laser beam at Santori's glowing man miracle. Santori enjoys the hit and prepares himself for a counterattack. Before he finishes preparing for his attack, Hamelin gives Seth the scroll housing her Nemesis brothers and asks him to keep them safe for her, while she buys them time to escape the Inquisition. Once she's done with him, she proudly walks towards the glowing man's miracle and attacks it with all her might. As they fly further away from the island of Rumbletown, Seth can do nothing but watch his new friend, Hamelin, get stabbed in the back by an unfamiliar foe, General Torque. In her dying breath, Hamelin begs Seth to make sure he changes the world while she's away. Hamelin dies in agony with tears in her eyes, hoping to wake up in a new world one day. Moments after Hamelin's death, Seth gets off his broomstick and charges at Torque with murderous intent. Von Tepes, another Inquisitor who serves under Torque, interrupts Seth and throws him to the ground. Torque reprimands him for jumping into a fight, but then Von isn't ready to listen. He raises his wand to end Seth when suddenly Piedon activates some innate power in Seth's body and forces him to wake up as a beast with glowing eyes. Seth gets back up a new creature entirely and slaps Von out of his way. Grim, Santori, and a few other spectators realize just how much Seth has changed in such a short time. Von gets up with the wound on his face and decides to attack Seth again. This time, Seth ends him in one single strike and lunges at Santori's miracle. Santori tries to use his glowing man miracle to stop Seth's attack, but then Seth isn't ready to let him stop him. After getting Santori off his back, Seth the monster faces Torque, the killer of his friend Hamelin. Before attacking him, Torque activates his miracle and analyzes the Fantasia powers in Seth's arms. He realizes just how weak Seth is becoming and knows he's not going to keep up that form forever. What Torque has to do right now is to buy himself and Seth some time so he can easily defeat Seth when he's finally out of his beast state. Seth keeps attacking Torque without any thought in the world. Torque, on the other hand, pushes Seth to the edge of the platform they were fighting at and watches him fall off the edge. Torque quickly cuts his losses and orders his people to get on with recuperating the town back to its former glory. Meanwhile, Malie flies herself and Grim to a safe spot in the town. Grimm summons his coffin and frees the people he once captured to protect them from Conrad's evil deeds. After watching the people run out of the coffin happily, Doc shows up crying for himself to be saved. Melly carries him and urges him to stop crying so they don't get caught by the Inquisition looking for them. As she pets him, Melly gets a little worried and asks Grimm if he has an escape plan for all of them. At that instant, their ride from Artemis, sponsored by none other than Master Lord Majesty himself, shows up to rescue them. In the meantime, Torque meets with Dragunov for the first time since he arrived, and apologizes for allowing a nuisance like Conrad to rule an important town like Rumble. Dragunov pays his respects to his master and closes the case on Conrad and his minions. Just then, the Artemis escape pod distracts Santori and his people, who were still in their miracle glowing man, so they can escape under the cover of darkness and return to Artemis in one piece. Well, this plan works just fine as the Inquisitors are distracted by the fireworks and fail to notice the magic locomotive flying directly under their nose. As his body stays unconscious, Seth gets into a trance and sees his memories one more time. Then, he finds himself floating in a ball of Fantasia and sees Hameline's consciousness fade into nothingness. He grits his teeth in regret for not saving her when she needed him the most. Seth moves on to condemn himself for causing nothing but chaos to the world. He suddenly remembers the beast he became earlier that night and blames Piedon for everything. Piedon appears behind him and tells him a little truth. Seth had always had his hidden powers that were sealed by Alma, and he was only there to help him realize and actualize his powers. Seth loses it for a while and asks Piedon why he's so concerned about him, like he was his brother or something. Piedon stops him at that point and decides to become Seth's brother for a moment. He claims to be Seth's older brother and tries to convince Seth to believe him. After the small talk, Piedon asks Seth why he looks down in the dumps. Seth tells him he's just worried about the way he behaved in his fight against Torque. He's worried about how he's to get to the Radiant and stop the people who discriminate against the sorcerers and infected from doing so. Piedon tells him there's nothing he can do now, and Seth asks for some time alone. Piedon leaves Seth's trance and lets him think of his answer. A week later, Seth wakes up in Melly's room and finds Melly in her alternate personality form, sitting at his bed with the baby Doc. Melly teases Doc for being so small and wishes he could be bigger. Doc, on the other hand, sinks into despair as he realizes his chances of ever marrying Miss Melba just went down the drain. Upon realizing that Seth is up, Melly returns to her normal self and starts crying over Seth's condition. Since he's been down and out for a week, they never thought Seth would wake up again. Grimm shows up a moment later to congratulate Seth on making a full recovery. He apologizes for attacking them from the onset and wishes there was something he could have done to avoid that altogether. Moving on, Seth feels a sharp pain in his left arm, and Grimm explains everything to him. Torque used his miracle, which nullifies Fantasia, to nullify his left arm's ability to gather Fantasia and use it. Seth doesn't seem to have trouble with that, and asks about the well-being of Fantasia first. Grimm tells him not to worry about the town, as the Inquisitors are already rebuilding it back to its former glory now that their terrible leader, Conrad, is gone for good. Seth gets a little happier about this, and Doc gets back to his usual complaining self. Seth remembers Hameline's Nemesis brothers and asks after them. Melly tells him not to worry too much about them, and that they're currently chilling out in the research zoo. Back in Majesty's castle, one of his entourages queries him for using a huge chunk of their funds to sponsor a magic ship to rescue someone like Seth. Majesty ignores the question and dismisses the entourage as he waits to find out what Seth has in store for him. A few weeks later, Seth gets back on his feet. One day, he's seen eating bread voraciously out of a basket, as Melly wonders why Seth was behaving somehow weirdly compared to the way he was before. Nevertheless, Melly, Seth, and the young Doc return to Miss Melba's cafe for the first time since they got back from Rumbletown. Miss Melba welcomes Melly and Seth back to Artemis and gets a little worried when she doesn't find Doc with them. She asks them about Doc's whereabouts and Seth pulls little Doc from his back. Upon seeing how little Doc's become, Miss Melba holds him up and calls him an adorable child, which is quite contrary to how Doc thought she'd react to his unplanned change in form. Eventually, Doc enjoys the cuddles and kisses from Miss Melba, and even starts harboring vulgar thoughts. At one point, Miss Melba offers to change his diapers for him, and Doc complains a little bit. He was a little embarrassed to have his schlong shown to the love of his life at such a young age. Sadly, he gets the shock of his life when Melba's puppet father opts in to change his diapers in his daughter's stead. After changing Doc's diapers, Miss Melba serves them some food and coffee to eat. While they dig in, she takes out the paper and shows them the latest in town. Upon opening the newspaper, Seth, Melly, and Doc realize that Majesty, the Lord of Artemis, had branded them to be heroes who saved Rumbletown from the terrible Inquisitor, Conrad, and the evil sorcerer, Hameline, who's also the Domitor. Seth gets a little sad and disappointed when he notices the bad name Majesty gave Hameline. He turns his head away from the paper and wishes things were better between them all. Just then, a magic pamphlet flies towards them and bursts into a hologram of Majesty's head. The head relays a message directly from Majesty and invites them to a party that Majesty is hosting in their honor, to thank them for saving Rumbletown. Doc smells something fishy and tries to warn his apprentices to believe anything that the con artist says. From the little he knows, Majesty's probably going to pin the expenditures on them and add it to their overall debt. He tells them not to think about going to the party, but then again, he overhears Miss Melba talking about going to the party and gets a little distraught. In one of his imaginations, he sees Miss Melba fleeing his arms with a handsome man she found at the party and couldn't imagine that happening. Doc shouts at the top of his lungs and begs Melba to avoid the party. Sadly, it wasn't his decision to make, as Melba already had her mind set on attending the party. Melly gets very happy for Melba for deciding to attend the party with them, but then her happiness quickly turns to sadness when she finds Seth trying to eat her pet, Mr. Boobry. That night, Seth dresses up and attends the party with the beautiful Malie and the half-grown Doc. Seth notices just how grown Doc has been in such a short time and asks him what happened. Earlier that day, Doc and Mei-Li had visited a magic shop to get some growth potions. He wanted to get as big and handsome as possible, just so Miss Melba wouldn't run off with the next handsome guy she found at the party. He buys the potion with all his saved dimes and takes it without even caring about the side effects. It was only after he drank the potion that he realized that the growth effects are random and there's no telling which age he's going to grow into. To avoid growing to be an old man, Doc abandoned the potion and made do with his current size, hoping to have the best happen to him. Seth teases him a little bit, and Doc throws a fit for a while before Melly shifts their attention to the wonderful food they had served at the party. Soon after, the MC for the event opens the stage and invites Seth, the King of Debt, to the stage of Artemis to show himself as the hero to the people of Artemis. Seth is picked from the crowd and thrown to the stage to show his face to everyone. Later on, Majesty shows his face to the crowd and introduces himself to the crowd before welcoming Seth to the stage. Majesty makes it look as if he was the one who helped Seth advance in life, when in fact, all he's ever done is throw Seth into more debt than he'd ever imagined. Majesty closes his speech by asking the crowd to hail the hero of Rumbletown. The crowd goes wild for a little while as everyone hails Seth as the King of Debt. When it comes down to it, Seth stops them from calling him a hero and lets Majesty and the people of Artemis know that he's no hero. Majesty, however, refused to let Seth spoil his party for him. So, he gets up and asks Seth to tell the crowd his next goal. Seth tells the entire crowd that he's going to find and destroy the Radiant, and although not everyone knew about the legend, they still cheered him on. At this point, Seth was already disgusted by the people of Artemis. Majesty added fuel to the fire by throwing Seth into the crowd, hoping he would somehow cheer up with that. Seth, however, managed to crawl out of the crowd only to meet his worst enemy, Nick. Nick's loud mouth prevents him from keeping his bants in, and he just ups and insults Hameline's power, calling her a weak sorcerer, and even going as far as challenging Seth to a duel just to prove that he's stronger than Seth. Seth warns Nick to avoid calling Hameline weak and also stay away from him while he still can. However, the idiot didn't take the hint as he continued provoking poor Seth to anger. When he can't take it anymore, Seth lands a heavy punch that sends Nick the idiot flying several feet away from Seth. At this point, Seth warns the people of Artemis to keep their mouths shut and stop saying things they know nothing about. They can only talk and whine from the safety of Artemis, but still don't know just how bad sorcerers outside of Artemis have it in life. The hall falls silent and Seth walks back outside. The following day, Seth visits Hameline's nemesis to reflect on his life. Suddenly, Alma shows up out of the blue and tells Seth she was called by Mei-Li to come put his head in the right place. She greets Seth in her way and speaks softly with him. Seth tells her he's no hero at all, and even reminds her about his berserk mode back in Rumbletown. Alma stops him from talking and shows him a letter from Taj of Rumbletown. Upon reading the letter, Seth finds out how good things are going in Rumbletown, and also realizes that he did the town some good by taking down their wicked leader, Conrad. After reading the letter, Alma reminds him not to forget the people who helped him get to where he is today. She understands that he has things to do, but then again, losing sight of the people who've been there for him is just uncalled for. With that, Seth's head gets back to the right place, and he rightfully appreciates Melly, Doc, and Mr. Boobry, all of whom have all been there for him. After getting past his little depression phase, Seth ends the day on a good note. Hours after falling asleep, Seth has a nightmare about his fight with Torque. He remembers the berserk monster he turned into back then and continues sleeping. Seconds later, his dream scene shifts to another battleground, one which is filled with the dead bodies of Seth's friends. Seth jolts back to life and stops himself from sleeping any further. Elsewhere, Torque and his minions complain about the recent turn of events. Santori and his female assistants talk about their colleague, Von Tepes, who lost control of his emotions and allowed himself to be defeated by the pesky horned sorcerer, Seth. Now that that's happened, the Inquisition has lost its reputation. To regain it, Torka sets course for Siphondir, the HQ of the Sorcerer Knights. His minions get a little excited at the chance to finally attack the sorcerers at their roots. If they manage to defeat the sorcerers, then they will get their reputation back. A few of them protested Torquay's plans, but then again, there was no changing his mind. Plus, there's one more person they have to worry about, and that's Captain Dragunov. Torquay's minions believe they all have to somehow punish Dragunov for interfering in their fight with the sorcerer and helping them rescue some of the citizens of Rumbletown. Torquay, who clearly knows Dragunov is innocent and only wants to help, decides to go with his minions and punish the noble Captain Dragunov. About a dozen miles away, the rookie who works on Dragunov's ship gets tired from hunger. Dragunov had given all their food supplies to Rumbletown so they could have enough food to get themselves back on their feet. Now, his ship's starving and there's little to no food to go around. The rookie wasn't happy with this type of treatment, and even went as far as saying disrespectful things about Dragunov. The vice captain catches him saying nonsense about the captain and reprimands him, telling him the captain's probably grieving over Conrad's heinous crimes. The rookie tells the vice captain things should be fine since Dragunov was only trying to help. The vice captain, however, tells him not to get too hopeful. Later on, Dragunov and his soldiers arrive at an abandoned island with a forest on it. They board the island and scout around to hunt for the infamous mountain rabbits. Little did they know that the rabbit was pretty humongous and also had a taste for human flesh. They provoke the gigantic rabbit and get chased around the island with their tails between their legs. Thankfully, Dragunov chases the rabbit away before it mounts itself on the people and eats them whole. Elsewhere, Torka meets with his secret assassin to talk to him about his next target, Dragunov. Torka calls Dragunov a weakling who doesn't believe his strength can change the world. On the contrary, Torka seems to believe he can make the entire world grovel at his feet if he plays his cards right. By evening, Dragunov realizes he has to do something as quickly as possible, or his men might start dropping like flies. He makes a few calls to the villages he's helped in the past, but nobody was willing to supply them with food. Their reason? They didn't want to get affiliated with the Inquisition that betrayed Rumbletown. The rookie complains a little bit about the injustice amongst them, but then Dragunov reminds him that that's how the world treats sorcerers as well. All it takes is for one of them to mess things up, and the world brands all of them to be traitors. At this point, the rookie is left with nothing to say. Dragunov notices this and just tells him to keep searching for a way out. Later that same evening, the rookie approaches Dragunov on the deck of the ship to talk about a few things with him. He asks Dragunov why he's not bothered by the way the people are treating them even after saving them from their travails. Dragunov smiles and tells the rookie not to give that too much thought, as they can only do what's within their reach. Dragunov also lets the rookie know about his beliefs and philosophies, just so the rookie understands him more. Suddenly, the rookie gets an idea and relays it to his captain. Dragunov immediately gets back to his phone room after hearing the rookie's idea and makes the call. To his surprise, the town he asked for help from this time actually agreed to help him. The rookie and the vice captain show up in Dragunov's office after he makes the call and are glad to find out they'll be getting food very soon. Dragunov tells them he initially didn't want to ask them for the favor, but the townsfolk were actually happy he called them. At least now they can finally sleep better at night. After exchanging a few encouraging words, Dragunov changes the course of his ship and heads towards the town to get their food supplies. In the meantime, Alma meets with Doc and Melly to thank them for taking care of Seth. Doc grumbles about her presence there, but only manages to scratch the surface of what would make Alma seriously pissed. Moments later, Alma is served coffee, but this time, she complains about how thin it is and asks if there is a reason why. Just then, Melba shows up and breaks it to them that they're out of coffee beans. When asked how much a bean costs, Seth and his people are shocked to find out it costs 10,000 dimes, and the reason is that Rumbletown, which used to serve as the exchange point between the producers and exporters of the beans, is now under duress. So, transporting the beans is now much more expensive than ever. Everyone heaves a sigh of relief seeing as there's almost nobody that needs coffee to live. Just then, Doc remembers his sewer friend, Devil the Devilfish. He finds his friend down bad from the absence of coffee. Seth and Melee decide to help him out by making a few runs through town to get Doc and his friend Devil a cup of coffee. Their first 5 runs all fail, but on their 6th run, they finally find the real coffee beans. Doc thanks Seth for finally helping him out and quickly makes a cup of coffee out of the beans. Devil takes a sip of the coffee and gets back on his feet. He then offers some coffee to Doc, which he takes with a big heart. At some point, Melly finds a piece of paper in Seth's pocket and asks him about it. Seth takes it out and reads out the cost of the beans to everyone. After finding out they were now owing 100 million dimes to Majesty, Doc faints. Hours later, Dragunov cooks a nice dinner for his men. The vice captain walks out of the dining room and finds his captain checking out an official summons from General Torque himself. He gets a little distraught as he never thought Dragunov would be punished for helping the people. But then again, the world is a cruel place, and Dragunov knew that beforehand. He leaves the ship's affairs in the hands of his vice captain, and gets ready to receive his punishment alone. Seth, on the other hand, takes some fresh air outside. Alma finds him lost in thought and speaks some sense into him. Seth thought he was a monster considering the way he attacked Torka earlier. Alma, however, calms her student down and tells him to keep a clear head. Seth thanks her for her help and returns to the city to get another magic broom for Meili. The stall owner makes him a pretty disgusting deal and tries to scam Seth with his money. Seth, however, refuses to get scammed as he keeps on arguing with the shorty. Alma barges into the shop unannounced and takes Seth out of there. On their way back home, she asks Seth why he would cause Meili such stress. Seth tells her not to worry about him still being a little brat. He even tries to show her some of his magic spells but couldn't pull them off at the time. Alma cuts him short and asks him to take her to Yaga so she can ask him about the Radiant. Seth immediately takes Alma to the tree where Yaga used to stay. There, they find only a letter and Yaga's cauldron sitting by the tree trunk. Alma picks up the letter and reads it out. From there, she reads Yaga's instructions to take Seth to Caislean Merlin, which is the capital of Siphondir, so he can meet like-minded sorcerer knights who are also looking for the Radiant. Before ending the letter, he makes sure to inform Alma to be especially careful of the Inquisition, as they're rumored to be heading toward that region to fight and take down the sorcerer knights to get their reputation back. Alma explains all about Siphondir to Seth and informs him to be more careful in his dealing. Seth gets a little restive and tells Alma he's not going to sit back and watch those good-for-nothing Inquisitors use the Sorcerer Knights for their gain. Alma continues reading the remaining contents of the letter, where Yaga advises her to make sure Seth finds the answer to his question about Radiant. In the next scene, Seth pitches the idea of traveling with him to Siphondir to Doc and Meili. While Meili has no problem tagging along, Doc is pretty adamant about going as he knows his two apprentices would somehow find a way to add to their debt. If they want him to tag along on another mission with them, then they have to pay off their debt first before asking him out again. At this point, Meili tries to get Doc to change his mind, but Doc stands aloof. Soon, even Melba shows up with her puppet after hearing all the commotion. Her dad tries to bring him down for being an ordinary researcher with no magic talent. Doc revels in his destiny and tells Melba's father that he's a great researcher. He's just underrated at the moment. Doc moves on from the conversation and asks his assistant, Malie, to help him fetch some spotted mushrooms to use in his next research. Malie tries to get him to change his mind, but then again, Doc wasn't about to let a girl's words reach him. Malie gets pissed and walks away, leaving Seth with Doc and Melba. Seth tries to guilt-trip Doc so he can change his mind and follow them on their next trip. However, Doc pulls an Uno reverse card on him and asks him if he feels good about putting Meili through constant danger in his travels. Hearing this, Seth gets a little worried about Meili and shuts up. After his ordeal with Doc, Seth gets to a random balcony and thinks about his experience so far with Hameline and Conrad. He wonders if he'll be forced to fight like that once more, and even gets a little confused over the entire concept of the nemesis always being evil. Simple-minded Seth puts himself off all that stressful thinking and decides to just live life as he sees fit. His goal to take down the Radiant isn't going anywhere, so he's doing pretty fine. As he gets up to continue doing his thing, Majesty shows up on his bogus luxury ride and talks with the little guy. He notices how down Seth looks and asks him if he's worried about his debt. Seth tells him it's not that, but something else. And Majesty leans in closer from his ride and asks if Seth is worried about going to Caislean Merlin. Seth gets a little surprised at this, as he never expected Majesty to know about his trip there. Nonetheless, he asks Majesty for some information about Caislean Merlin, and Majesty tells him it's a little more dangerous than Artemis. Seth then asks him if he understands the reason why people hate sorcerers too much. Majesty tells him people fear things they do not understand. He's come to accept the reality of life and has gotten past that. Majesty moves on to tell Seth that he's added the cost of hosting the party earlier to their debt, so it should be entering about 1 billion dimes at this point. Seth throws a fit and tells Majesty to stop the cap. Just then, Alma shows up and reunites with her old and cunning friend, Majesty. Majesty asks her if she was there for good, but then Alma bursts his bubble and tells him she's only stopping by for work. Majesty laughs like a maniac and asks if Seth is the kid she told him about. When Alma tells him Seth's the one, Majesty laughs and tells Seth to return in one piece so he can repay his debt. Grim, who was watching the entire scene play out, makes his comments about the entire thing. Just then, a horde of Nemesis eggs infiltrate Artemis's atmosphere to attack them. Everyone springs into defense mode to protect the city from near ruin. As the chaos spreads everywhere, Nick and his 2 servants show up again to badmouth Seth and his abilities. This time, Seth tells him that not all Nemesis are bad, But then, the airhead Nick isn't ready to listen to reason. Seth notices a nemesis egg flying towards the spotted mushroom island. Doc rushes in to remind Seth about Melly's mission at the island, and Seth immediately borrows Nick's broom to head to the island and save Melly. Meanwhile, Melly picks the spotted mushrooms without a care in the world. Suddenly, the nemesis egg landed and hatched immediately. Before the nemesis can eat her up, Mr. Boobry picks Melly up and flies her up in the air. Sadly, the little pet loses its grip and falls towards the nemesis' mouth. Thankfully, Seth was there in the nick of time, and he gets to save Melly while he's at it. The nemesis pursues them all through the island until Seth and Melly decide to retaliate and destroy the nemesis. After a series of magic barrage attacks, the nemesis finally gets knocked out. Thinking they were out of the blue, Melly turns her back on the nemesis and fails to notice it getting back up. Seth, who was facing the nemesis, sees it get too close for comfort. Having no plan, Seth jumps into the nemesis' mouth and allows himself to be dragged off into the water by the nemesis. Along the line, Seth loses control of his body and gets into his avatar state version, just like the time he was fighting Torquay. Alma feels the shift in Seth's aura from her ship and wonders what could have caused Seth to change his countenance. Seth, on the other hand, loses sight of all things good and bashes the nemesis to pieces. Thankfully, he gets back to normal after killing the nemesis, but this time, he's more disappointed in himself for not being more careful with his power. Grim, who was also spectating the scene from above, realizes just how powerful and dangerous Seth's power is. Seth returns to his hammock bed scared and confused about his new power. Eventually, he remembers something and returns to the stall owner's shop to get it. The next morning, Melly visits Seth in his room and opens the door only to find it all empty. All she finds is a new magic broom and a note on the floor from Seth apologizing for causing her trouble. He was leaving without saying a proper goodbye, just so he wouldn't lose control over his powers anymore. At that moment, Alma and Seth are seen flying alone to Caisleen Merlin. Alma checks to make sure Seth isn't making a mistake. Seth assures her he knows what he's doing and she respects his decision. Meanwhile, Doc gets a little worried about Seth leaving but puts on a tough face so people don't think he misses him. Dragunov, on the other hand, finally arrives at his prison and awaits the new fate that fits him. Pyadon, however, also tracks Seth down and is eager to find what destiny has in store for the boy sorcerer with horns. As Alma's ship approaches the continent of Siphandir, which houses the city of Caisleen Merlin, Seth gets to see the Sorcerer Knights take down a special new type of nemesis, one they call the Spectral Nemesis. After seeing such a wonderful battle play out in front of him, he gets back to the cabin of Alma's ship to get some food. Just then, he hears a rumble in the wine barrels close to him and checks it out. Lo and behold, Don Bossman and one of his servant boys, Gigi, pop out of the barrel to say hi. Seth gets a little shocked at seeing Don and his servant boy randomly pop out of the barrel. He even kicks them away from his sight and raises them high up in the air. Alma, who was just arriving in the same room as Seth, scolds Seth for harassing her new servants for no reason. Seth gets a little surprised and even tries to remind Alma about the terrible things Don Bossman and his people have done in the past. Alma, however, lets him know that she's not concerned by what they did in the past anymore, and they work for her now. With this, Don Bossman decides to clear the mist in the air. Before getting to the main point, he makes a dramatic entrance with Gigi, and even ends up scolding him for getting the entrance wrong. When it gets down to it, Don Bossman talks about the other two people who used to be with him, and tells Seth that they got separated sometime after getting imprisoned in Artemis. Hopefully, they are doing well. Don Bossman moves to explain the chain of events that led him to meet Alma and her almighty powers and strength. A few months back, Don Bossman and Gigi had managed to break out of Artemis's prison and sought refuge in a deserted island very close to the place so their wounds could heal. What they didn't know was that the island also housed a dangerous nemesis who had a hunger for human skin. However, when they did find out, life got pretty sad for them, simply because they had lost all their gear and materials to defend themselves. Suddenly, one day, Alma arrives at the same island, takes down all the nemesis in one fell swoop, including the Sorcerer Nemesis, who's feared to be the leader of the other Nemesis, and ends up saving the two criminals. Upon realizing how powerful and majestic Alma was, Don Bossman decided to turn a new leaf and serve Alma for as long as life allowed him to live. Alma initially tried to return them to the Artemis prison, and even tried contacting them. Sadly, nobody ever came to collect the criminals, so she let them serve her. At this point, Don Bossman was already in tears as he remembered the tremendous sacrifice Alma went through to save them. Alma gets a little tired of their whining, so she orders them to go get something for her. After they're gone, she talks about the two of them with Seth and jokes around a little bit. Seth gets a little too serious and tells Alma about Pyadon, the guy with horns who claims to be Seth's older brother. Seth tells Alma he feels somehow connected to Piedon, and he doesn't know why that happens. Alma seconds his thoughts and tells him she also felt the same way when he was fighting Torque in Rumbletown. Alma chose her next words carefully, as she didn't want to give Seth the wrong impression about herself. Besides, since she couldn't remember why she had that bandage placed on Seth's face, she decided not to put too much thought into it. She then finds Seth looking down and out and slaps him back to reality, reminding him not to get too careless and die on her. Just then, Don Bossman informs them of dinner, and Alma chases Seth to eat his food before it gets cold. After he's gone, Alma gets a little worried and wonders what this Piedon guy would want with Seth. What she's certain of is that it can't be anything good. In the next scene, Dragunov is seen making his way to an undisclosed location in the snowy Arcadian mountains. Confused, Dragunov could not wrap his head around the reason why he was summoned to the snowy mountains to get punished. Maybe he was being punished because of his negligence back when Conrad used to serve under him. His mind drifts back to the incident that happened in Rumbletown about 15 years ago. That day was as chaotic as it gets, with the Inquisitor team getting scared by the minute. While serving under a good-for-nothing captain, Vice Captain Dragunov at the time was usually the one calling the shots. After the crisis broke out, the entire city was thrown into despair. For the first time, Dragunov waits for his orders from his captain. The duo stood atop one of the walls with their soldiers around them, when suddenly, they found young Conrad running towards them. Although the captain was about to take him out, Dragunov allowed Conrad to speak up. As expected, the callous human being speaks ill of 13th Street and encourages the dumb captain to sink it. Even worse, he implicates Major Oxumer and the defense force to make them sound like they are using the Nemesis to their advantage to cause chaos. Dragunov tried to warn the captain so they could evacuate the citizens living there, but Conrad wasn't helping matters either. The stupid captain sank 13th Street with thousands of innocents still on it and went to sleep like a baby that night. After reflecting on his failure back then, Dragunov arrives at the hideout and is greeted by Lieselata, one of Torque's soldiers in his elite force, the Thaumaturgus. Lieselata takes Dragunov to the inner chamber of the cave and presents him to the shrine of the founding father of the Inquisition. There, Dragunov finds Torque waiting for him and gets on his knees immediately after seeing him. Torque welcomes Dragunov and listens to him rebuke himself for being so inefficient. When he's done, Torque raises him back up and tells him about their mission to correct the world. From then, henceforth, Captain Dragunov is dead, and a new Dragunov will be reborn as a thaumaturge. Dragunov gets a little shocked, as he is already prepared to die for his crimes. This is, however, good news to him, as he now has a chance to be cooler than he already is. Torque invites Dragunov closer to the shrine and narrates the story of their founding forefathers, who were known to have decided Nemesis with a garden tool. Dragunov calls this a miracle and is dismissed to get some rest so he can return hale and hearty for his next mission the next day. Before letting him go, Torque gives him his first mission, which is to go find the Horned Sorcerer boy and bring him and his friends to justice. Dragunov accepts his mission and heads out. In the meantime, Alma and Don discuss a few things about sorcerers and the like. Don asks Alma if she's tagging along with Seth on his way to Sifandir. Alma tells him she's not going to do such a thing and would rather just see him off there. The very next morning, Alma's ship finally arrives at the continent of Sifandir. Seth gets back inside the ship to listen to Alma's advice before getting off the ship. Don Bossman and Gigi give him some supplies and a short broom for him to fly on. Seth gets the supplies and broom and then says his final goodbyes to everyone before flying off to Sifandir. Seth gets super excited to finally see the great continent of Sifandir after hearing fables and stories about it. Elsewhere, the rookie from Dragunov's ship finds the vice captain in the former captain's spot and asks him why they've all been summoned to their hometown, in Bohm. The vice captain stands aloof and tells the rookie to stand out and anticipate what might be going on in their hometown. The rookie gets a little worried about their captain Dragunov and wonders where he could be at such a crucial time like this. In another scene, Lieselata serves Dragunov some tea and drinks for him to sip while they travel to Sifandir to hunt down the Horned Sorcerer. Lieselata, who admits to having served under Dragunov before, gets a little concerned about the look Dragunov had on his face, as he usually puts up such a face anytime he's about to go against his orders. She asks him what he could be thinking in his head, and Dragunov only gives her snippets. As he takes his drink with a straw, Dragunov reassures Lieselot not to get too worried about him at all, as he knows what he's doing and isn't worried about going off course from his mission this time around. Of course, that's a lie, and Dragunov worried about what the Horned Sorcerer would be doing at the time. Seth, on the other hand, has trouble navigating the rainy clouds of the Sifandirian continent. He loses control of his short broom at one point and crashes onto the surface of another ship's propeller. The occupants of the ship at the time, who also turned out to be the merchant barons, heard the thud, but couldn't quite figure out what had happened. Without further ado, they deploy a subpod to transport the VIPs on board to the continent. Seth spots the pod leaving the ship and jumps on it so he can hopefully hitch a ride to the continent with them. Again, the riders hear the thud on the top of their sub-pod but still think nothing of it. One of them suggests that they're being stalked by a ghost, and even manages to scare one of the measly cowards who occupies one of the high ranks of their clan. Plus, their oversized king, who claims to be the richest merchant in the entire world, gets excited at the thought of ghosts and asks if he could have one for himself. His son, who also turns out to be the spineless coward from earlier, gets so scared that he embarrasses himself in front of his wife. Soon after, the other more sensible merchant barons enter the main area of the sub-pod to discuss their strategies to turn their next destination into their milking site. In a few more minutes, they find good land to camp at. The merchants waste no time in setting up their camps and doing all things accordingly. Upon placing their tents in the dense rainforests, the sensible merchant baron amongst them tells all of them about his plan to turn that island into something they can make money from. The Fatso King and cowardly husband keep on whining about the uncomfortable conditions they're being put through in the forest and wish things could be better. At that instant, Seth makes the stupid decision to jump onto a branch and save himself. Sadly, he loses his footing and lands on the king's big belly. The king initially fails to recognize the big bump in his belly, but his subordinates remind him of the goat boy in his belly, and the king pulls him out to be executed by his soldiers. Seth begs them for life and promises them he's not a spy. When he realizes the merchants don't believe him, he gathers Fantasia on his feet and pulls himself from the king's grip before making a run for it into the forest. Almost immediately, the king mandates his most powerful soldier there, Crystalom, to rush after Seth and bring him back alive. While the other soldiers run towards Seth, Crystalom makes sure he's bribed enough before leaving. After hearing a generous offer from the king, he opens 2 bottles of muscle juice and downs them to enhance his muscle strength. Meanwhile, Seth runs through the forest as fast as he can to get away from the guards. He makes a diversion to another area in the forest, but then again, one of the birds from the guards approaches him to take him out. Seth realizes that the bird is casting his location, so he uses his Titan Punch to knock the bird out so he can escape the good female archer pursuing him. The archer, however, manages to land around 3 arrows in his body before leaving him in Crystallum's hands. Crystallum finds Seth and jumps midair to attack him with his powerful leg muscles. Seth holds his ground against Crystallum, but then his magic isn't that effective against Crystallum's white-silver sword. Crystallum sends Seth crashing into the forest and then descends to find him. Sadly, he could only find a weird ghost-like nemesis waiting there for him and his men. Crystallum retreats as much as he can and fails to realize that the ghosts are nothing but a hologram created by Grimm's magic. Grimm retrieves an injured Seth and takes him to a safe place for him to heal and wake up. Seth wakes up and finds himself at the entrance of a cave, with Grimm standing near him. He asks a few necessary questions about Grimm and his intentions. However, when he hears Grimm is there to save him, he thanks Grimm and gets on with the other questions. Grimm asks him why he never used his real Fantasia powers, and Seth tells him it's because he didn't want to recreate what happened in Rumbletown. Grimm congratulates him for being so good to avoid unnecessary blood loss. With that, Grimm falls silent and allows Seth to talk. Seth thanks him for saving him and tells him he never wanted to hurt his buddies. That's why he came on his own. Upon arriving at their destination, the merchant barons hold a meeting to discuss their next move in Siphendir. The big king and the ladies in the house discuss with the sensible baron, highlighting the effect of the incident with Conrad on their business. Now that they know how much can change with one single event, the sensible baron wants to experience what's to happen in Siphendir next, as he senses something big is coming. The next morning, Grimm shows Seth a narrow path to the castle of Cieslin Merlin. Before letting him go, Grimm warns him not to stray away from the path, so he doesn't lose his sense of direction in the dense forest. Seth takes one last look at the forest and looks at Grimm to speak to him again, only to find out Grimm's disappeared. Seth continues the rest of his journey alone, and successfully arrives at the lively city of Cieslin Merlin. There, he finds some kids playing Nemesis tag and also gets to see the impressive knight's castle. Seth walks quietly through the city and notices just how friendly both humans and the infected are to each other. He suddenly hears screams from fangirls nearby as the heroic knight-sorcerer duo, Mordred and Sagramore, pass by the town square. Seth, after seeing the 2 heroic knights, turns his head around and sees both Melly and Doc frolicking around the city. Seth is stupefied and freezes in place as he gets confused over what to do. Upon seeing the very same people he abandoned, Seth could do nothing but stare at Melee and Doc. He tried calling Melee when she saw him, but Melee ignored him and left the other. Seth signals to Doc to figure out what the matter is, but Doc is just as clueless as he is. Unable to do much about the situation, Seth leaves apologizing later, and instead gets to the Caeslin Merlin Castle registration building. There, he meets the indifferent attendant who tells him what she knows about the Radiant. Unfortunately for him, the woman tells him the current knights are more focused on finding and defeating nemesis at present and don't have enough time to chase fables. With this, Seth gets distraught and asks the woman if there's a place where he can get more information about the Radiant. The woman tells him about the castle library and tells him he has to become authorized personnel if he wants to see such text in the castle. Seth asks for ideas on how he can infiltrate the castle without raising suspicions. The woman tells him he can sneak in as a knight in the castle and hopefully get what he wants. On hearing this, Seth quickly picks up a knight form to sign up, but the attendant didn't want a knight with horns. Seth tries to cover his horns but only gets thrown out of the building. Elsewhere, Doc carefully follows the silent Melee as he wonders what she could be thinking in her head. Instinctively, he recalls what happened the day Seth left them. Doc was a little too happy that day to finally get rid of as he was displaying it at the Kettles Cafe. Melba, Yaga, and her father ask Doc for some information about Caeslin Merlin, and he gives it to them. Melba gets a little impressed at Doc's knowledge of things and praises him for it. Yaga continues from Doc's explanation and tells them about the recent amassing of soldiers and knights at the city of Caeslin Merlin to undergo training on taking down nemesis. Besides that, the city is known to house lots of historical magical texts that will do the world a lot of good if they're kept hidden and away from the public eye. Melia shows up seconds later and asks Doc if Seth truly left them to train to become a knight. Yaga tells them it's undoubtedly true. Melee keeps silent and walks back to her room. Doc and Mr. Boobry follow her and try to talk to her. Sadly, Melee wasn't in a good mood to talk at all. Instead, she kept on walking forward, regretting what she did way back before she came to Artemis. Initially, she thought meeting Seth would somehow make her feel better, but it turns out he didn't give a damn about her as well. Doc realizes his assistant is feeling sad and tries to cheer her up. Melee thanks Doc for the effort, but still, it wasn't enough to fill up the hole in her heart. As they continue walking to their inn, Doc wonders about the past Melee tried so much to hide. Seth, on the other hand, finds himself sitting and sulking in front of the great Merlin statue. When he realizes it, he tries speaking to the statue to give some sort of clue on how to get his bearings. Just as he's about to lose hope, a hairy creature, who calls himself a fairy human, Meyer, shows up and farts up a stinky gas that sends Seth's nose begging for dear life. Seth ignores the stench from the man's buttocks and asks him if there is any advice he could give him on how to sneak into the castle unnoticed. The man takes Seth through a narrow pathway through a mountain and tells him to get to the stables if he wants to get to the castle quickly. Seth asks him to hasten things up because he wants to see Merlin's records instead. The hairy human tells Seth to calm his balls so they don't get caught while sneaking to the stables. Seth asks him for some little information on Merlin, and the dude tells him how dirty and shaggy poor old Merlin was. This was a little different from the version of Merlin Seth heard, but then again, there's no use crying over spilt milk now. As they're about to reach the stables, the hairy human, Mir, hears the sound of the horn from the stables signaling the start of an important event. He throws Seth inside the stables without questions and tells him the password, Lulu is sleeping. Seth walks further into the stable and finds several sorcerer knights frolicking around the place, searching for one thing or the other to get prepared for their next mission. Just then, a lady calls Seth and asks him what Lulu is doing. Seth recalls the password and tells her Lulu is sleeping. This makes the lady ease up the tension she had with Seth, and she invites him to ride with her on their next mission. Firstly, Seth walks forward and helps her arrange her saddle on her ride, fumbling around when he gets the chance. From the way he does things, the lady notices Seth's a newbie, so she gives him the armor orb and shows Seth how to activate it. Seth activates and gets a cool armor suit on just like the lady. Then, the lady pulls him onto her carriage and sets off to the skies with her gigantic raccoon dragon, which she called Dracoon. Seth is crazed as he sees dozens of sorcerer knights fly toward their next location. Along the way, the lady tells Seth they're going to fight a spectral nemesis, which appeared somewhere around town. When the time comes, she expects Seth to take over flying her raccoon dragon so she can fight the nemesis when it appears to them. Seth tells her he's never ridden one of the raccoons before, and the lady asks him why he came along in the first place. Seth tells her about Mir, and the lady, who calls herself Okoho, throws a fit. Seconds later, Mordred shows up to check up on her, but Okoho lies and tells him she's perfect. The two exchange a few more encouraging words as they approach the Spectral Knight and get ready to fight it. Seth asks for a little origin story behind the Spectral Knights, and Okoho tells her how random and mysterious they are. Before talking herself to death, their squad leader, Lord Brangoire, speaks up and divides his team into two to attack the Nemesis. After dishing out the instructions, Lord Brangoire stammers a little and then covers his head to activate the Gisoni, a magic spell that synchronizes the knight's consciousness with Lord Brangoire. Once they're done, Akaho explains a few things about Gisoni to Seth and waits for the signal as she gets dangerously close to the spectral knight. When the signal is given, she uses the Fantasia restraining magic on the Nemesis. Seth gets a little worried as it turns out her magic wasn't effective. He tries to tell her about it, but then Okaho isn't too psyched to hear her flaws. Amidst the ruckus, one of the Nemesis' tails comes their way and throws Seth off the raccoon's back and sends him flying straight down to the earth. Okaho tries to save Seth, but then she gets in her colleague's way and is forced to choose between the mission and Seth. Meanwhile, the farmers working on the farm where the spectral knight appeared hid away to protect themselves from the spectral Nemesis. Suddenly, Seth gets to the ground but manages to cushion his fall by pushing a bunch of Fantasia towards the ground. After saving himself, Seth looks at the farmers hiding behind a tree and asks them what they are doing there. The farmers told him they were plowing their land when the Nemesis suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Seth tries to get them away from the farm, but then Okaho shows up and wrestles him to the ground, thankful that he's alive. Seth struggles to get himself out of her grasp as Okaho asks him why he never tried to get away from the attacks. When Seth finally gets away from her, he looks up and finds the several magic attacks the Sorcerer Knights were throwing at the Spectre Nemesis. The farmers complain about a few things the head farmer did the previous day, and one of them mentions the Dullahan. Seth gets a little curious to find out what the Dullahan is, but then his attention is shifted to the Spectre who was actively attacking the farm and its produce. Seth steps into the line of attack and saves that parchment of land from getting burned to a crisp using his repulse spell. The Nemesis finds Seth lacking and attacks him. Thankfully, Okaho was quick to think on her feet, so she places her shield in between the monster and protects Seth. Seth asks if she'll help him take down the monster, and Okaho tells him she's not under orders to protect anyone. Seth, however, reminds her about the farmlands and lets her know that it'll be her fault if all their crops end up getting burnt and unusable. With this, Okaho decides to help out. However, she asks for Seth's help in gathering some Fantasia, as the next magic spell she is about to use, Chromin, will require a lot of Fantasia to complete. Seth asks her what the spell is all about, and Okaho tells him it's a spell that covers and protects a large area at a time. Seth holds Okaho's hands and helps her gather all the Fantasia from the air, and even goes as far as stealing Fantasia from the Nemesis and the Gisoni spell the other knights were using up there. Soon, the Nemesis gets drained of all its Fantasia, and it starts disappearing. Mordred and Sagramore quickly decapitate one of the Nemesis' heads before it disappears out of sight. Having protected the farm from the dangerous Nemesis, Seth and Okaho as heroes of the farmlands. Lord Brangoire rallies up his knights for a quick AAR debriefing, while Seth stands somewhere nearby. To begin his report, Lord Brangoire blames his men for being so weak and backing out of the fight when they needed them the most. Just then, one of them speaks out and blames Okaho for usurping all the Fantasia they had to spare to cast the Chromin spell on the ground. Lord Brangoire throws a fuss about it, and even goes as far as misjudging the wrong person. Okaho had to reintroduce herself to the bearded man, so she could get scolded properly. Lord Brangoire scolds her without remorse for acting out of her orders and doing things herself. While he's at it, the giant queen of Sifendir, Queen Boudica, shows up and is hailed to meet her sorcerer knights. Everyone gets on their knees to pay their respects to their gigantic queen, Boudica. Boudica, who's a sassy lady, starts by recalling just how badly she feels for the people whose fields were damaged in this fight. One of the farmers speaks up and tells the queen about their pains. Lord Brangoire tries to stop him from talking, but then the queen asks the farmer to speak up. The old man tells the queen about the Bringer of Calamity, aka the Dullahan, a monster that holds its head in its hands and chases people out of their houses and stuff. The old man begs Boudica to do something about the situation, and Boudica decides to finally step up and help her people end their suffering. She talks about the great spirit of Merlin and also hails her late husband before promising to do something about the situation at hand. Before she ended her speech, Boudica stepped out of her magic circle and commended Okaho for saving the farmlands from near ruin. Shocked, Okaho thanks Her Majesty for the kind words and watches her leave them with her entourage. After she's gone, Brangoire brings his men back to order, and Okaho rushes over to Seth to jubilate over being favored by the one and only Queen Boudica. Okaho decides to celebrate her recognition with Dracoon and Seth, but before Seth can go with her, he has to check out Grim, who is standing in the middle of the fields to say hi to him. On getting there, he asks Grim a few philosophical questions to which Grim answers. After spewing out things Seth didn't understand, Grim asks Seth for a progress report. Seth tells him he's got a plan to get into the castle very soon and will get the library item as well. Grimm asks him for a favor to help him steal from a memory stone collection called Ammatheki from inside the castle grounds. Seth asks him what he wants to use such a stone for, but Grimm refuses to divulge that information to him. Eventually, Seth stops questioning him and agrees to help him out. Grimm changes the subject and asks Seth about his former friends, Meili and Doc. Seth tells him there's been some kind of distance between them ever since they found each other in Caeslin Merlin. It's possible they still hate him for leaving them in Artemis without saying a word. Grimm, after thinking about the matter, tells him he needs to solve this issue on his own if he wishes to be on good terms with his friends again, and also make sure to give Seth the location of the inn where Meili and Doc were staying at. Seth thanks him for the help and asks Grimm why he knows so much about Caeslin Merlin. Grimm refuses to tell Seth about his past life and just disappears without a trace as usual, leaving Seth alone on the fields. That night, the Dullahan appeared on the fields and chased after two farmers threatening to eat them up. After his encounter with Grimm, Seth got himself to the inn and asked for their room. On getting there, Seth prepares himself for what may come for him and knocks on the door. Doc answers the door and is surprised to see Seth. Seth asks him if he knows where Meili is, and Doc, who is still surprised at the whole thing, urges Seth to leave the inn while he still can, because if he's unfortunate enough to see Meili by that time, there's no telling what could happen. Seth, on the other hand, wasn't prepared to leave like a coward, so he waits for Meili to make her appearance. When she comes, Seth is met with a very weird version of Meili. This Meili, who's quite different from the Meili he knows, seems very indifferent about his existence and doesn't want to talk to him at all. Seth asks Meili to grant him some attention so he can apologize for leaving Artemis without telling them. With a straight look on her face, Meili tries several times to close the door on Seth and prove to him that she's not as angry as he thinks she is. Seth, who clearly knows she's lying, leaves the door open and waits to listen to everything Melia has to say. Melia starts by recounting the wonderful moments they've had together and states that she somehow envies him and his ability to cut people like them off as quickly as possible. Since this wasn't the case, Seth clenches his fist and tries to explain to her that he was only trying to protect them from himself. Since he wasn't sure of what he would do after his transformation, he thought it was best if they stayed away from him. At this point, Meili was just irritated, as she thought Seth was just underestimating her. She even tells Seth that she's always wanted to get stronger and wasn't a child who didn't know what to do. Even if something bad had happened to her back then, she had no intention of placing the blame on Seth, as she's a full-grown adult and knows what she's doing most of the time. She's responsible and makes sure she knows what she's doing. Seth stands strong on his point and tells Meili he didn't want them close to him, not only because of his power, but also because of the thaumaturges and the Inquisition that were after him. Meili still refuses to get his point and keeps guilt-tripping Seth into choking on his own words. When it comes down to it, Meili finally lets the waterworks flow out. She knows how Seth feels, as she was once in that state in her life. Her alternate personality, the more violent side of her, does things without thinking twice and makes bad things happen to the people around her. Meili mentions one of her old friends, Vanellope, the one she had a bad history with before coming to Artemis, and tells Seth not to think he's supposed to be alone when he has friends like her and Doc around. If she had someone to stop her from doing something crazy, then maybe she wouldn't feel as lonely as she feels now. Even upon seeing Seth, she felt she'd finally seen someone that could finally understand her, but like the others, Seth abandoned her and left her on her own again. Meili cries a little and then stops crying to tell Seth not to worry too much about it anymore. Since he wants to be alone for the rest of his life, then she'll let him be alone. And since it's not all about who's right or wrong, then Seth can go on living his life the way he wants. With this, she closes the door to Seth forever and leaves him outside. Later on, there's a heavy downpour in Caeslin Merlin, and Seth camp outside the inn to stay away from the cold. Doc sees him outside and gets out to stay with him. There, they discuss a few things about Meili and her goals and aspirations for herself and Seth. Now that things have ended between them, Doc asks Seth not to blame her for this and just let time heal things between them. With that, he asks Seth if he has someplace to go. Seth sucks it up and assures Doc that he's fine. Doc takes him up on his deal and gets back inside. After he's gone, Seth gets hungry again and thinks of his next move. He removes the Nightstone from his pocket and remembers the stables. Seth walks back to the stables and finds Okoho doing some attack formation training with her raccoon dragon. He watches for a little while and waits till Okoho is done before saying hi. When she's done, Okoho recognizes him from the other time and gives him a towel reeking of cow and horse piss to clean his drenched body. Seth asks her for his stuff, and Okoho gets it off Lulu's head. She introduces Lulu as her fellow sparring partner and also mentions that she's been with her for a long time now. Seth notices that this Lulu girl always seems to be sleeping and asks Okoho if sleeping is Lulu's curse. Okoho fumbles and stammers a little bit as she wants to keep things like that secret from Seth, but then Seth asks her about her curse, which makes her raise an eyebrow. As it turns out, Okoho was embarrassed by her curse and felt a little sensitive about speaking of it to just anybody. Seth asks her why she's so protective of her curse and wishes she could be a little more open about her curse. Okoho finishes packing a bucket of apples for Dracoon to eat out of. While her raccoon dragon eats, she asks Seth about his mission at the castle. Seth tells her about his search for Radiant and also the castle archives. Just as she is about to say a thing or two about the place, Mir shows up and causes a little trouble with his music and the likes. Okoho handles the problem and then looks around only to find Seth absent. She catches him trying to escape the stables and draws him back to her. Then, she asks him about his powers and how he was able to gather so much Fantasia in such a short time. Seth gets a little confused and tells her she probably did all the work herself. Besides, she has Lulu and her people to train with if she needs a new training partner. Seth thinks about his options and asks Okoho if she can also help get him access to the library in return. Okoho tells him she can do all that as long as he agrees to be her sparring partner and help her get past the ordination exam, which is to be held in a few more days. Seth accepts her deal and gets right to work. Okoho offers him a place to stay and sleep in the stables and welcomes him to her team. Seth settles into the stables and gets to sleep there. In the middle of the night, he has a nightmare about a weird crypt under the basement of the castle. In the nightmare, he finds himself drawing a weird drawing on the wall and wakes up quickly before he can finish his dream. Upon waking up, Seth gets a little worried over the incessant nightmare he's been having for some time now. Nonetheless, he waits till it's morning and decides to place a call to Alma using the communications feather she gave him during their last meeting. Seth successfully sets up the mechanism and places the call to Alma, who picks up the call. She asks Seth if he's done anything crazy this time that he needs to tell her. Seth tells her he didn't do anything crazy at all and that he's been training with this new girl called Okoho for a while now. Alma checks to make sure he's not strayed away from his mission, which is to figure out Radiant's location. Seth tells her he's not forgotten about that yet, so she shouldn't worry about him. Besides, he's been reading the books and documents Okoho brings him every day from the castle, and still hasn't found anything of importance there yet. Alma tells him he might have to sneak into the castle to get a peek at the documents himself. Alma asks him if he thinks he can easily sneak into such a heavily guarded place unnoticed. Seth assures her that he's got a plan to get in easy. Alma moves past that subject and asks after Millie. Seth tells her he's been observing her from afar, and Alma gets pissed at him. She even knocks him and calls him a fool for not being courageous enough to apologize to a beautiful girl like Millie. Moving on, Seth asks Alma if she has ever brought him to the castle before because he somehow thinks he's more connected to the Cieslin Merlin castle than he expects. Before Alma could say much, someone enters the stables, and Seth hangs up the phone to check who. He peeps out of the room he was staying in and finds Mordred kissing Okoho on the cheek. When the duo is done with their business, Okoho walks close to Seth, who tries to call her. Upon hearing her name from Seth's mouth, Okoho, who seems like a completely different person, turns around, takes a look at Seth, and walks away without saying a word. The next morning, Melly gets ready for an outing and tells Doc to take care of the house before she heads out to her next destination. After she's gone, Doc gets a little worried at Melly's sudden change in behavior. He decides to head into town himself and do something about it. Elsewhere, Okoho, who was returning from an apple supply run, finds her colleague Sagramore, the serious one amongst them, training his slashes. She calls him and challenges him to spar so they can have fun like normal kids. Seth, on the other hand, gets into a disguise and arrives at the entrance to the secret underground library meant for members only. He notices the behavior of the guard at the entrance and realizes he's pretty nonchalant about his guests. Seth decides to just get down and walk past the guard thinking he'd safely enter. Sadly, this was not the case, as the guard found out his name wasn't on the magic list. He tries calling Seth to answer for himself, but then Seth rips the magic invite list to shreds and rushes inside the basement. The guard calls for his colleagues to catch Seth, but they unfortunately lose sight of him as they progress further into the crypt. What they didn't know was that Seth had already reached a part of the crypt, drew the symbol he used to draw in his nightmares, and accidentally unlocked a secret door, which pulled him into the narrow passageway inside the wall. Seth wriggles his way through the passageway and manages to find the light at the end of the tunnel. Only this time, this wasn't a place he'd have expected to see at the end of the narrow passageway. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the cave network was made in a very odd fashion. As Seth tries to get a feel of the place, someone enters the room. Seth realizes this and rushes to hide himself. The person coming also notices Seth hiding somewhere and uses his investigation spell to investigate the person hiding from him. When he finds out the person hiding from him has horns, he gets very scared and calls Seth Pyodon before begging him to let him go. Seth tried to reason with the guy, but he wasn't budging one single bit. The guy places a scroll on the floor and uses it to activate a transparent prison, which traps Seth in an enclosed space with the real form of the spectral nemesis he fought earlier. Seth tried to reason with the guy, but still, nothing came of it. Just then, Seth looks into the orb in front of him and realizes that he's been made into a spectral nemesis as well. He gets very confused and stops right in his tracks just so he doesn't trample the people under him. Around that time, Dragunov, Lieselot, the merchant barons, and the farmers all see Seth's spectral nemesis standing over the fields. Seth, however, struggles to understand what is happening to him and decides to stay put so he doesn't trample over their house. Sadly for him, the other nemesis was just getting awake. It stabs Seth with its poisonous tentacles and leaves him for dead. Seth almost falls to the ground and destroys the entire village. Thankfully, the prison wall was able to hold him in place. Lord Branguar and his minions were already preparing themselves to get to the battlefield immediately so they could nip the arising problem in the bud. As the ruckus grows, Lord Branguar calls for Mordred and asks after his other colleagues, Sagramore and one other guy, so they can get to battle ASAP. Mordred tells him they're all absent for now, and Lord Branguar throws a fit for it. Okoho takes her chance and opts to fill in for the absentees. Lord Branguar is a little skeptical about things, but then he allows Okoho to lead the newbies to the fight since she's the queen's favorite. Mordred lets Okoho lead the trainees and head straight for his dragon. Okoho takes the reins and leads the newbies, including Melee, to the battle. In the meantime, Seth struggles to keep himself afloat as the poison is already spreading to his body. He notices the nemesis staying put and wonders why it didn't attack him a second time. Just then, a stone moves, and the nemesis attacks it, giving Seth the notion that it only reacts to sound. As he hangs on to dear life, Grim decides to help him find the device causing the projection and stop it before it's too late. Meanwhile, Dragunov and his partner, Lieselot, stray away from their mission a little bit and help the people while they can. Dragunov finds Melee riding with Okoho's fleet and ignores her to look for and save the people. Melee and Okoho, after flying close enough, finally notice that the second spectral nemesis is actually Seth. Seth, on the other hand, struggles to keep his wits about him as the poison's effect is already numbing his body system. Meanwhile, Lord Branguar and his army of sorcerer knights were already charging towards the spectral nemesis with murderous intent. Just as they're about to get to Seth, Okoho and Melee stop them and beg them to listen to what they have to say. Branguar, however, didn't have time to waste as they feared the nemesis would destroy the village in due time. Seth is seen in the cave shaking as he thinks of his next move. He takes one last look at the nemesis behind him and recalls that it only works with movement. Seth comes up with an idea and provokes the nemesis to stab him a second time. The same action is reflected in the projection on the farm, and Melee gets a little worried about Seth. Seth, however, manipulates the nemesis to make sure it lifts him high enough to the air. When he gets to the appropriate distance, Seth gathers Fantasia on his right arm and uses it to boost his body out of the transparent cage he was kept in. Upon realizing that Seth, his prisoner, has escaped, Diabol releases the transparent cage and causes the spectral nemesis projections of Seth and the other nemesis to disappear from the farm where Melee and the other knights were at. To subdue Seth, Diabol calls his comrades and orders them to take Seth out before he regains his strength. Suddenly, two spectral projections appear out of nowhere and take one look at Seth. They decide to leave the poor boy to his fate as they thought he was already dying. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case as Seth had different ideas in mind. Back on the farm, Melee slowly loses her link with Seth and gets a little worried. She tells Okoho about her suspicions and wishes. Seth was fine. Branguar dishes out instructions to his remaining men and orders them to find their fallen comrades so they can get back to the castle without fail. Somewhere around the forest, Dragunov and his partner, Lieselotte, find two night sorcerers down and out in the middle of nowhere. While Lieselotte advises they leave the sorcerers and continue their mission, Dragunov gets closer to investigate. He realizes that the soldiers are still alive and are put to sleep by someone else. Just then, Dragunov and Lieselot spot Grim hiding in one of the trees behind them and attack him with their miracles. Grim makes a run for it, but Dragunov and his partner not only catch up to him, but also place him under serious duress. Dragunov keeps missing his shot on purpose, hoping Grim surrenders himself to justice. Grim, on the other hand, had no intentions to surrender, so he creates a purple mist and tries to escape. Sadly, Dragunov and his partner, Lieselot, still catch up to him. Grim is left with no choice but to get into his coffin and escape into his alternate dimension. His plan works successfully, but he also ends up getting injured. Upon arriving at his other world, which looks like an abandoned basement, Grim checks the arrow on his left shoulder and freaks out. His servant, Leogon, inches closer to him to check him out and possibly help him remove the arrows. However, Grim got very violent and slammed his servant, Leogon, to the wall, threatening to end him if he ever tried to sneak up on him again. Leogon apologizes for his recklessness and promises not to do it again. Grim lets him go and uses some magic spells to remove some of the blood on the surface of his wound to store it inside a small container. He also orders Leogon to retrieve the blood on the floor before it coagulates and stores it in the containers provided. Leogon gets up and does his stuff. Grim also tells him to prepare some food while he's at it so he can nourish himself back to health. As for the surface world, Grim was going to stay away for now so he could start his journey from the beginning. After instructing his coffin on his next destination, Grim gets down to enjoy his time there. Leogon gets a little too excited about following his master back to the surface, but Grim tells him they're not getting to the surface anytime soon. Before his scene ends, Grim wishes Seth well. A few moments after meeting his death, Seth gets teleported into the spiritual realm called Sud. There, he finds himself encased in an orb with a black round substance in there, with him. Seth's life flashes before his eyes and he recalls all the wonderful memories he's had with his people, Meli, Doc, Yaga, and even Alma. He wonders where he went wrong and wishes to restart life from that point. When it comes down to it, Seth remembers his first meeting with Piodon and also Hameline, the Domitor. He condemns the monster he was back when he fought Torquay, and gives up hope after realizing just how much he hurt Meli. Before he blacks out forever, Seth opens his eyes and finds the black round thingy staring at him. Just as he's about to do something, the black round thingy engulfs the orb he was in, and Seth screams at the top of his lungs for help. Okoho, Meli, Doc, and even Mir heard Seth's cry for help and were worried for him. Meli and Okoho quickly rush to the castle to save Seth before it is too late. What they didn't know was that Seth's body had already been taken over by the black thingy inside him. In a split second, Seth becomes the monster he was so afraid to become and attacks Diabol's comrades like a beast on steroids. Diabol's comrades step in and combine their magic abilities to take Seth down. Unfortunately, even their most dangerous spells weren't enough to bring down the beast inside Seth. However, they did manage to throw Seth out of the mountain he was at and send him flying towards the forest. Thankfully, Mir saw him just in time and saved Seth before he completely crashed into the ground. Moments after yeeting Seth out of the mountains, the two spectral comrades pop their heads out of the hole Seth created in the mountain on his way out. They spot Mir playing with a tree trunk and ignore him, totally given the reputation and the kind of person they know him to be. They continued to scan around, hoping to find Seth's body, but couldn't find anything. Diabol shows up behind them to complain about Piodon and Seth giving him trauma. He also urges them to conceal the hole ASAP so they don't get discovered. So they quickly seal up the hole and return things to normal. Mir waits till they're gone before checking Seth's body out one more time to assess the damage done. After checking out everything there is to know about Seth's body, Mir realizes that he has to take Seth to his wife for effective treatment. Concurrently, Meli and her pet arrive at a random bench out in town to call Doc. Meli relays everything to Doc and urges him to follow her to find Seth. Doc follows Meli into the forest where they find Okoho and a few other sorcerer knights investigating the rubble that came out of the mountain hole. They trace the debris to find out where it came from, only to discover that the place has been sealed up. After reuniting with Meli and the others, Okoho asks Meli if they knew Seth's location. For all they know, Seth could be somewhere chilling out while they worry. Doc, however, lets them know that Seth's definitely in trouble. To find him, Meli takes out her wand and casts a locator spell, which she and the others follow to find Seth. After following the spell out of the castle for a while, they find themselves in Khalid's forest, aka the forest that causes anybody unfortunate enough to get in there to get lost. The locator spell enters a particular spot in the bush, and Meli tries to follow it, but then Okoho warns her not to go any further into the forest. She would rather prefer they get around the forest so they don't get lost. Meli pretends to listen to her for a second, but then decides to just get into the forest without a care in the world. Okoho tried to stop her and even pulled Doc along with her. Suddenly, Meli and Okoho find themselves in a completely different part of the forest. This place was very beautiful and well decorated with ornaments and flowers. Okoho scolds Meli for getting inside the area without her permission and risking their lives when suddenly, Mr. Boobry pulls their attention to the giant creature, searching for them. Before the creature finds them, Okoho hides the others and waits for the creature to pass them by. She then tells them to keep it together so they can all make it out of the forest together. Mr. Boobry notices the absence of the creature and calls his master's attention to it. Mir appears from behind and introduces himself to them. Scared, Okoho and Meli both wonder what Mir could be doing in that part of the forest. Mir gets down from the tree he's at and pulls Seth's wounded body out of a small bush. Then, he takes both Seth and his buddies through the forest to see his wife, Jill, who is also a weird creature. On their way there, Doc admires all the different plant varieties present in that area, and even marvels when he finds the fungi and algae growing there. Okoho, on the other hand, asks Mir if the myth about getting lost in that forest is true. Mir only laughs and tells her not to get herself worried over something like that. as the thought of it is just a farce. Seconds later, they all arrive at Mir's house. There, they find his wife, who's a giant creature covered with leaves and branches. Jill teases Melly and her buddies a little bit to make them scared before turning to her husband to reprimand him for going out to chill with the tree without telling her. While she discusses this with her husband, Melly interrupts her and begs her to save Seth while she still can. Jill stops her chore and works together with her husband to get into the spirit realm, where Seth's consciousness and the black round thingy live. As soon as they arrive in Sid, they find Seth sitting in his glowing orb and make a few comments about his state of mouth. Seth is surprised to see them and asks them what they're doing inside his head. Jill stops him there and explains the concept of the seed space to him, making sure he knows that other people can interrupt the space and discuss things with him. Once they're sure he's got that down, Mir asks him about the black round thingy sitting with him inside the orb, and Seth tells them he doesn't know. Right outside the Sid realm, Okoho and her people get a little confused as it appears Mir and Jill are sleeping with them. Okoho, however, tells them she feels Jill and her husband are speaking with Seth at the moment, so they shouldn't think otherwise. Melie and Doc get a little skeptical about things, and Okoho decides to get them into Seth's seed. In the meantime, Seth explains his last experience with the black ball trapped with him and relates it to a certain guy with horns that he knows, Piedon. Mir and his wife let him know that he's between life and death at the moment. The only thing keeping Seth sane in his consciousness is Mir's magic. If Seth happens to wake up without learning to control the black ball, then he may die and get his body taken over completely by the black thingy. After giving life a second thought, Seth decides to let things go and remain in the Sid forever. Just then, Meili and the others show up and stop him from doing such a thing. Happy to see his friends finally coming along, Jill and Meyer decide to let Meili do her thing. Doc, who was summoned there to look old, complains to Okoho and forces her to get him and herself back to the real world. After they're gone, Jill and her husband follow, leaving Meili with Seth to discuss. After they're gone, Meili asks Seth why he acts so weak when he's supposed to be strong. Seth tells her he's genuinely scared of himself and what he becomes when he transforms into that hideous monster. The funny thing is that the black orb thingy only gets stronger the more Seth tries to fight it. Meili listens to all of Seth's woes and understands him for once, rather than judge him for trying to run from his fate. Meili reminds Seth of how kind he was to her when he found out about her curse, and politely tells Seth to press on and change his destiny. He has her and everybody he's ever loved behind him, and they will never leave him. With this, Seth thanks Meili for the help and decides to get himself back to normal. He regrets abandoning Meili and would die before doing such a thing again. Meili gets a little happier and gets teased a little bit by Seth. Meili wakes up and finds herself with everyone. She tells them Seth has decided to undergo treatment and also stay behind at Mir's so he can train. With this, Meili and her buddies, including Okoho, are escorted out of the forest by a walking mushroom. On their way, Okoho and Doc complain about Seth's decision to stay there. Meili advises them to trust Seth a little bit more and watch the magic happen. Besides, they have more pressing matters at hand, like the device producing those spectral nemesis, as well as its caster, Daibal. Meili suggests they get back to the castle and report to the knights, but then Okoho warns them against doing such a thing. If such an elaborate scheme has been going on in the shadows for a long time now, it must mean a higher-up must know about it, so they all decide to keep quiet and observe things low-key. A few hours after they return to the castle, Queen Boudica summons Lord Brangoire, Mordred, Doc, Meili, Mr. Boubri, and Okoho to meet her in her quarters. There, she lets them bow down before her before she addresses them. She starts by reminding the soldiers about their trust in each other and talks to them about the spectral nemesis problem. People have started to doubt the Sorcerer Knights, and she fears that her kingdom is vulnerable to attacks from merchant barons. Moving on, she blames Lord Brangoire for his misconduct during their last raid, and asks him if he has anything to say for himself. Lord Brangoire quickly shifts the blame to Okoho and Meili, telling the queen that they stopped the knights from attacking the nemesis in the first place. Boudica shifts her sights to the two ladies and asks them to explain themselves. While they fumble, Mordred speaks up and bails Okoho out of trouble with the queen. The queen checks Okoho and demotes Brangoire from commanding the Sorcerer Knights after finding out that he let Meili and Okoho wander off into the Kalite forest. From then on, Lord de Gaulies, the second in command, will lead the Sorcerer Knight apprentices till their ordination ceremony. Speaking of the devil, Lord de Gaulies shows up and makes a dramatic entrance. He thanks the queen for the promotion and pledges to lead his apprentices to victory. Before Boudica could answer him, however, de Gaulies saw Meili and fell in love at first sight. He tries to force Meili into collecting the flowers he kept between his yellow teeth, but Melier's alternate personality isn't having that at all as she slaps him to his senses. Boudica gets tired of the others and sends them out of her quarters. Just as Okoho is about to leave, she picks her up and lets her know that she has the Queen's full support. She also gives a warning signal to do things in accordance so she can avoid getting in trouble with the men. Okoho thanks the Queen for her kind words and waits behind to tell her about the interesting things she found in the Forest of Magical Things. About 2 to 3 years later in Mir's forest, Seth finally makes a full recovery. He wakes up and finds himself in the sap sack of a weird tree, with Jill and her husband keeping a close eye on him. Shocked, Seth tried to wriggle his way out of the sap sack but couldn't get down from it. Just then, Myra and Jill let Seth out and gave him some clothes to cover his body. Seth gets a little restive and asks them what they were trying to do to him as he feels he's been asleep for a very long time. Jill and Myra explain that he's been there for about 2 or 3 years and has been getting the nutrients his body needs to survive from the sap. Hearing this, Seth gets very worried and decides to run back to the real world. Mir, however, stops him and explains the concept of time in that part of the forest. According to him, there is practically no time in that forest, and Seth can choose to go out at any time he wishes to go out. With this, Seth decides to stay behind and learn Fantasia's control from Mir. Mir makes him beg for the training, and even decides to test him first before accepting him to train under his tutelage. To complete his first test, Seth is to catch Mir as he glides across the forest. Seems easy, right? Well, unfortunately, Seth was in for his money because Mir was like a sage dude who's become one with the forest. As such, he glides from tree to tree at amazing speeds, leaving Seth to wonder why Mir's everywhere. He tries to catch Mir using ordinary means, but Mir turns out to be too fast for him. They take a break for a little while, and Mir explains what Seth needs to do if he wants to get as fast as that and catch up to him. To do that, Seth has to completely feel the air and energy around him to become one with them. Only then will he be able to catch up to him. Later on, while Seth takes a bath, Jill asks Mir why he's helping Seth. Mir ignores her questions and tells Seth to get ready for the next part of his training. Over the next few days, Seth undergoes the most rigorous training regimen ever known to man. Lucky for him, he survives it and finally gets to see and feel the forest's energy. In no time, he catches up to Mir and passes the first test. Now that he's done with that, Seth asks Mir to teach him how to manipulate Fantasia. Mir tells him not to think of Fantasia as an object, but as air. To get the most out of Fantasia, Seth has to think of his surroundings as an extension of his body. By doing this, he can create things out of his own will and make things happen just by thinking about it. Mir demonstrates an example by creating a tree out of nothing and gets to the next part of Seth's training, which is putting his freeloader, the Black Orb, under control. To do this, Mir tells Seth to let the orb try to absorb him, while he gathers Fantasia to control the orb. Seth tries this, but unfortunately gets absorbed by the Black Orb. Luckily, Mir was able to stop him and bring him back to normal before things got out of hand. After their first trial, Mir asks Seth to explain his experience with the Black Orb. Seth tells him he feels as though someone is watching him from that black hole and is just waiting for him to slip up so he can take over. Mir tells him to try again and get to know what or who his freeloader was. Meanwhile, Diabol and his spectral comrades stop at nothing to locate the Horned Sorcerer. One of the spectral comrades asked Diabol why he was so intent on hiding in that weird cave. Diabol tells them that he's currently hiding from a man named Pyodon, and would be safe from him as long as he's within the castle walls. They discuss a few things about Pyodon, and realize that Pyodon was just trying to use Seth for his means. There's no telling what Pyodon would do once he finds out Seth isn't useful to him anymore. At that moment, Seth teleports himself and Mir to the Seed Dimension. Mir encourages him to try taking over his orb, but then the orb goes on a rampage and even attacks Mir. Mir defends all of the orb's attacks and tells Seth that the orb is either trying to offer him up to something or is trying to bring that something to him. After fending off the orb, Mir asks Seth why someone who claims to be his brother will do something of this nature to him, as he couldn't understand why someone who claims to want to help Seth would attach such a dangerous object to him. Training ends for the day in a few hours, and Mir congratulates Seth for finally getting closer to knowing his freeloader Black Orb. To help keep Seth under control during his next training session, Mir wraps an armband made from one of his body hairs around Seth's wrists and tells him to keep the band on him always. Seth, after hearing what the armband was made of, freaks out a little bit, but then finds out Mir was only joking about using his hair, so he calms down a little bit. He then asks Mir to tell him what the armband was truly made of, and Mir tells him it's from a special tree that can only be found in the forest. The tree had Jill's sap flowing inside it and was bound to him forever. From then henceforth, Seth is one with the Keitel Forest. Seth gets excited and asks his master to get back to training. Before training him, however, Mir and his wife offer a note warning Seth to stay away from the weird black thingy inside his Sid dimension. If he happens to fall under its curse, curse one more time and allows it to engulf him totally. Then Seth can kiss his life goodbye. Not to worry though, as Mir will make sure Seth gets the hang of sealing that black orb thingy before it causes trouble again. To do this, however, Seth must strengthen his will so the black orb doesn't win. Seth assures him that he's ready before urging him to get him back to training ASAP. Later that evening, the horn of battle is sounded and Brangoire rallies up his knights to get ready to attack the nemesis approaching them. He dishes out instructions to his people and nearly dismisses them when Lord Degoulis shows up like a menace and makes fun of poor Brangoire. Seconds later, Degoulis spots Meili and starts praising and hailing her to make her feel happy. He even tries giving her a rose flower, but this time, Mr. Boubri slaps the flowers from his hand. Brangoire brings Degoulis back to reality and reminds him of the emergency. Degoulis makes a few more comments about Brangoire's seriousness before they all head out to save the farmers and their fields from the nemesis. On getting to the farmland, Lord Degoulis eliminates a large chunk of the attacking nemesis in one strike and stops to exalt himself while the other nemesis freeloads on the crops. Brangoire, who got tired of Degoulis' whining, steps up to the role of commander and orders Okaho and Meili to assess the damage. Both girls immediately get to the site of the battle, and Meili realizes the full extent of Lord Degoulis' strength. Granted that he's a strong man, Lord Degoulis is also the sworn guardian of Sagramore and Mordred. Meili asks Okaho why Lord Degoulis seems different from Brangoire. Okaho tells her Lord Degoulis is someone who relies on individual strength to survive, while Brangoire prefers to depend on his team to win his battles. Although Brangoire's ideals aren't too far-fetched, he seems too tightly bound by them and rarely listens to what others have to say about him. At that time, Brangoire calls them back to their duties and urges them to be quick so they can get back in time for dinner. Just then, a giant nemesis appears, and both commanders Degoulis and Brangoire turn the battle into a competition. Both of them rally their knights and head towards the giant nemesis to take it out. On their way there, Degoulis makes Brangoire a deal. Whoever captures the nemesis first will get treated by the losers. Brangoire, who's hot-headed, takes Degoulis up on his offer and urges his men to chase after the nemesis. Okaho refuses to follow them as she senses something weird from the dead nemesis Degoulis took out earlier. Before she could do anything, the dead nemesis all rose again and started attacking the people around them. Without consideration for her life, Okaho jumps down from Dracoon and gets to the ground to save some of the villagers currently in danger. She looks around and spots a kid standing on a rock surrounded by the spider nemesis. Okaho calls her Raccoon Dragon and saves the kid before it's too late. As she flies through the air, Okaho decides to do something about the Nemesis on the field. She activates Gisoni and hands the reins of her Raccoon Dragon to the kid before descending to the fields to fight the nemesis. After punching a few of them to the ground, Okaho makes her Raccoon Dragon fly higher so she can scout the environment around her. She finds so many nemesis attacking many people at once and gets a little confused about what she's to do. She thinks about acting on her own, but then remembers Brangoire's orders forbidding her from doing such a thing. After giving it much thought, Okaho finally breaks her Gisoni contact from Brangoire and borrows a few soldiers from his fleet to help her take down the multiple nemesis at once and save the people from getting eaten. Her plan works like a charm, and Okaho manages to take down all the Echo Nemesis at a time with the help of her colleagues. When she's done with the heroic feat, she breaks the Gisoni stream with her colleagues and collapses to the ground. Suddenly, everyone gets back to their senses and is quite surprised at how they destroyed all the nemesis in one strike. They look around and find Okaho lying unconscious on the ground. Thankfully, some of them feel sorry for her and rush to help her out. A few dozen meters away, one of the merchant barons, who spectated the entire fight happen, applauds Okaho for her quick thinking and decides to use her as their pawn in their little game to claim some fortune for themselves in the continent of Kyphendir. Once all the hubbub in the fields has died down, the merchant barons take their chests of gold and offer them to the villagers as a token of their contributions towards the rebuilding of the village. The next morning, Okaho wakes up on her hospital bed and hears Doc crying over something. She looks onto her right and finds Doc crying near Meili's bed. Afraid something bad happened to Meili, Okaho gets up to find out what had happened to Meili. Thankfully, she was fine, and Doc was just crying about one of his allergies. Okaho punishes them for almost giving her a heart attack and makes them promise never to do such a thing anymore. Later on, Okaho and the others discuss the aftermath of Okaho's actions. Doc fears she may be terminated before her ordination simply because she left her flying dragon with a child and disobeyed Brangoire's orders. Okaho takes the news in a pretty chill manner and lets her friends know that she doesn't regret what she did one bit. As long as she was able to save most of them, she's good to go. Soon after, Mordred and Sagramore show up to visit Okaho. Mordred lets Okaho know that he's filled in for her and bailed her out from the higher-ups. With this, Okaho is very grateful to her friends for coming through for her once again. In a few hours, Okaho and Meili get on their feet to spectate the entire town of Seaslin Merlin as they prepare for the ordination ceremony. ceremony. Doc and Maylee ask the other three why there are so many infected people wandering the streets, and Sagramore tells them a story of a horrible tradition that Sifendir used to practice. The creation of knighthood and the Sorcerer Knights not only made such a horrible tradition stop, but also made it possible for strays like themselves to get accepted into a royal family. Now that it's their turn to get accepted into the knighthood, they'll finally get a chance to protect the continent of Sifendir. While discussing happily with her friends, Okoho peers outside her window and finds Brangoire waiting for her. In the next scene, Diabol and his minions contemplate their next move as they wonder where to attack using the projector device. One of the minions condemns farmers for trading with greedy outsiders like the merchant barons. He then somehow convinces Diabol to project the next Spectre Nemesis at the farmlands so they can teach them a lesson for betraying Merlin's teachings. Just then, another minion gets into the cave to report the results of his search for Seth. Diabol asks him if he knows Seth's whereabouts, but unfortunately the guy says no. In the meantime, Seth is seen struggling to keep his monstrous self under control. This time, he loses control again and gets slammed to the ground by Mir. Mir ends training for the day and listens to Seth's question. Seth asks him if it's that hard to make living trees grow. Mir tells him he can only manipulate space and time to make already living trees grow much faster. This makes Seth wonder why he hasn't gotten the hang of it yet. He asks Mir a few more questions, and eventually discovers that Mir isn't human. Mir also lets Seth know that he's special now that he can see the forest shaman's memories. Mir mouths a few more things and walks away. Seth calls him back and asks him to tell him what he is. Mir gets back and tells Seth that he's a pixie. Seth refuses to believe him initially, and then Mir pops out of his bogus human body to reveal his stature as a little man, as the humans called pixies. Surprised, Seth asks him if he has sisters and brothers. Sadly, Mir was the last of his kind, and maybe like that for a while. Seth gets a little more confused and asks for more information about the pixies. Mir starts by telling Seth his age, which is around 853 human years old. Seth asks him if he knows much about the legendary Merlin, and Mir tells him all he knows about the lousy dude people revered so much. He did, however, mention that Merlin never wanted the forest to thin out, as he feared that the supernatural creatures that live there may be culled. Sadly, he had little to no control over something like that, and the human civilization grew so large that they took up all the Fantasia the pixie needed to survive. To prevent their extinction, the pixies gathered Fantasia in containers and merged with the earth to become one with it. Upon hearing this, Seth asks Mir if he's truly the last pixie alive, and Mir decides to show him something. Seth follows Mir to a small bush, and there, they find his wife, tending to some trees and a small sap pod housing about 3 to 4 pixie babies. Seth gets very excited when Mir tells him the babies are part of the reason why he's training Seth to control his dark powers. Mir asks again to confirm that he's ready to protect the forest. Seth assures him that he's ready, so Mir takes him back to training. On their training grounds, Mir teaches Seth a cheat code to accumulate and control Fantasia. Once he's sure Seth's gotten the memo, he urges him to let his dark power loose. Seth does so, and begins to struggle to keep his power in control. Meanwhile, Mir calmly tells him to remember his bond with the earth and let Fantasia flow through him. Seth initially fails to realize what Mir means. Then, the armband Jill and Mir gave him earlier showcases some of Seth's important memories and also reminds him of the bond he has with the earth and those who love him dearly. Seth sees Hamelin and suddenly regains his resolve to change the world for good. Before the black orb completely absorbs him, Seth breaks out of the black force and finally conquers it. Mir congratulates him for having completed the training after so many months. He also shows Seth the first plant he created with his own Fantasia, and Seth is happier than a baby who's about to get breastfed. In a few hours, Seth gathers his stuff and gets ready to leave the forest for the castle. He says his final goodbyes to Mir and his wife, and promises to make them proud one day. Once he's done with his speech, he touches the sap pods housing the little pixie babies, and promises to be a good big brother to them in the future. Seth ends his meeting with the husband and his wife by speaking to them through the Sith dimension. Then, when the time is right, Seth strides through the forest and begins his journey back to the castle. During the time Seth was away training, peace reigned throughout Cieslin Merlin as the spectral nemesis attack had been suppressed for a while. Nonetheless, the people who want the nation's ruins, like Diabol and the Baron merchants, still work out their schemes from the shadows, patiently waiting for their time to come, so they strike the capital where it hurts the most. In the meantime, the capital spends most of its days preparing for the anticipated Night Ordination Festival. Back in the stables, Okoho and Maylee are seen giving Dracoon a nice bath when Okoho suddenly brings up Seth and wonders how he'll be doing at the moment. Maylee tells her friend not to worry too much about Seth and just have faith in him instead. Doc, who was washing with them, gets pissed, and asks Melly to get herself ready to get back home to Artemis. Melly, however, refuses to move an inch, and even tells Doc to quit worrying all the time and just have faith in his apprentices when he can. Besides, the attacks from the spectral nemesis have been on the low ever since Seth left, so there's nothing to worry about. Doc tells her since they've not caught the people behind the spectral nemesis, they can't be at peace yet. Okoho also joins their conversation and urges them to keep quiet and all. Doc and Melly get into trouble and tease each other, and Okoho gets distracted a little bit when she finds Branguar walking out of the stables, almost like he was stalking her the entire time. Before she can call him or do anything about it, Melly changes her personality and calls Okoho back to her senses. Okoho, who's been looking for a sparring partner, welcomes Melly's other personality and spars with her for the rest of the day. By nightfall, Melly picks Doc up and heads straight for her home after receiving loads of thanks from Okoho for the training. Moments after Melly's gone, Mordred shows up to see Okoho alone. Just right outside the stables, Melly notices Branguar spying on Okoho as he is standing near the entrance, and even tries to call him so he can notice them, all to no avail. Eventually, she carries Doc to a corner and hides there to watch Branguar spy on her friend. From all she knows, he might be part of the conspiracy against the capital. Seconds later, someone leaves the stables with a cloak on, and Branguar follows suit. Melly takes Doc and follows Branguar through the busy market night and runs into the impertinent Lord Degoulis there. Degoulis stops her midway and tries to pimp her up, but Melly wasn't having him at all. So, to avoid losing Branguar, Melly bribes Boubri and Doc to fly over the people and follow Branguar until they find him. Without thinking twice, Mr. Boubri takes Doc and flies straight towards the fields. He finds Branguar about to decapitate Okoho's head, just as she's about to summon a spectral nemesis and throws Doc at him. Branguar gets distracted for a little while and gets attacked by Mr. Boubri. He turns his sights back on Okoho and tries to kill her one more time. However, Melly already caught up to him, so he stopped that from happening. As Branguar tries to tell them the truth, Okoho, who appears to not be herself, attacks Melly and almost lands a blow on her, but thankfully, Seth comes in at the right time and stops her from touching Melly. Surprised about Okoho's strange behavior, Seth tries to reason with us, but Okoho keeps on attacking him. Melly tries joining the fight, but Okoho becomes way too strong for them. Branguar breaks himself out of the prison Melly kept him in and joins the fight. Seth stops the fight midway and recognizes the eyes Okoho has on her. He tries to get Branguar to stop fighting her, but Branguar isn't just going to back down. Okoho escapes on her broom and the others pursue her. On his way, he tells Melly to be gentle on Okoho as he believes she's being controlled. Okoho raced as fast as she could until she got to the fields. There, she runs past two farmers who get scared shitless because of her approaching them like the Dullahan. To catch up to her, Seth recalls his training with Meyer and uses the feel of the Fantasia in the air to get her and pin her to the ground. Okoho struggles to keep up with Seth and unconsciously gets back to her normal self. She looks around her and gets a little confused as she has no memories of the things she did before getting there. Branguar accuses her of treason and brands her a traitor. However, Seth and Melly know something's up as the Okoho they know will never do such a thing. Branguar backs up his claims with evidence of the things he's observed so far during his investigation with Okoho. Okoho, on the other hand, begs them all to hear her out. Seth concurs with her reasoning and speaks to Branguar to give her some breathing space. Just then, Okoho speaks up and tells them about her curse. To support her explanation, she shows them her curse mark and tells them anyone who touches it can control her for a specific period. To prove her theory, Branguar gets down on his knees, touches the curse mark, and activates Okoho's robotic state. Then, he tells her to take her own life, and Okoho almost does it in an instant. Satisfied that Okoho isn't telling lies, he orders to stop midway and gets more confused over the real culprit behind everything. Seth asks Okoho if she told anybody else about her curse. Okoho tells him she told nobody. Branguar formulates a new plan right there and advises Okoho to return to the capital and behave like nothing happened while he works in the shadows to expose the dirtbags who pulled such a dangerous stunt on poor Okoho. Okoho nods in agreement to everything Branguar says to her and waits for her punishment to be meted out. Branguar punishes her by refusing her ordination at the ordination ceremony. Distraught, Okoho decides to go check things out with Mordred. Seth tells her about the moment he saw her and Mordred back in the stables before he left for his training and tells her to try investigating him first. On their way back to the capital, Seth picks up the projection stone and realizes that the Fantasia running through it feels just like his. He suddenly remembers Diabol and decides to go check check him out at the underground cave in the castle. Okoho suggests they enter the castle during the festival as security will be less heavy during that time. Seth also advises Okoho to beat down anybody who tries to touch her mark next time, as she has the right to protect herself from intruders and she shouldn't be scared to protect herself. Meanwhile, Dragunov and Lieselot successfully snuck into Kaifandir and followed a narrow route to get to the merchant baron's hideout. On their way to the hideout, Lieselot gets suspicious and warns Dragunov not to act out on his judgment, or else she will be forced to act and take him down. Dragunov, who started getting irritated at Lieselot's incessant nagging, decides to rizz her up so she can rest and be awed by his charm in the meantime. When he's done rizzing Lieselot up, Dragunov arrives at the hideout of the merchant barons as General Torka ordered and steps in to say hi. The merchant barons receive both thaumaturges with warm welcomes and advise them to get comfortable so they can discuss business as usual. The reasonable merchant amongst the bunch starts by telling the thaumaturges about the new device they created, the Harmonisium, which is known to nullify Fantasia. So the merchants needed the Inquisitors to acquire the machine and wage war against Siphendir so they could weed out the infected, get rid of their curses and powers, and then get their dignity back. In return, the merchant barons will have unsurmountable resources in their name. Lieselot seems to reason with the merchant's thoughts and tells him not to think the Inquisitors would just dance into his hands easily. Dragunov, who's been suspicious of the merchants from the very beginning, asks the reasonable merchant what the merchant barons would have in return if the Inquisitors do their dirty work for them. The reasonable merchant chuckles and commends Dragunov for his keen insight, and then, out of respect for the thaumaturgs, tells Dragunov that they wish to capture all the infected people after they're defeated and turn them into their slaves. Dragunov is a little shocked to hear this, but he keeps his cool. After her revelation, Okoho decides to visit the only person she suspects would try to manipulate her curse and take advantage of her, Mordred. She arrives at his room in the dead of night and recalls the horrible scene Seth described in her last meeting with Mordred. Then, she knocks on Mordred's door and shows him the stone when he opens it. As she walks into his room, Mordred tries to touch Okoho's curse mark, but this time, Okoho is prepared. She wrestles him into submission and asks him why he would do such a thing to her. She's been trustful enough to violate one of the strictest laws in Sazlin Merlin, which is to never disclose details about one's curse to anybody, and tell Mordred everything she knows about her curse. To defend himself, Mordred tells Okoho that the faithful of the Hermits group, aka the group of those spectral humans, wanted to use her curse mark to manipulate and terminate the night sorcerers who betrayed the great Merlin, as well as the farmers who traded with the foreigners. However, Mordred stepped in and urged them to use spectral nemesis instead. With this, Okoho gets even more disappointed and contemplates telling the queen about the treachery. Mordred warns her against it and lets her know that the queen is also in on the treachery, to stare at the statue of great Merlin outside the dorm and possibly ask for its help. Soon after, Mir and Seth pop out of the small bush behind her to talk with her. While Mir tells her not to trust an ordinary statue, Seth asks Okoho to give an account of how her meeting with Mordred went. Okoho starts by mentioning the good memories she had with Mordred and Sagramore. She didn't leave out their dream to become cool like the Sorcerer Knights and also beat down Nemesis to protect the people. So why would Mordred do such a thing? Why would the queen, the only person she respects so much, betray her people just like that? Mir and Seth cheer her up and remind her of the good deeds she's done to the people while at it. To finalize his talk with her, Seth advises Okoho to just calm down and do what she thinks is right. The next day is the day of the ordination ceremony, and everyone's in a pretty festive mood. Dragunov and Lieselot stay in the shadows to watch and wait for the signal from the merchant barons while their people show up to attack the capital. Just then, the night sorcerer apprentices start walking towards the queen's throne to get ordained to be sorcerer knights. Seth notices Okoho's nervous expression and talks to her using the seed dimension. Okoho tells him not to worry too much about her, and that she doesn't care about becoming a sorcerer knight anymore. Rather, she knows what to do and will stop at nothing to protect the people while she can. Seth wishes her luck and leaves her to get ordained. Queen Boudica calls her people to her feet and urges them to kneel before her while she gives her introductory speech. When she's done, Boudica gives her other knights the order to begin choosing their apprentices. In the meantime, Seth and Doc manage to break into the castle archives. Doc and his cowardly self try to escape the place, but Seth pulls him back and begs him to stay and look for the thing he was going to help Grim with. While Doc does that, Seth will get to the cave underground and talk to Diabol. After taking their picks from the apprentices, Okoho remains the only one unchosen. While the knights chastise her for being such a disobedient lady, Okoho proudly gets up on her feet and accuses the queen of sending the spectral to attack her people. Queen Boudica keeps calm and tries to sidestep the accusations. However, Okoho wasn't letting her off the hook for 1 minute. Instead, she turns to the people and implicates Boudica to be a queen who's thirsty to rule using force and fear. Lord Dagoulas gets a little tired of Okoho's whining and tries to restrain her with his knights. However, Okaho comes prepared, and she uses the strongest Gaisoni force against the guards and controls them to move away from her. Then, she turns to the queen and begs her to confess everything while she still has the chance. Before Boudica could say anything, Lord Dagoulas cuts in and decides to punish Okaho. He takes out his sword and lunges at Okaho to slash her, but Branguar steps in and defends her from Goulas's sword. He then joins forces with Okaho and seconds her accusation. Boudica tries to get his head back in order, but then Branguar isn't ready to accept orders from the queen anymore. Disappointed, Boudica thinks of a solution. However, she was quickly interrupted by a wounded sorcerer knight who flew in and crash-landed on her throne. Without question, he bows his head and informs the queen about the Inquisition's attack. As they speak, the Inquisition army ships finally get to the outskirts of Sifendir, and every thaumaturge, including Piodon and Torquay, gets ready to fight the infected. With the Inquisition hot on their trail, Boudica postpones the accusations to another time and urges her soldiers to focus on the most pressing matters, which is fighting the Inquisition and protecting their precious capital. In the meantime, Mir and Jill both sense a weird presence hovering above their forest. Mir gets the feeling that it's the Inquisitors, so he decides to go check it out. He tells Jill to keep watch over the forest while he goes on his way to protect the forest, and Jill wishes him good luck. Just right outside the forest, sorcerer knights gather on their mounts and form up on each other to protect their land from the Inquisitors, and finds Malia alone in one part of the forest. He holds her and tells her to keep her mouth shut, and then asks her for the location of the Horned Sorcerer. Before she could say a thing, the scene shifts to the next, and the Sorcerer Knights are faced with a battalion of Inquisitors, just waiting for them to arrive on the battlefield so they can settle things once and for all. Verone, Ulmina, and Santori all gather together to tease the Knight Sorcerers. Verone, the youngest thaumaturge, asks Santori when he wishes to use the machine Torca placed in their care, the Harmonizium. Santori tells him to be patient and let them wait for a written peace agreement from the infected so they can try to settle things amicably. At that instant, the entourage from the Inquisition arrives at the enemy lines and takes him time to read out a few outrageous crimes the Inquisition accused Sifendir of committing, most of which relate to housing the international criminal, Seth. To redeem themselves from their false atrocities, they surrender to the Inquisition and renounce their reign over Sifendir. Queen Boudica gets insulted by the accusations and sends the Inquisition carriage back to their masters to show them she's ready for war. The Inquisition army gets the memo, so they immediately begin the attack on Sifendir. Completely unaware of what is going on the surface, Seth arrives at the underground cave and calls Diabol to show his face for a conversation. Diabol shows up after hearing his name a few times and tries to attack Seth. Seth lets him know he was never his enemy, and he just wanted to talk to him. However, Diabol wasn't ready to listen just yet as he kept on attacking Seth. Seth figured out his trick in time and eventually drew Diabol to the light. On seeing him, Seth takes a closer look at Diabol and realizes that he also has horns like him. He asks Diabol for his real identity, and Diabol introduces himself as Seth's brother. While searching for a book about the Memory Stone, Doc stumbles upon a magic book that could tell him the pages to find the answers to his question. After freaking out upon knowing the book's abilities, Doc decides to ask the book about the Memory Stone. The book tells him the exact page where he can find any text about the Memory Stone. Surprised, Doc asks the book to show him texts about the Radiant, and the book takes him to page 10. Doc opens the page only to find it ripped out. To help Seth understand his predicament, Diabol explains his origin story to him. Before saying anything, however, he tells Seth to be very careful about the guy who calls himself Piodon. Ever since he was little, Diabol has always been feared to be a monster since he could use Fantasia with his bare hands. Piodon found him in the dungeon one day and recruited him to be his brother, so to speak. For years, Diabol joked around and played with Diabol, thinking he finally found someone he could call his brother. Sadly, that wasn't the case, as Piodon was only breeding him to be an assassin. When the time came for Diabol to mature, Piodon started taking control over his body using that black round thingy, and would sometimes send him on dangerous missions to kill someone he didn't know. With time, Diabol lost his freedom and decided to investigate him one day. He found Piodon training another guy like him. He calls the guy Triton and tells Seth that they're the first people in the world to be born sorcerers. If they were born sorcerers like himself, and Diabol thought, then this would mean they were very powerful and strong enough to gather Fantasia with their bare hands. This may be why the Inquisition is so hell-bent on finding Seth, being the only horned sorcerer they've set their eyes on. Seth gets a little more surprised and wonders what happened to Triton and Diabol when they told Piodon about their findings. Diabol told Seth that Piodon left him and Triton to suffer with the Inquisition. Around that time, Piodon was busy overseeing the battle between the Sorcerer Knights and the Inquisition. Boudica, on the other hand, gets a little worried over how the Inquisition knew about the spectral nemesis. She suspects a spy to be amongst them, but doesn't have enough time to figure out who the spy is as the enemies are coming in hot. To strengthen their defense, Boudica summons her 3 great spirits, Prasutag, Tehran, and Ogmios to help them. Once they arrive, one of the spirits summons a wall of fog that encloses the soldiers within them. Before the fog dissipates, Boudica and her people destroy the Inquisition army closest to them and advance to their next line of attack, which is using the anti-gravity spell to keep the enemy fleet on their toes. The next wave of enemies advances towards the Sorcerer Knights, and Boudica uses Terran's power to summon lightning and take down all the Inquisition ships at once. After taking them down, Boudica senses something weird and realizes that they had things too easy so far. Without thinking, a bunch of other sorcerers advanced towards the enemy to take them down. It was then that Santori turned on the Harmozinium to negate their Fantasia and throw them to the ground. Santori joins the fight and swears on his beard to avenge all his fallen comrades by taking down Queen Boudica in due time. After watching her men get destroyed by the Harmonitium, Okoho notices Fantasia, negating the effect of the Harmonitium machine. At that instant, Mir's forest begins to wither, as the Fantasia that kept it alive gets nullified. Unable to do a thing, Mir stays down and thinks about the state of his wife and unborn kids. In the meantime, the Sorcerer Knights keep getting closer to Santori and willingly offer themselves as sacrifices. As the next wave was about to advance, Okoho stepped in and tried to explain the situation to them. She warns them not to get close to that machine or else they'd have their Fantasia drained. Sadly, nobody wanted to listen to her, so they headed there on their own. Grangoire also follows them for some reconnaissance. Santori keeps having the time of his life as he knocks several sorcerers off their brooms due to their lack of Fantasia. Okoho notices this and checks around her to figure out a way to stop the Harmozinium machine from functioning and killing their sorcerer. Suddenly, she finds Lord Degoulis, Sagramore, and Mordred heading towards the enemy ship. Okoho gets a little pissed at them and links herself with Dracoon so she can fly faster and catch up to them. Concurrently, Seth, who is still unaware of the war outside, stands shocked as he learns of the truth behind Diabal's hiding. Diabal continues his story and lets Seth know that Piodon is only using all of them to achieve his aim. Seth asks him why he couldn't escape captivity while he still could, and Diabal tells him it's because Piodon was so connected with him that he can see everything Diabal sees. Since the castle could keep out magic of any sort, Diabal decided to stay there and hide from Piodon. Seth tries to tell him to join him so they can figure out their memories together. With this, he holds out his hands and allows Diabal to touch them. Diabal suddenly gets teleported to Sid and realizes just how vast Seth's knowledge of the spiritual realm is. He tries touching some part of his memories, but then the thought of it was too painful for him. To help him understand his past better, Seth called Mir's name to come help him out. However, Okoho was the one who answered. With the little time she had left, she explained the situation outside the castle to Seth, telling him about the war. Seth gets himself out of Seed and asks Diabal to follow him out of the castle so they can fight the Inquisition together. Diabal, who is too scared of Piodon, hands Seth a stone and tells him to go out and fight while he uses the stone to summon a spectral knight whenever Seth needs one. Seth holds him up on his offer and races up to the surface only to find the entire nation in shambles. Mr. Boobry flies and lands on Seth's hands to tell him about Melee. On the other hand, Melee gets captured by Dragunov and Lieselot while walking in the town square and is told to stay put while Mr. Boobry brings Seth to her for capture. Dragunov leaves that vicinity to hide and wait for Seth. A few minutes later, Seth arrives searching for Melee. Dragunov intercepts him and holds him at arrow points. Seth fights Dragunov as he asks after Melee's location, but then Dragunov isn't there to play with him either. He manages to pin Seth down to calm him down so he can ask him a few questions. In the meantime, Melee has a brief conversation with Lieselot and tells her about Seth's dreams to find and destroy Radiant. Lieselot couldn't help but laugh at what Melee was saying. However, Melee tells her she's dead serious, and that Seth is someone who can make the impossible happen. Elsewhere, Seth and Dragunov continue having their conversation as they fight each other. Lieselotte, on the other hand, forbids Melee from speaking out of bounds so she doesn't get killed. Melee, however, confronts her and asks her if she's ever been afraid of death. Lieselotte falls into her provocation trap and is caught lacking by Melee. Melee waits for the right time and exchanges her cuffs with Lieselotte to buy herself some time to escape. As Melee runs through the slums, she thinks back at what Dragunov did to her back when he captured her and wonders why he would do such a thing. What she didn't know was that the Sorcerer Knights were having it bad in the battle up front. While the war continues, Lord Degoulis, Sagramore, and Mordred all land on the Merchant Baron's cruise ship to discuss terms and come to a peaceful pact between the merchants and the Sorcerer Knights. Just as they're about to get to the heart of the meeting, Mordred switches sides and reveals himself to be the traitor all along. As it turns out, the lead Baron, aka the reasonable Baron Dusant, is Mordred's father. Lord Dagoulis and Sagramor are shocked at the realization, but it is already too late as their deaths are already near. Back on the battlefield, the Harmonisium machine gets to the queen and manages to weaken her a little bit. As for Myers Forest, all that remains green is nothing but a small parchment of shrubs. Okoho flies very close to the Baron's ship and notices the weird meeting between Sagramor, Dagoulis, and the other merchants. She tries getting a closer look to understand what's going on, but unfortunately, Mordred figures out her location and captures her with their nemesis capture net. As for Gulis and Sagramor, Dusan orders his son to capture them and do away with them quickly. As the tides of battle raged on, Queen Boudica got even more irritated by the Harmonitium as it was gravely limiting their ability. She tries using the Great Spirit Ogmios' golems to take down the Harmonitium, but unfortunately, the Harmonitium is too strong for all of them. Santori and his partners, Ulmina and Verone, get a little bored as they think they are having this war easily. Secretly, they wish Seth would show himself and make things a little more interesting for all of them. What they didn't know was that the strong and terrible Branguar was already leading his army to decimate the enemy lines, so they could get much closer to Santori and his people. Verone realizes that the Inquisition soldiers are at a disadvantage, so he steps in and uses his miracle, the bell that turns anything within its ring radius into stone. A few guards rush towards him to take him out, but Verone turns them all to stone. Branguar's right leg, which was also in the ring radius, gets turned to stone as well. After capturing their intruder, Mordred breaks the terrible news to Sagramor and Dagoulis. He was the one who made them believe the overseer of the Spectral Knights was the queen when in fact, it was him and his dad, Dusan. While Dagoulis and Sagramor curse Mordred for tricking them, Okoho asks Dusan the more important question, which is why and how they hope to profit from interfering in everything. Dusan explains every inch of their plan to Okoho and her people, letting them know that they all needed Seth and Diabal to force Torka to wage war against Siphandir. Now the merchant barons made it seem like Seth and Diabal were really bad dudes to Torque, so Dusan could easily manipulate him to attack Siphandir. When he is asked about their true intentions, Mordred and Dusan both tell Okoho and the others that they aim to capture and turn the infected from Siphandir into their slaves. Surprised, Sagramor asks them how they plan on subduing the most powerful sorcerers in all of the land, and Mordred tells them about the Harmozinium and their plan to use it against every magic-wielding sorcerer in the land so they can bring them under their control. With this, Okoho gets emotional and tries to bring Mordred back to his senses. Unfortunately, Mordred tells her he's been living his entire life for that moment. As the negotiations go on, the battle begins to favor the Inquisition, as Queen Boudica starts losing her power. Before she loses all of it, Boudica decides to take matters into her own hands. She suddenly gets up on her feet and races towards the enemy lines, ignoring all attacks and weapons used against her. The Inquisitors failed to realize why she was running towards them, but Boudica just kept on running. Even her sorcerers beg her to reconsider charging blindly at the enemy. Boudica ignored all of them and kept going on. Santori sees her coming and makes her fall so he can gloat about how he captured the glorious queen of Siphandir. In a few moments, Boudica gets back on her feet, picks up a boulder, and throws it at the Harmonisium to knock it down and render it useless temporarily. This pisses Santori off so badly that he holds Boudica's head to the ground and pummels it till he's satisfied. Even after knocking and capturing the queen of Siphandir, Santori remains unsatisfied as he wants someone more challenging to fight with. Someone like Seth. Almost immediately, word about Boudica's capture reaches Dusan, and he uses that as his bargaining chip to get Dagoulis and Sagramor to surrender themselves. Sadly, both soldiers are ready to surrender just yet, and Dusan leaves them in the hands of their natural foes. He leaves Gulis to fight with Crystallum, the steroid addict, and also leaves Sagramor to face Mordred. Before fighting him, Sagramor, who's always serious-minded, gets emotional and tries to bring Mordred back to their side. Sadly, Mordred was never on their side to begin with. Once he notices that words aren't getting to his friend, Sagramor and Mordred clash swords. Meanwhile, Lord Dagoulis and Crystallum, both strong men, fight each other to their heart's content, as they wish they'd met under different circumstances so they could be friends. Being the better one of the two, Sagramor manages to disarm Mordred. However, when it came down to finishing the job, poor Sagramor couldn't do it. He foolishly tries one last time to bring Mordred closer to him. Sadly, this was too bad an idea even for him. Mordred intentionally gets closer to Sagramor and stabs him in the neck when he isn't looking. Sagramor's last vision of his killer is his best friend, whom he fought so many battles. Okoho, on the other hand, lets out a terrifying scream that resonates through the entire battlefield. Meanwhile, Seth and Dragunov continue their one-on-one and argue facts about their current situation. Seth gets the upper hand at one point, and manages to pin Dragunov down. Just as he's about to deliver the final blow, Dragunov asks him to remember Malie and the sacrifice she made to ensure this war didn't get out of hand. When he's sure he's gotten Seth's attention, he asks Seth to join him to stop the war together. At this point, Seth stays put. A few meters away, Lieselota keeps searching the town for Melee and catches her trying to get past her. Without flinching, she attacks Melee with murderous intent and forces her to switch personalities. In the meantime, Gulas and Crystallome continue fighting each other like a bunch of crazy lunatics with nothing else to do, while Okoho guilt trips Mordred for keeping quiet and manipulating his supposed friends for all these years. Just then, Dusant instructs his son to take care of Okoho once he's done with her. Okoho asks him why he risked his position to save her back when she was supposed to be terminated. Mordred tells her he only did those back then, so he doesn't lose the only person who could do his dirty work for him. At this point, Okoho asks Mordred if he ever felt anything for them during those years they were together. Without even flinching, Mordred tells Okoho his curse, which eliminates every feeling of emotions from his body. Ever since he was younger, Mordred had never felt anything for anybody before. To blend into the crowd, he would sometimes copy Sagramore so he could pretend to be the happy one, just so that people wouldn't suspect him. After divulging all of his secrets, Mordred proceeds to stab Dracoon. Then, he activates Okoho's curse and orders her to jump off the ship and fall to the ground. Unable to control herself, Okoho obeys Mordred's every word. Concurrently, Seth and Dragunov both arrive at the battlefield. Seth is shocked at the amount of destruction he's currently seeing and asks Dragunov for an explanation. Dragunov tells him this is all happening because of Torquay's just cause. Seth gets pissed and tries to punch Dragunov. However, Dragunov dodges his punch and tells him not to forget that the world isn't black and white. Just as there are inquisitors like him, there are also bad sorcerers, and Seth should not be so naive as to believe all sorcerers are good. Seth calms down at this point and asks Dragunov what he plans on doing in the meantime. Dragunov takes out an arrow and shoots it with a flare attached to it to signal his people that the horned sorcerer has been captured. Santori and Olmina get the signal and immediately cease their fire so Seth can pass through. Seth follows Dragunov through the crowd of sorcerers and endures the scorn the sorcerers throw at him while he is approaching the inquisitors. As Seth and Dragunov get closer and closer to the Inquisitor's army, something extraordinary happens. Without warning, the merciless battleship of destruction, piloted by Torquay and the Thaumaturges, the legendary Uranos, descends from the heavens. Before it begins firing anything, Santori instructs his soldiers to assume their formations, so they can get ready to attack when it's time. Once the soldiers assume their formations, both Dragunov and Seth watch in dismay as the great battleship opens fire on all of Caisline Merlin. Before the sorcerers could react, Barone and the other stronger Thaumaturges started using their miracles to subdue whatever enemies they could find. Dragunov, who's as surprised as Seth, looks up and realizes that Torquay has betrayed him. Some days before the battle, Torquay had promised Dragunov to end all the bloodshed once Seth has been captured. But now, that wasn't the case as the Inquisitors still attacked Caisline Merlin even after Seth was captured. Seth holds Dragunov and tells him he's going to find those behind the Uranos ship and beat them down with his bare hands. As Dragunov wonders what he will do, Seth moves on and takes down a few soldiers on his way. Dragunov decides to help him out and turns his back on his soldiers. Outnumbered, Dragunov hopes to fight till his last breath. Luckily for him, his former soldiers were there to help him out. They reunite with their former captain and await his instructions on their next move. Dragunov happily retakes control of his old army and tells them they'll be working independently from then on. As Okoho nears the edge of the ship, Dracoon appears in her Sid world and uses the Gaisoni bond Okoho had with him earlier to pull her back and help her regain her senses. Okoho gets back on the ship and realizes that her Dracoon is suffering from a fatal wound. Mordred, on the other hand, wasn't interested in her feelings, so he raises his sword to take her out. Okoho uses her stronger Gaisoni to control Mordred like a puppet and uses him to attack all of his father's army. Melee, after switching personalities, attacks Lieselot with all her might, while Santori finally notices Seth's arrival on the battlefield. He rejoices to finally be greeted by the Horned Sorcerer and hopes to have an amazing battle with him while he's at it. Seth takes down about 30% of Santori's soldiers in one fell swoop and heads straight for Santori. Moments before his fight begins, a weird bulb of Fantasia races out of the castle library and heads towards the battlefield at incredible speed to join Seth in his fight against Santori. Both Seth and Santori are surprised to find Doc piloting such a sophisticated piece of tech. All Seth could do was watch Seth and the other memory stones inside the suite argue over who would take charge of the controls. Doc struggles to hold his own against the memory stones and makes sure all the stones are kept in order. Seth gets a little confused and asks Doc for an explanation. Some of the memory stones introduce themselves and the suit to Seth and ask him who their enemy is. Santori gets bored of waiting and decides to attack Doc and the memory stones in the suit. Without even thinking, the memory stones manipulate the armor and block Santori's attacks. Santori gets a little happy to finally see another worthy opponent for him to fight. As the memory stones block Santori's attacks, Doc begs them to retreat and leave things to Seth. Thankfully, the memory stones aren't cowards like him, so they attack Santori till they manage to land an injury on him. Seth notices the wound on Santori's hands and quickly joins the fight, so Santori doesn't have enough time to recover. He uses his Skull Burst magic abilities and works with the suit's Fantasia boosting powers to knock Santori down. Thinking he was out, Seth gets the shock of his life when he realizes that Santori was only sleeping the attacks out. He wakes Santori up and listens to the strong thaumaturge spew out some nonsense about the warriors he's fought before in his life. Out of all of them, Seth and his new friend are the most entertaining bunch he's ever seen. While he talks, one of the soldiers shows up to complain about Brangoire interrupting them and restraining the queen. Santori tells the soldier to go sort things out himself and leave him to fight his best enemy. Yet, Doc and the memory stones hear the soldier's words and immediately race down to the spot where Boudica was held to protect her from the Inquisition forces. Seth tried to call him back, but unfortunately, Doc was too far gone. After he's gone, Santori tells Seth about the last time he saw him in Vivazzini. Seth remembers that to be the location where Diabol claimed to have found his brother, Triton, and tries to tell Santori about it. Upon hearing this, Santori happily gets up and rejoices at the thought of having more sorcerers like Seth to capture. Seth tries to reason with him, but Santori tells him he's been instructed by Torque to capture all the horned sorcerers and he's not asking any questions. Seth notices Santori's on fire and tries to tell him. When Santori notices, he removes his clothes and uses a Fantasia-enhancing drug to amp up his powers. Seth waits for him to finish spewing out his nonsense before activating his dark powers and giving him a deadly punch in the belly. Santori happily returns the punch with his projection and makes things interesting for both of them. At that moment, Doc arrives at the right spot in his Pendragon suit and blows all the soldiers away. Brangoire gets awed by this sudden appearance and likens the suit and its wearers to be sent from the great Merlin himself. The memory stones were already feeling as well, but as you'd imagine, Doc spoils all the fun and reveals himself to be the one piloting the suit. Despite being a coward, Brangoire still commends Doc for actually fitting into the armor while he could. Doc and his stones thank him and turn to face the little child coming towards them. They get a little confused and contemplate saving the child as he gets closer to them. Thankfully, Brangoire could recognize Veroni from a distance, so he was able to warn Doc and the others to stay away from his miracle. Thankfully, they managed to get out of his miracle in the nick of time before Veroni pummels them to the ground with his weird bell miracle thingy. The memory stones pilot the suit to attack Verone, despite Doc's insistence to run away and abandon everything. Doc gets so stressed that his little brain gets an idea. He tried to relay his idea to the memory stones, but they didn't listen to him. They kept on attacking Veroni until Doc got pissed and stuffed them all in his mouth. He threatens to swallow all of them if they don't listen to him, so everyone stops what they are doing and calms down. After getting their attention, Doc advises them to release enormous amounts of Fantasia instead of just attacking Verone blindly. Initially, they all refuse his dumb plan, but after he swallows one or two of them, they follow his plan. Back on the merchant ship, Dusan steps out of his cabin and finds his son trapped under the Gaisoni spell. He orders his men to take down the puppet he calls a son, and this manages to piss Okoho off. Just then, the men on the ship all take muscle-inducing drugs and amp themselves up to fight Okoho. Meanwhile, Mali's strength matches up to Lieselotte's own, and she starts fending off her attacks brilliantly. Seth, on the other hand, struggles to take down Santori's projection as he slowly loses his touch over his dark ball. Before he loses himself, he tries to make Santori sabotage himself, but Santori sees through it and avoids it by all means. Seth calls in a favor from Diabol, and he immediately summons the spectral nemesis. Santori's projection, being the stronger one, pummels Diabol's projection in a few punches. Seth gets beaten up and knocked out for a few seconds, and Santori starts gloating and celebrating early. He even makes the mistake of getting too close to Seth, who was being patient. Just when Santori begins to say noble things about the horrible things they've done so far, Seth powers up and resonates with both Okoho and Meli in their battles. All at the same time, Seth, whose head was already under Santori's feet, finally unlocks another part of his power and gets back on his freaking feet. With immense anger and determination in his eyes, he coordinates attacks with both Meli and Okoho in their separate fights and encourages them to surpass their limits. Then, in one attack, he blows Santori to smithereens and finally puts an end to the Santa Claus warrior. With moments left to live, Santori thanks Seth for granting him a chance to witness such an amazing battle, and even goes as far as bidding Seth farewell for ending him in such a perfect fashion. Seth blows Santori into bits, and then falls unconscious mid-air as he's used up all his powers. Then, He falls to the ground and stays there unfazed and unconscious. Elsewhere, Okoho controls Mordred and threatens his father, Merchant Dusang, to end him. Dusang, who knows another ship is waiting for him, waits for his chance and jumps on the oncoming ship with his men to escape Okoho's grasp. As he rides to safety, Dusang reunites with his comrades to discuss a new strategy to get the land of Siphandir for themselves. Mordred, on the other hand, who's still under Okoho's Gaisoni, begins to feel emotions for the first time in his life. He begs Okoho to release him from the Gaisoni as he suddenly feels a rush of regret and sorrow for killing his friend Sagramore with his own hands. Okoho leaves him to suffer and refuses to release the Gaisoni spell. She gets up and boards another friendly ship with her friend and wounded Dracoon. In the meantime, Verone, Doc, and the Memory Stones continue their heated battle, but this time, Doc's plan works, and they manage to crush Verone with a huge boulder. For the first time in his life, Doc gets praised by something, so this makes him jubilate a little too soon. A little while later, they feel Fantasia draining from the suit and turn back to check up on Verone. To their dismay, Verone is nowhere to be found, as he's seen running towards the forest to check up on Olmina. Doc and his Memory Stones manage to get back on their feet. Confused about what they're to do, Doc and his people decide to get to the forest and investigate the machine draining all their Fantasia. Doc tries to keep them down so they don't wander into danger and kill him. However, the Memory Stones were no cowards, so they worked together and moved the suit to get to the forest with Queen Boudica's unconscious body. After confirming that the Harmonitium is functional, Olmina decides to step up to the stage and control the tides of battle. With Santori gone, she knows the fate of this battle rests in her hands. Although some of her soldiers oppose her plan, Olmina carries out her plans. First, she orders her remaining soldiers to leave the battlefield and return to base. Then she uses her miracle to summon the dead from Hades and control them with her light. While she's at it, Mr. Boobry wakes Seth up just in time before he's hauled away by two sorcerer knights. The duo talks to him about the weird zombie knights coming towards them, and Seth turns back to see the bodies coming towards him. He clears a path for himself and the soldiers to run through, and then heads toward the forest to find Jill and Mir. Along the way, he calls Okoho, Doc, and Melee to help him out so they can meet up at Mir and Jill's forest. Meanwhile, the Sorcerer Knights retreat to the castle gates just so they can be safe from the zombie knights, since they can't use or manipulate magic. Seth manages to find Mir mourning over his dead wife's withered body. Soon after, Doc, Boudica, Brangori, Melee, and Okoho catch up to Seth only to see him sunken in despair. Mir, whose heart was hardened against the humans, gets his heart hardened and reveals himself as the great legend Merlin. He tells the humans with him that Jill was the only person who stopped him from taking down the humans back when he wanted to do that. With this, he transforms himself into a monster and also activates the dark ball inside of Seth's seed and makes it overwhelming for the time being. Together, the two monsters jump high into the sky to begin the death and destruction of the human race. Piedon finally catches up to Diabol in his hiding place and says hi before doing his thing to him. After they're gone, Doc continues moving towards the Harmonisium machine with his other colleagues. They get there in due time and get a little confused over what they're to do to bring it down. Boudica falls deep in tears when she realizes that Mir, or Mirden, which is his full name, is the spirit they've been worshipping all this while. Seth gets sent by Mir to destroy the Inquisition's forces, and he does so gracefully. Olmina, who could see him coming, decides to take one of her power drugs so her miracles are enhanced well enough for her to accept and absorb all of Seth's darkness. Seth also sees her and approaches her from above. Olmina hugs him and starts absorbing all his pain little by little. As the ordeal with Seth continues, Grim arrives from his basement dimension and attacks the Uranos to stop it from shooting the castle wall. In the meantime, Boudica falls into a state of total despair as she speaks ill of herself for disappointing Maiden. Okoho gets tired of the queen's whining and decides to take matters into her own hands. Without thinking twice, she and Brangoire rush towards the Harmonisium and try to destroy it themselves. However, their little bodies were not enough to make it work. Pissed, Okoho turns to the queen and tries to speak some sense into her. Nonetheless, Boudica refused to get up. Seeing as she's left with no choice, Okoho slaps Boudica and cajoles her into getting up and fighting the Harmonisium. Rather than punish Okoho for her insolence, Boudica gets the necessary confidence she needs and does her dirty work herself. She gets up and uses every last bit of strength in her body, alongside Okoho and Brangoire's emotional strengths, to destroy the Harmonitium once and for all. After she's done, Boudica falls from exhaustion and gets Okoho a little worried. Thankfully, she's okay. Around that time, Doc and his memory stones get back on their feet, and Melee tells them to get ready to go meet Seth. Before they could do that, however, Dragunov showed up and offered to take one person to the Thaumaturg ship where Seth's being kept. Melee decides to go with him to find Seth, and Dragunov uses his arrow's teleportation abilities to get her there. On their way there, Dragunov asks Melee to tell him how she plans on stopping Seth's rampage. She suddenly remembers Grimm and tells Dragunov to take them there. Upon getting to the Uranos, they find Grimm taking down some Inquisition soldiers. Grimm spots them and quickly attacks both Dragunov and Meli. This time, Meli speaks up for Dragunov and tells Grimm that he's there to help save Seth instead. Grimm immediately stops attacking them and asks them for their plan. Meanwhile, Ulmina keeps on absorbing all of Seth's darkness and almost takes out all of his darkness if not for Grimm, who came and stole him away from her hands. Ulmina gets so sad about losing Seth that she loses it and begs them to bring him back to her. Dragunov leaves Grimm and Melie to take care of Seth and returns to his former ship. Veroni shows up shortly and talks some sense into Ulmina's head. After hearing what her son had to say, Ulmina calms down and decides to leave to fight another day. In a few minutes, she instructs her fleet to retreat and get back to base so the war can come to an end. The Sorcerer Knights see this and rejoice over their victory. Sadly, their victory is short-lived as the Great Spirit, Merlin or Myrddin, shows up and exerts his wrath on the Inquisition army. The Sorcerer Knights see this and make the mistake of thinking Merlin is on their side. Unfortunately for them, they were very wrong. Without thinking twice, Merlin turns his back on his people and attacks them. The Sorcerer Knights defend themselves and hold Merlin off while they retreat to the castle gates. Meli and Grimm see this and try their possible best to wake Seth back up. However, Seth was already far gone as he was deep under Merlin's control. Meli tries speaking to Seth in the Cid, but on getting there, she finds Seth completely engulfed by the black orb. Okoho shows up shortly when Meli starts getting absorbed and saves her from imminent death. As the destruction continues, Meli keeps begging Seth to get back to his senses. Dragunov and his army help the Sorcerer Knights to buy some time so they can flee the angry spirit, but then Merlin faces them and attacks their ship instead. Seeing this, Meli intensifies her calls and finally gets Seth to return to his senses. Mere seconds after getting his senses back, Seth jumps down and stops Merlin's attack from getting to Dragunov's ship. After protecting his ally from getting crushed, Seth flies to the ground to face Merlin and have a brief discussion with him. Myrddin or Merlin gives him some attention and tells Seth that Jill isn't there to stop him now, and he's going to complete his mission from back then to the fullest. Seth shouts at Myrddin and gets thrown to the castle wall. Myrddin picks Seth up as Grimm and Meli try desperately to keep him away from the people. However, Myrddin was pretty hell-bent on taking down every human in his sight. He regrets listening to Jill back then and wishes he destroyed the humans back then. If he'd done that, then his lovely wife and unborn children wouldn't have been killed in the war. As the rampage goes on, Doc and his memory stones find something glowing under Jill's corpse. On checking it out, they find out that Jill had sacrificed the remainder of her life force to protect the children. Myr finally gets close to the castle wall and almost breaks down the barrier, when suddenly, tree roots grow to the wall's entrance and make Myr pause his attack for a while. Surprised, Myr asks if Jill is there, but Seth shows up and presents the cocoon housing his unborn kids. Poor Myr gets so emotional as he picks his kids up and holds them to his chest with tears in his eyes. After seeing his unborn kids alive and well, Myr returns to his normal self and thanks Seth for not allowing him to kill his kids during his rampage. Moving on, he tells Seth just how hard it'll be to create a new cocoon for his kids, but then again, Seth tells him not to overthink things and that he can just create another cocoon. Besides, making a new cocoon takes centuries, and Jill was the only person who could do it easily. Seth asks him why he can't create the cocoon by himself, and Myr exposes himself to be a half-human. Surprised, Seth asks for an explanation, and Myr explains that his dad was a Riz god who slept with a lot of human women during his time. During one of his flings, a woman got pregnant for him, and Myr was born. For many years, Myr was forced to be the outcast in his community, and when the time came for the Pixies to merge with the Earth and become one, he had trouble with it because half of him is still human. Devastated by his fate, Myr wandered the forest for centuries until he met Jill, who was just a beautiful young female back then. Although Myr wanted to keep the pesky humans away, his wife, Jill, would speak to his heart and make him forgive all of them. As time went on, more humans would come by and offer Myr money to buy and own the forest in their name. Since the forest never belonged to anyone, Myr would chase them away. The humans settling in the forest region at the time mistook Myr for trying to save them from the combative humans by chasing them away, when in fact Myr was only trying to get some peace. Over time, the humans began praising him for protecting their land, and started creating legends of his name, and even went as far as calling him Merlin. Myr, despite being irritated by the weird name and fables, ignored the humans and decided to settle in with his wife and enjoy life with her. Upon hearing this story, Okoho and the others get a little surprised as they learn that their legends and fables were all lies conjured by people who didn't know any better. Myr also clears any misunderstanding about his name and calls himself Myrddin and not Merlin. Seth, after hearing all Mirrodin had to say, suggested they keep the babies with a human while they wait for them to mature and be born into the world. There's a little contemplation in the scene, but eventually, Queen Boudica offers her belly up as the new cocoon for the little ones to grow and mature inside. Mir is happy to hear this and thanks her greatly. Elsewhere, Lord Dagoulas and his enemy, Crystallum, end their fight as Crystallum retreats. Dragunov and his former crew set sail towards Bohm, their hometown, despite having committed several treacherous crimes to their home country. His men advise him against it, but then Dragunov tells them he'd like to know what Torque was planning at the moment. He urges his men to trust him and let him lead them towards greatness. Thankfully, Dragunov's men didn't falter. Deep in the underground dungeons of the castle of Kaisley and Merlin, Lieselot, who was captured and imprisoned as a POW, lies patiently and waits for judgment to be meted out to her. She, however, refuses to lose hope in her trusted master, General Torquier, as she thinks he'll somehow come and save her. 3 days later, Boudica calls for a gathering between the survivors of the war and the soldiers who fought bravely to pay their tributes to their fallen comrades. After giving a heartwarming speech about how they got outside and successfully defended their land, Boudica gets down and begs for forgiveness from her people, for forcing them to keep their curses hidden and making them all separated instead of being unified with each other. From that day henceforth, though, she vows to change the law, and even proves it by calling Okoho and Brangoire to get out and tell the people their curse. Okoho exposes her curse mark to the surprised people. Queen Boudica lies about her curse and tells everyone she grows beautiful with each passing day. This causes the crowd to get a little more festive, and in a few minutes, everywhere gets lively and people start telling their curses to one another. Just then, one of the kids speaks up and asks Boudica to tell her the father of the children she's expecting. Boudica refuses to tell them Mir's name, but describes the father of the kids as having a beautiful beard. With that, the rest of the ceremony goes on well up until Brangoire asks for a favor to reinstate Okoho to be a sorcerer knight. Boudica, on the other hand, asks him why he would think of giving Okoho such a low rank in the first place, and Brangoire gets confused. He asks for some clarity, and Boudica decides to name Okoho as the heir to the throne of Kifendir. This means that if something should happen to Boudica, then Okoho will be made queen. Everybody expresses some shock over the realization, but eventually, they're all forced to bow down and welcome their new heir to the throne. As the crowd goes wild with joy, Boudica thanks Okoho for showing her the ways to become a queen. But then again, Okoho turned to the crowd to tell her Seth had a part to play in that. Sadly, Seth was nowhere to be found as he was busy chatting with Mir in the desecrated forest. Mir appreciates Okoho for actually playing her part in keeping the forest alive when she was a kid. Seth tells him not to worry too much about the forest and just wait for his children to be born. Maybe when they are, they can revive the forest. Mir also mentions a few more things and gets down to play his terrible music to commemorate his wife's memories. Seth watches him for a while and leaves him to do his thing. Later that night, Boudica gives Seth the memory stones he's searching for, and also thanks the others for their good deeds and help in saving Sifandir from the Inquisitor. Before letting them leave, she gives Doc the key to the Pendragon armor suit since he's the only one capable of using it. As for Okoho, Boudica advises her to travel around the world with Seth and his people and have fun before returning to reclaim her title as the queen. When all's said and done, everyone gets on their mounts and heads towards their next destination. Seth and Okoho wave Mir and the queen goodbye as they finally leave the continent of Sifandir. On their way to their next destination, Seth thanks Meli for helping him get back to his normal self during the battle. He knows he owes his life and sanity to Meli, and will never forget that. Grim shows his face out of the blue one time, and startles everybody. Everyone exchanges cheerful looks as they all press on to get to the next part of their lives.